Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Let Us Head Fanfics, back with amazing fanfiction. This is the third part of What If Deku Was Deaf and Genius. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Keep him busy. Keep him busy. Don't die. Keep the fucker busy. His inner mantra might not actually have been helping much, but it made him feel a bit better, so Izuku was going to keep going with it. His Kaioketsu Shoge lashed out like a viper, aiming to snag yet another blade from his opponent. There was already a small pile of knives behind him where he had tossed them out of the way as he did his best to keep Stain a safe distance away. He had forced the man back a bit, trying to move the fight a bit farther from Ida and the downed hero he had only belatedly noticed against one wall. But tight spaces like this weren't the best for his mid to long range weapon. He had to make do by keeping a bit of cord draped down between both hands, keeping his control as tight as possible even if the shortened range meant the blades the hero killer was swinging came way closer than he would really prefer. He really should talk to Kurokuma-sensei about more bow staff lessons. If he made it out of this fight intact, that was. He leaned back a bit to dodge a swipe at his face that managed to get way too close. He thought he avoided it completely, but as he fended off the other fighter with a swipe of his own blade and a firm kick to the gut, he felt the telltale burn of a shallow slice along his jawline. He reset his stance, not bothered enough by the cut to be distracted. But as his right hand, along with the beautiful green blade, came back up into defense, he felt all of his muscles suddenly lock up, and then he was dropping bonelessly to the ground. From his prone position, he watched as Stain lowered his bloody knife from his mouth and smirked down at him. Valiant effort, kid. Too bad it was all for nothing. With a dark chuckle, he stepped over Izuku and headed towards his original targets. Panicked, the green-haired teen cried out, begging him to reconsider, doing his best to stall for just a few more seconds. But the discordant sound of his last sword being unsheathed once more rang out like a death sentence anyway. Izuku did his best to move, snag a throwing knife, turn his head, anything at all. But his body just wouldn't respond to his orders. His brain moved at 100 miles an hour, even as his limbs stayed infuriatingly still. His quirk causes paralysis. He wasn't able to activate it until just a moment ago. What was the requirement? The wound? No, probably not. The blood then? Did he have to touch it or? Oh, gross. Okay, now how to counter it? Could he break the hold? Or was it a timed thing? He prayed he could break it by sheer willpower alone, even though he knew it was unlikely. Because right at that moment, listening out for the sound of one of his classmates getting murdered right next to him, he was sure his will would have been more than strong enough. But he still couldn't budge. Just before the yawning portal of despair opened below him and sent him plunging, he heard an unexpected sound. Instead of steel biting into flesh, he heard the distinctive whoosh and crackle of flames. It was followed by a slightly winded and blessedly familiar voice stating, "Dorioku, in the future try and send better directions please." The prone greenette almost sobbed with the sudden mess of emotions he felt, but managed to respond semi-coherently. Sorry, didn't have time to send Power L Loader M my exact lock location. All that gear and you don't have a distress button somewhere. Izuku groaned. Believe me, after today I'm adding it to every costume I have a essay in. They were interrupted from further discussions of costuming updates by an irritated growl. Another child. How many kids are the heroes letting run around freely in a burning city? We wouldn't be running around at all if you weren't out here killing people, Todoroki pointed out in his dry tone, and Izuku couldn't hide a snort. The serial killer grumbled in irritation. I wouldn't have to kill people if the heroes were trustworthy, and now I have to kill yet another child. The sounds of fighting started up again, and the freckled teen on the ground felt another type of panic at his inability to see what was going on. There was one way he could help though. Hentai, don't let him cut you. He activates his quirk through the ingestion of blood. There was a half a breath's pause, tinged with a bit of surprise, and then the madman was laughing, even as the sounds of metal meeting ice reverberated around their small battlefield. Good job, kid. None of the pros have figured it out, and yet here you are. What a waste of potential. Izuku grit his teeth in frustration, trying to tell how the fight was going by sound alone. He was thankful for all of the work he had put into ruggedizing his hearing aids now. The ones his mom bought would have broken as soon as he hit the ground. That didn't mean he liked hearing a villain sing his praises. He twitched when he heard a blade strike something that was not ice, and a hiss of pain. It took him half a second too long to realize what that meant. But as soon as he figured out he could move again, he was up and sprinting forwards, snagging his Kaioketsu Shoge as he went. Shoto was reeling, two throwing knives buried in his left forearm. Stain launched towards the dual-tone boy, reaching to retrieve his weapons. Izuku threw his own blade, doing his best to use the whole length of his cable in an effort to keep the hero killer from gaining control of another person. The man managed to jump back at the last second, only taking a shallow nick across the back of one hand. He cursed as he danced back away from the boys, gaining some breathing room to regroup now that Doryoku was back under his own power. The smaller teens guided to a stop in front of his icy friend. "Tenya, see if you can move again." A pause. "I cannot." An agreeing noise came from the pro hero, who up till that point had been silent. He must have just regained consciousness. Izuku hummed to himself. Maybe the more people he uses it on, the less time he has. No, because then he would have been expecting me. An outside factor then. Blood type. The small flinch from the hero killer confirms his guess. And neat. Hentai, what is your blood type? Oh, me too. So if he gets YU, he has L like 2 meters minutes or so. Understood. But I don't plan to let him get me. Ice was already spreading up his arm, slowing the blood flow from around the blades. Izuku spared him a quick smile, even knowing he couldn't see it from behind his mask, and chirped out a cheerful, "That's the spirit." He swung the weight in his left hand at their opponent, to keep the man back. "Cover me, okay? You have more choices for long range and support attacks." "Roger that. The pros are only a few minutes out, so we just have to go a little longer." The greenette nodded firmly before launching himself forwards once more, his internal chant starting up again with the action. Stow, stow, stow. The next little bit of time is lost to a blur of violent movement, of flashing metal and swinging weights and rushing gusts of flame and ice, but none of the three fighters could seem to land a decisive blow. The hybrid student was impressed at his and Shoto's teamwork. It wasn't flawless by any means. Izuku was definitely sporting a few crispy patches on his new costume, and Shoto had accidentally thrown a blast of ice or fire into the path of Izuku's own weapons a few times, as evidenced by scattered glaciers covered in red glitter and green goo. But overall, for kids who had only been classmates for a couple of weeks, they were doing really well adapting to the others' fighting style. Of course, it's when they really start getting into the groove of things that Stain throws them a curveball. Instead of coming at them head-on like he had been, he used the distraction of another burst of ice to break their sightline. And the next thing they knew, the villain had used one of the walls to launch himself up and over their heads. As Izuku quickly spun to give chase, he stepped right into the line of another throwing knife. He yelped in pain as it buried itself to the hilt in his thigh. "Midoriya," Shoto called out, breaking the rule about code names in the field. But the smallest teen was already refocusing on their task. "Shoto, he got past us. Protect the others." Cursing, the icy boy spun in place just in time to watch as a katana arched down, headed straight for Native's neck. "No." Izuku started forwards in desperation, stumbling as his leg threatened to give up on him. He wasn't going to make it. Neither of them were going to make it. A pro hero was going to die right in front of them. Then there was the roar of engines. Ida launched a speed-powered kick at Stain's head, making contact with a sickening crack. The hero killer skidded a few feet back from the blow, stumbling as he fought to keep his feet through the disorientation of a blow to the head. As he steadied himself, he ended up right back within Izuku's range, and the teen knew it was a now or never moment. He swung the weighted end of his weapon as quickly and precisely as he could, finally managing to wrap the man up in its grasp. With the push of a button, the fight ended. Stain dropped as green electricity sparked, and Izuku kept the cord tight against any thrashing, keeping him contained in case he managed to come back into consciousness. "Ha Hantai, Tenya, we need better restraints and to disarm him." "And now," the other two snapped to, following his order without question. Luckily, Native kept some zip ties on his person for villain takedowns, so that made step one rather easy. As they were pulled tight, Izuku finally let out the tension in his Kyoketsu Shoge, allowing Shoto to unwind it so he could search for the blades hidden in Stain's clothing. Honestly, it was ridiculous just how many the guy had hidden away. The hybrid student made a mental note to tell the cops to triple-check him when they got him to intake at whatever station he ended up at. By that point, the pro hero had finally gotten his freedom of movement back and was standing slowly, using a hand and a swab of gauze to keep pressure on a nasty gash in his shoulder. "How badly are you boys hurt?" Todoroki hummed dismissively. "I've got 2 small knife wounds, but neither of them are deep and I've iced them so the bleeding isn't bad." He seemed to finish his search and sat back in his heels, glancing up at Ida to prompt his own report. "A stab wound to the shoulder and a slash to the bicep. I should probably get them looked at ASAP, seeing as how they are still bleeding." The tallest boy catches the small medipack Shoto pulled from his belt. "It's not much, but there should be enough sterile bandages to wrap up with." As Ida got busy with that, the icy teen turned towards his smaller friend. "Midoriya." The green boy hummed distractedly, too focused on his contemplation of the knife in his left thigh to really answer. He gently tried to test his weight on that leg again, but hissed as it started to give. I don't think I can walk on this." Native took a closer look at the now shaking teen and cursed when he noticed the handle of the knife, the only part that was still visible. The pro hero stepped towards the boy quickly to get a better look. "Okay, that's not great. Leave the knife be. We don't know if it hit an artery, and we don't want you bleeding out if we remove it." He reached up and activated his communicator. barking orders for an ambulance to be sent as soon as possible. The hero then came over to offer the shortest boy his good shoulder for support, ordering the other two to work together and lift the downed villain. We need to get out onto the main street so they can find us easier. Apparently the bigger mess is almost over, so they shouldn't be long. The teens were herded forwards, suddenly exhausted from an adrenaline drop. As they stumbled onto the main street, their attention was grabbed by a small commotion to their right. The heroes had finally made it to back them up. Izuku half listened to their exclamations of surprise at the sight of a subdued Stain. His focus was now fully occupied by the burning pain in his leg. Unfortunately, that meant he didn't move quickly enough when shouts of alarm filled the air, looking up in confusion even as Native tried to drag him towards the ground. Within half a second of the first sound of alarm, the small teen found himself in the air, fire spreading from around his ribs as claws dug in harshly from his own weight. He let out a distressed yelp before choking a bit as the creature that had a hold of him tightened their grip. He strained his neck up and back to find himself staring at the belly of a Namo. Desperately, he tried to reach for any of his weapons, but his belt and his looped Kyoketsu shoge were tangled in the talons of the beast, and his boot knife was out of reach unless he really wanted to hurt himself on the claws embedded in his torso. As real panic started to set in, he was suddenly nauseated by a steep spiraling descent. Within a few dizzying moments, the teen found himself roughly pulled from the grip of the Namu right as the monster crashed to the ground. The issue was that he went from the hold of one nightmare into the hold of another. Stain held him by the back of his collar as he slipped yet another knife out of the exposed brain of the now-deceased Namu. He was yanked around, stumbling on his bad leg as the madman began a tangent, lecturing all of the heroes present. After a few seconds, Izuku went down, unable to support his own weight as well as keep up with Stain's erratic hand movements. After a second of choking pressure as his suit pulled tight, hood slipping free, he was released and shoved the rest of the way to the ground. The teen couldn't hide the short cry of pain as the blade dug itself deeper, or the small whimper as a studded boot pressed into his back to keep him still. There was another few seconds or so of frantic screaming from the man above him, all of which the boy ignored in favor of focusing on his own breathing. But he took note when the killer went from frantic to silent. When he spoke again, it was with far more weight. Izuku felt his lungs freeze in terror at the absolute bloodlust in the air as the hero killer took a step towards Endeavor. But he knew he had to do something. If he let another fight start, who knew how many more people would be hurt? Quickly, he dug through his pockets, snagging a prototype marble he had promised to test for Kuroyama. His weak toss hit the man squarely between the shoulder blades. Luckily, it was seemingly enough force to make the net expand. Within a second, the murderer was down once more, tangled and struggling to get his knife at a good angle to cut his new binding. The heroes descended quickly at the chance, only gaining a few shallow cuts before the last blade was wrestled away and the serial killer who had been terrorizing the country for months was finally cuffed. After a dizzying amount of movement above him, Izuku became aware of a couple of voices calling his name. He opened his eyes, unsure of when he closed them, to see Majima and Todoroki crouching over him. He managed to grunt in acknowledgement of their presence, and hum when they let him know the ambulance was just around the corner. But neither of them dared to move him onto his back, probably afraid of spinal trauma. They both took one of his hands though, which was really nice of them. He felt himself drifting as the paramedics arrived, and he tried to warn them he was going to faint. His mind went blank just as the doors shut on the ambulance. He would never be sure if they had understood that last little bit of his consciousness. Green eyes flickered open slowly. Long pauses passed between blinks as Izuku slowly readjusted to being awake. After a few minutes, he became aware of the low hum of conversation. He rolled his head in that direction, uncomfortable with people being in the room when he wasn't sure who it was. It took a second to focus, but when he did, he saw that the speakers were Todoroki and who were each sitting in their own beds across the room from each other. His fuzzy brain stalled for a second, stuck on the fact that there were at least 3 beds in the room he was in, which was weird, right? He must have made some sort of noise because the other 2 boys quickly turned to face him. Midoriya, Ada exclaimed loudly, though he did seem to be contrite when the boy in question winced at the noise. Sorry, good to see you awake, Midoriya. Here, I will call the nurses to let them know. He fumbled around for a button on a lead connected to the wall. Oh, nurses, hospital, that made sense. Green eyes drifted over to Todoroki, Izuku trying to remember why they were all in the hospital together. Then his gaze caught that of the elemental boys. His brain decided to give him a flash of memories. Blood, darkness, fire, stain. He gasped and sat up quickly. Too quickly. His world swam nauseatingly. The next thing he was fully aware of was the coolness of Todoroki's right side pressing up against him. Apparently he had listed to the side and the other boy had rushed to keep him from falling out of bed. The greenette looked up into gray and blue eyes in fearful desperation. Stain, he's in custody. Please lay back down. The nurses might actually attack us if you pulled any of your stitches. The smallest teen puzzled over the stitches comment even as he let himself be guided back down. It took him longer than he would have liked to remember why sitting up would have risked pulling stitches. His brain felt fuzzy and slow, like a koala crawling through molasses, probably due to some sort of painkillers. Eventually, though, he did remember. The Namu, claws and sharp stabbing pain in his belly even as he was distracted by the whiplash sensation of suddenly being lifted into the air, his blood splattering on the pavement below. The agony as those talons yanked free of his skin. Yes, he did quite a number on you. You were out for a few hours. Izuku smiled weakly. The most sleep I've gotten all week then. Todoroki looked at him in concern at the joke. Not really what he was going for, so he tried to calm the other boy by reassuring him that he was kidding. Izuku convinced the other boy to take himself and his IV back to his own bed to rest. If it had only been a few hours, then it must be early morning at most, and he was sure the other two boys must be exhausted. Ada hummed to himself and reached over with his good arm to press the call button again. This time a voice came over the intercom it was connected to, and the blue-haired teen had a short conversation explaining that Izuku was awake, getting curt acknowledgement in return and a promise to come in to check on them as soon as they could. Something in the nurse's tone caught the greenette's attention. Like sandpaper catching against gauze, it rubbed his intuition the wrong way. He let his eyes roam the room idly, letting the other two resume their conversation on the news coverage they were checking on their phones. After a few minutes, he noticed and puzzled over his own lack of an IV, since he apparently lost a good amount of blood. At the least, they should have been giving him basic fluids. His ears ached a bit from sleeping with his hearing aids in, but that was easy enough to ignore, with the more pressing matters to take up most of his attention. And as a few minutes of waiting ticked quickly into an hour, he began to get an inkling as to what was happening. He didn't say anything, though, not wanting to sound accusatory if they really were just too busy after the mess of that night. Another 30 minutes on, and all of the teens were dozing lightly, playing on their phones or watching the flashes of light through the windows as cars drove past. A subtly increasing burn in his abdomen and leg let Izuku know that whatever meds he had been given were fading. The three boys all jumped as the door to their room slammed open and a blur of purple and pink catapulted into their space. The blur made its way straight for Izuku, and the teen soon found himself being crushed by his two best friends. He couldn't stop the grunt of pain as pressure was put on his stomach. Hearing that, Hitoshi and Mei jumped off of him as quickly as they had latched on. Mei was demanding to know where he was hurt, and Shinso was apologizing for taking so long to get there through traffic. But green eyes were drawn to more movement from the open doorway. Kazashi and Mir rushed in after their kids, with Aizawa following a bit behind. Soon enough, Hatsune-sen was calming the two frantic teens, keeping them from jumping their friend again. Mike was running his hand gently through sweat-matted curls, scanning his charge as if to make sure he was all in one piece. And Aizawa had started to ask his other two students for a quick rundown on what had happened and who had what injuries. Ada was just finishing up his basic version of events, not meeting the sternly disappointed gaze of his teacher, and explaining that they had been waiting for Midoriya to get checked on now that he was awake, and that the hospital must be ridiculously busy for no one to have even poked their head in. The small group who were standing around Izuku noticed how the small teen tensed a bit at the passing comment and looked at him in concern. Mia took his hand in hers, patting it gently. "You okay, kiddo? Are you hurting?" "I'm okay," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "I just don't like hose hospitals." She hummed an acknowledgement even if she didn't look entirely convinced. Hitoshi settled so he was half sitting on the bed, his hip pressed flush against his best friend's. He took the smaller boy's hand and held it up to his own chest, purple irises locking onto green. The grumpy boy knew he wasn't the best with words, so he tried to communicate through the look alone, trying to let his crush know how happy he was that he was alive and how scared he had been on the long drive to Hasu. The smile he got in response told him that at least most of his message got across. It was only another minute or two of everyone settling in around the room before a nurse finally appeared. There was a brusque knock on the still open door, and then a frowning woman stepped in. "Hello." The front desk notified us that Midoriya Izuku's guardians were here. Izuku ignored the curious looks from his two classmates at the term guardians, curious looks that turned to confusion when Aizawa stood and said, "That would be me and my husband." "Okay, great. I have Midoriya's discharge papers and billing list here. Please sign them before you go." There was a pause, the green teen sinking in on himself in familiar shame. Aizawa leaned forwards in the plastic chair he had commandeered. "I'm sorry. Discharge papers. We haven't even spoken to the doctor yet." "Oh," the woman paused. "Yes, well, he is very busy tonight. I'm sure you understand." So Yamada stood abruptly, a pleasant smile plastered on his face. "Okay, if he is too busy to come to us, I can go to him to figure out what needs to be done for Izuku's health. Can you show me where he is?" Now the nurse looked openly irritated. "I'll go ask if he can come here," she grumbled as she stepped out through the door and stomped away. There was a moment of silence broken by Hitoshi's quiet, "What the fuck was that?" Mike quietly admonished him for his language, even though it was a bit distracted in tone. Ada and Todoroki shared looks before turning to Aizawa. Aizawa-sensei, the blue-haired teen started uncertainly. The doctor has already been in to speak with both Todoroki and I, and he didn't seem to be in a huge hurry at that time. The nurses also came and checked on us a few times before Midoriya-kun awoke. The greenette in question sunk further into himself with every word. Dreading the conversation he could feel brewing. The three adults in the room shared a look, obviously realizing that something serious was going on. Before they could ask Izuku if he knew what exactly it was, they were interrupted by the doctor finally showing his face. He looked at them with an irritated frown on his face. "What's this my nurse was telling me? I've approved Midoriya for discharge. What seems to be the problem?" Mia stepped up to the plate from her place, stood at the end of the green teen's bed. Isn't discharging a minor without discussing their condition with their guardian against regulations. She frowned fiercely at the pissy man in the white coat, daring him to deny this well-known rule. The doctor sighed. "All right, fine. If that's the issue, let's get this over with. I have some important patients who need my attention more at the moment." The heroes and students in the room all tensed at the offhand comment, and Aizawa had to stand so he could block Mia from doing something dumb. The man snatched a chart from near the door and started reading from it robotically. All right. He had a knife in his left thigh. We took it out and gave him 8 stitches. He also had 10 puncture wounds in his torso of varying depths. We cleaned and stitched those as well, and he lost around 300 ml of blood. So he will most likely be dizzy and weak for a week or two while his body reproduces what was lost. If he rests and drinks fluids, that will eventually fix itself. We also noted 2 cracked ribs and plenty of small nicks and abrasions. Judging from what I saw, the kid should know how to take care of those. The stitches we used will dissolve on their own, so there will be no need to come back. There. Now, sign here to acknowledge the discharge and here to accept the bill. Hold on now. Yamada took a step forward. 300 ml is a lot of blood for such a small kid. You didn't give him a transfusion or an IV or something. The doctor waved away his concern. It will be fine. We can't afford to waste those supplies on those who don't really need them, and it will live so. The mood in the room changed in an instant. The silence choking as the doctor turned to hang the clipboard back up on the wall. After the small pause, it seemed Razor found his voice first. He asked, his tone reminiscent of razors and flame. The man who had yet to realize his slip-up turned to look over his shoulder. Yamada took yet another step forward, now far closer than the doctor should be comfortable with. You called him it. Unfortunately, the man in danger didn't seem to sense his impending demise. He flapped a hand. Well, you know, whatever. It's a no. I'm sure that's not the worst it's heard. Green eyes danced across the room, taking in the anger and shock on the faces of everyone but the instigator of the situation. He could tell Yamada and Hatsumi-sen were about to get physical. He wasn't sure if Aizawa would stop them or not. The man in question looked particularly enraged himself. And then there were the other teens. Hitoshi looked ready to commit a murder, and if he started swinging, Izuku Nume wouldn't be far behind. The other two were watching the whole scene in confused shock. The smallest hero in training knew he couldn't let this escalate anymore. He didn't want anyone going to jail on his behalf. So, gathering up his courage, he cleared his throat and forced himself to sit up slowly, getting the attention of everyone in the room. Aizawa-sensei, see, can we just go home? If you sign the PA papers, I promise I'll pay off the B bills with the money I make from work, okay? Kid. The dark-haired man looked a bit thrown by his request, unsure of how to respond. They can't just leave you like this. You lost a lot of blood and really need to have that taken care of. The freckled teen looked down at his hands, tugging harshly at his fingers. Actually, sensei, they can turn me away at any time. Page 25, paragraph 3 of the Quirks and Mutations Hospitalities and Accountabilities Bill of 2XXX states that any hose hospital or clinic who do not have an appropriate specialist on staff may refuse service at any time in the name of SB, sparing the injured party further harm. So if this hospital doesn't have someone who specializes in the treatment of the Quirkless, we don't, then they are free to treat me for as much or as little as they are comfortable with. The doctor nodded amicably. See, the null knows how this all works. Honestly, if we had been informed of its status before we started working, we would have sent it off to the clinic across town. I would have focused more on the others who had just shown up. They deserve my help more. These two, for example, he said, gesturing to the other 2 teens who were in beds, would not have had to wait so long to be stitched up. Izuku nodded tiredly. Before he started looking around for his clothes, he spotted a small cabinet by his bed and reached over to swing the door open. There he found what was left of his wonderful hero costume. It had apparently needed to be cut off of him. The greenette wanted to cry when he saw the pile of blood-stained cloth. Hiroyama had worked so hard and he had ruined it within a week. At least the boots and belt were still intact. He took a deep breath and reached for his jacket to see if there was any way to get it usable enough to get to the car. Hitoshi stopped him and grabbed his own backpack from where it had been dropped on the floor. I snagged some clothes from my room on my way out the door. They might be a bit big, but Izuku managed to send him a grateful smile. Thanks, Tosh. He started to swing his legs over the side of the bed only to be stopped by Aizawa's hand on his shoulder. The man looked him in the eyes for a second, conflict on his face, before finding something in the freckled face that had him slumping. Zashi signed the damned paperwork. Get the discharges for the other two as well and call their parents and mentors to let them know we are taking them to UA. Come on, kid. Let's get you changed so we can get away from these idiots. Wouldn't want them to corrupt that brain of yours with their stupid. The small teen missed most of the doctor's complaints about them taking the other two. He seemed to be hung up on the fact that they were sons of major hero families. He was distracted by the Eraserhead picking him up in a bridal carry before toting him effortlessly to the small bathroom. His small protests were stamped out by a stern glare and a rebuke about the risks of pulling stitches. Izuku was sat gently on the closed lid of the toilet and the door was closed behind them. The greenette tugged on the ties holding his top closed as his foster father dug through Hitoshi's plain black backpack. He came up with a large purple hoodie with tiny black cat faces printed all over it and a pair of black joggers. They paused as Mike's voice got louder, obviously straining to keep control of his quirk as he completely verbally obliterated the bigoted doctor. They heard Mia step in before Aizawa had to go stop his husband from blowing out the windows, and after a few seconds things quieted down a bit so they returned to their own task. The hero helped his charge slip out of the hospital clothes and into the much more comfortable items quickly and professionally. He tossed the hospital garb to the floor carelessly before snagging his student and the bag into his arms once again. They re-entered the hospital room to find that the doctor had gone and Yamato was moodily signing a large stack of papers. Todoroki took their spot in the bathroom, his hero suit intact save one tattered sleeve. Izuku was set down gently for the moment as his teacher was waved over for Mike to ask a question on the paperwork. Their conversation got heated fairly quickly, but they were careful to keep their voices down. Mia drew Izuku's attention away from his fosters and thoughts of turning up his hearing aids by crouching down in front of him with a small smile. Hey kiddo, I need you to be 100% honest with me, okay? I'm texting Obagi so she knows what she needs to set up for. I've already run through things with the other two so now it's your turn. She waved her phone in front of him to illustrate her actions and he caught a glimpse of a number under the name RG. Are you in pain, kiddo? The small teen was definitely in pain. The last of what he assumed was morphine having finally faded, but it wasn't the worst pain he had been in so he just hummed and made a so-so motion with his hand. After a suspicious look she typed something out AMD moved on. Any dizziness or nausea that he couldn't deny. If it hadn't have been for Aizawa setting him down in a chair with a back the teen would probably have been swaying with how the room seemed to roll with his every move. Yes, he said quietly. Okay. No walking for sure then. Anything else you think might be a concern? He shook his head, only regretting it slightly. And with a nod and a gentle hair ruffle she stood to go take some quick pictures of their charts to send off to the heroine. That was when Izuku noticed that both Aizawa and Yamada had left the room. He looked over to where Hitoshi was shoving his costume into a plastic bag and Mei was doing a quick glance over his equipment to check for tampering or damage. Violets and Quicksilver caught on Evergreen and Hitoshi sent him a reassuring smile. They'll be right back. They had a question about some of the paperwork. Do you want to put your boots on or no? The greenette relaxed a bit at the casual reassurance. Yes, please. Do you mind handing them to me? With a snort and an eye roll his friend walked over with his super cool hero boots. But instead of handing them over Shinso knelt and snagged one of Izuku's bare feet. The greenette protested that he didn't have to do that. But a quick reminder about pulling his stitches and a stern glare quieted him down quickly. And wow, Hitoshi was becoming more and more like Aizawa every day. The greenette looked up from where his friend was struggling with his laces to find Todoroki staring at the two of them, an odd look on his face. Before Izuku could ask what was wrong though his guardians were back and there was a whirlwind of grabbing the last of their stuff. The nurse came back with 2 wheelchairs and insisted on the 2 other boys using them or not being allowed to go. When Yamada challenged her, demanding another one for Izuku, she just rolled her eyes and stated that those were the last 2 and that Izuku was safe to walk. The small boy tugged the hood of Hitoshi's jacket over his head to try and hide his annoyed and embarrassed flush. After a minute or two, Aizawa stopped their argument by scooping his ward back up from the chair and nudging his way past the rude nurse none too gently. Mia and Mike pushed the other 2 boys through next, the man giving the bitch one last glare as he went. All of the adults pretended not to see the rude gestures from the 2 uninjured teens as they pulled up the rear, much to Ida's quietly scandalized delight. After a few tense minutes of walking they made it to the parking garage and the Amezawa SUV. After a moment of discussion Ida, Todoroki, and Hitoshi climbed into the 3rd seat. Mia and Mei flanked Izuku in the 2nd row and Mike took the driver's seat. Aizawa pushed the wheelchairs back towards the entrance as they all got settled. Hatsume-san insisted on the smallest teen laying down, stating that the 2-hour drive would be easier on him if he did. so he ended up with his head in her lap and his feet in May's. He was vaguely aware of the pink inventor pulling apart the power soles to check the engines, but calloused fingers gently working through his short curls lulled him quickly to sleep. He was pretty sure they hadn't even made it to the edge of Hasu before he was gone. Shio had the boy ready for a transfusion within 10 minutes of Yamada setting him gently on one of the beds in the infirmary. The other two boys were then hooked back up to fluids and painkillers. Both of them fell asleep fairly quickly after their long night, but Izuku was still awake, bleary-eyed but tracking everyone's movements as they all bustled around and settled in for the night. Mike pulled a chair up to his foster son's bed, snagging a freckled hand and gently rubbing a thumb across nicked and scarred knuckles. May found a corner of the floor to use for setting up shop, sorting all three hero students' equipment out around her and setting in on giving it all a proper tune-up. Mia settles near her daughter, ready to step in if needed in the name of keeping the infirmary in one piece. And Hitoshi claimed a bed of his own, phone out as he caught up on a mythology podcast he had been neglecting. Once Aizawa was sure everything was well enough, he headed to Nezu's office. He knew Recovery Girl had let the mammal know what was going on, and that he would have headed to his computer in the name of fixing any issues he could. And with the sheaf of papers under his arm, the underground hero was pretty sure he could argue there was a major issue. The dawn eventually came. Hatsum-sen had eventually needed to snag her groggy daughter out of the floor. She was originally going to dump her in a bed of her own, but when Hitoshi had seen her heading that way, he had lifted his own blanket and scooched over. And how could she say no to that? Honestly, those two were more like siblings than any real siblings she had ever seen. And no one could deny that in this situation cuddles were a great idea. So she settled her baby girl down and made herself useful in cleaning up the nearly completely checked over equipment from the floor, piling it neatly on the bedside tables as the kids rested. After the sun was well and truly up, she and Yamada had a quick discussion before she did what she always does in the name of caring for people. She goes out to find some good soul food. By the time the boys were groggily sitting up to face the day, the woman was back with her bounty in tow. She went with a traditional breakfast, for Americans at least. A 24-hour cafe supplied her with plenty of bacon, eggs, and sausage, and then a run to a nearby bakery actually had donuts. So she set up her takeout boxes on one of the rolling tables, and as the kids woke up, she made them plates of greasy, sugary heaven. Izuku was the last, besides May, who would probably be down for a few more hours, to wake up. He sat up slowly with regards to the stitches holding him together. When he saw the donuts, he practically lit up in excitement. He promptly asked for the chocolate one with rainbow sprinkles. Mia just grinned and plated him up his requested sweet and some other odds and ends. After he was done eating, Yamada stood from his chair in the corner and came to sit on the edge of his bed, handing him his charged hearing aids. "Okay, kiddo. Time for 20 questions. I texted Chio when you woke up and she should show up soon, so let's get a head start, okay?" The teen sighed but nodded, noticing that Mia had gone over to speak to the other two patients. "Any dizziness?" Green eyes cut back over to his foster parent. Some, not as bad as last night." That earned him a small smile. "That's good." "Nausea?" "No, sir." "Great. Okay. Scale of 1-10, how much pain are you in?" I'm okay. It's not too bad." The small teen flinched a little at the disapproving look his reply gained him. "That's not what I asked, kiddo. I know there is pain, and all I want to do is help. I can just have RG give you a high dose of painkillers, but it'll be easier to not go overboard if you give us an accurate pain level to work with." After a moment's pause, Izuku deflated, too worn out to really argue the point. "Maybe a C6. I'm mostly just sore and achy." Mick smiled at him cheerfully. "Good job, kiddo. So an 8 or so. Good to know." He ruffled short green curls gently before bouncing away to go snag another donut for himself. Green eyes blinked after the too energetic man in slightly surprised confusion. "But I said 6. A snort from his right had him looking over to glare at a sleepy Hitoshi. "Oh, come on, Izu. You know adding a couple of levels for you is warranted. You tried to tell me it was just a boo-boo while you were actively bleeding out in a closet. Your description of pain isn't really reliable." The greenette pouted. That was one time, and in my defense I had a concussion." The two bickering teens jumped, suddenly remembering they weren't alone, and looked over to see their two classmates looking worriedly at them. Ada bit the bullet and continued. "That seems like a very worrisome situation to have been in, Midoriya-san. Are you all right?" The greenette flushed brightly behind his freckles, Todoroki gaining an odd look on his face before he glanced away from Izuku. Yes. It was a while ago. I'm okay now." There was a sardonic snort from his purple-haired friend. "Yeah, okay. Except for the holes in his stomach. Totally normal and fine." "Hideshi, the mortified boy in question whined to his friend, hiding his face in his scarred hands. "Please don't." Purple eyes watched in amusement before he chuckled and agreed to lay off. Just in time for Recovery Girl to walk into the room and begin her morning checks. She started with Izuku since he had been the most injured of the three. She asked the boy a few follow-up questions to build off of what Yamada had sent her via text. before drawing a curtain around the bed and helping him remove his shirt, pants, and bandages, leaving him in his boxers, stitches and scars on full display for her to check over. She paid special attention to his leg where the knife had been buried so deeply. After a few minutes of poking and prodding, she deemed the stitches good enough and helped her patient rewrap and dress. Pulling the curtain back open, she got to work setting the boy up with an IV of fluids laced with painkillers. She then moved on to the other two, giving Izuku time for the pain to dull. After everyone was checked over and settled, she hummed and turned to the two adults in the room. Okay. A detective and their mentors should be here within an hour to talk with them, get their statements, and see how to proceed from here. After that, I will use my quirk on them. I don't want to do it beforehand for obvious reasons. Mike chuckled at the small joke. Yeah, being coherent is kind of important for giving a statement. The older hero hummed an amused agreement before heading for the door of her private office. I'll be writing up recovery plans for these three if you need me. Ada in specific will need some physical therapy to deal with the nerve damage. Mia followed her in, snagging the older woman a treat as she did, obviously wanting to chat with her old friend. The boys all settled into wait, Ada chatting calmly with his teacher while Todoroki fiddled with his phone. Hitoshi was obviously fighting a doze, the warmth of a cuddly Mei slowly drawing him towards his ever-elusive rest. Izuku himself was also feeling exceedingly tired, drained and groggy from the late and taxing night. Eventually, there was a polite knock on the door, and it slid open to reveal a small group of heroes and one exhausted-looking detective. Aizawa stepped through the door first, a stern look fixed firmly on his face. He was followed quickly by the others, the 5 men standing in an intimidating group at the head of the room. Tsukachi-san pulled his phone out and started a video call. As it rang, he looked at the teens with a small frown. Police Chief Tsuragami wanted to talk to you three in person, but your early release from the hospital in Hasu means this will have to suffice. Please be respectful. The man has a lot on his plate right now. After another ring, the call was answered and they were treated to the sight of a man with the head of a dog. Izuku blinked before accepting his existence. Such was the world of quirks. Hello, Woof. My name is Tsuragami Kenji, Chief of Police in the city of Hasu, and you three boys have definitely caused a bit of an issue that we now have to settle. The smallest teen blinked in surprise at the wording before glancing at the other two boys in question. Ada was looking down at the floor in shame, but Todoroki looked angry. Green eyes blinked in surprise, not used to seeing the other boy's emotions showing so strongly on his face. He cut his gaze to Hitoshi, unsure of if he should speak up or not. The last time one of their classmates had gotten angry, he had gone on a murderous hunt for a serial killer after all. But the pale boy was gazing in drowsy nonchalance at their guests. The chief went on before he could decide what to do. You see, none of you have your provisional licenses, which means you are not normally cleared to use your quirks in hero work without supervision from a fully licensed pro. By that point, Todoroki was fully glaring at the phone screen. The greenette flinched when the other boy spoke, the suppressed rage in his voice very clear. Are you saying we should have just sat back and let Ada and Native die? If Midoriya hadn't stepped in, there was no way the two of them would have made it until a pro could get on scene. Todoroki-kun, wait a minute. The smaller teen tried to calm the fiery temper sitting across from him. Let's hear them out. Oh, okay. Aizawa hummed in approval. Midoriya is right. Letting your temper get away from you is not a good look for a hero. Did Aizawa glance at Endeavor when he said that? Besides, Chief Tsuragami has a solution to the situation to go over with the three of you. So back down, kid. No one is mad you saved someone. You just need to be aware of the risks of doing the same thing in the future. The dual-colored teen subsided with a surly grumble, and Izuku caught Hitoshi giving the suddenly emotional teen a curious look. But the men took the chance to move on before he could even attempt to say anything. The dog-headed man chuffed in muted amusement. Indeed, since Power Loader gave Dorioku open-ended orders to protect and Endeavor gave orders for Hantai to back him up if necessary, that gives us a bit of legal wiggle room. The main issue is Tenya's involvement. If we give him credit for helping in the takedown of the hero killer, there will be nothing we can do to protect him from the vigilante laws. But if we give credit solely to the two heroes in training who had permission to fight and hide Ida's involvement, Todoroki finished the thought in a monotone. He will not get in trouble. All of their teachers snorted at that, Yamada practically chortling. Oh no, he is in so much trouble. His parents will be here in a few hours for a meeting with Nezu to discuss what will be done there though. So brace for that, kiddo. Though getting away scot-free from attempted murder. Ada paled, but nodded demurely in acceptance of his fate. Aizawa hummed. I suggested an after-school revision program going over hero laws as well as suspension from hero classes until we are sure we can trust you in the field again. But we will see what they settle on. Izuku thought that was fair considering what Ada had tried to pull. The next hour or so was mostly spent getting official statements and deciding exactly what to tell the press. After Tsukachi left, the gathered mentors drifted over to their charges for more personal conversation. Izuku smiled up at Power Loader sheepishly. Hi, sensei. Hi. You bring down a serial killer and then almost bleed out in my arms, and the first thing you say is hi. Green eyes blinked up at him hesitantly. Adoom, the red-headed man sighed before reaching over to ruffle his student's hair. I knew you had a trouble finding issue, but I honestly thought that this week would be pretty quiet since I wouldn't have to deal with you, eh? I guess I should have known better, huh? He grinned in amusement as the hybrid student pouted. You did really good for such an impossible situation, kid. Be prepared to be grilled about your equipment by your classmates, though. The small teen sighed fondly at the reminder of his over-enthusiastic support friends. They were interrupted from bantering more by a couch from near the foot of the bed. Majima looked over to find Recovery Girl looking at him pointedly. This young man is well overdue for a session with my quirk. Say goodbye, Hagari. The man chuckled. Yes, ma'am. He turned to his student promptly. Dreamweaver and Mike gathered your things and I brought them with me. I'll grab them from the car and leave them in your locker in the support lab. I'm pretty sure Kagami also slipped his number into your bag, so you should probably text him when you get the chance. The greenette beamed, flattered that his senpais at the agency wanted to keep in touch. With one more hair ruffle, his mentor left and Chiyo stepped up to give Izuku his kiss. Within seconds he was out cold, a small smile on his face as he settled into a healing sleep. Ada's mother and Todoroki's sister came to pick them up that afternoon. They both seemed really nice, fussing over their individual teens as they packed them up to take them home for the rest of the week. Recovery Girl insisted on Izuku staying one more night for observation, though. She sent the Hatsums and Hitoshi and Yamada home after dinner in the name of quieting his space so he could get a proper rest. Hitoshi had run down to grab Izuku's phone from his bag after lunch, and he had plugged it into charge while he napped and chatted with his friends. Now that it was a lot quieter with only Aizawa currently in the room with him, the man busy with paperwork, using the edge of Izuku's bed and a clipboard as a makeshift desk, he snagged the device off of his side table. He yawned tiredly as it booted up, feeling drained and groggy even after having napped on and off all day. He let his focus slip a bit, thinking about all that had happened over the last few days, but was brought back quickly as his phone started going crazy in his grip. Frantic dings announced his numerous notifications, the little piece of outdated text sounding like it was going to explode with the sheer amount of incoming data. It went on for a solid 2 minutes, the teen looking up to sheepishly meet Aizawa's raised eyebrow. If I were you, I'd silence any notifications that don't come straight from your friends and those who might need to contact you immediately. The greenette nodded slowly. I think that's a good idea. Once the damn thing stopped freaking out, he quickly went into all of his news and social apps and silenced them. It wasn't until he knew that his phone was no longer in danger of combusting that he started actually looking at what was making it scream. Oh, the news about his involvement with Stain had dropped. A lot of his old and new classmates had apparently dug around and found his social media accounts in an attempt to contact him. And the people who actually had his number had left a mountain of messages and missed calls for him to sift through. Those seemed to slow down a bit after a few hours, though. Most likely someone had gotten a hold of Mei or Hitoshi and they had let their classmates know he would be okay. He sighed, too tired to care enough to slog through a news article about the events of the night before. So he decided to ignore his problems for the moment and opened a game Toshi had insisted on him downloading the week before. He had been too busy to give it a try, but now that he was stuck in bed, it was as good a time as ever. Soon the quiet tinkling of classical music soothed over the room as tiny cats walked around on his screen. Content in the tiny utopia he was building for them. It was only around 30 minutes before the man sitting at his bedside had to jump forwards to catch his phone as it fell from his sleep-lax fingers. With a grumble and a hidden quirk of lips, it was placed safely back in the bedside table and he was left to rest and heal. Aizawa left in the morning to meet Hitoshi in one of the gyms, stating that just because his internship had been a bit interrupted, they didn't have to cut the purple-haired boy's learning week off completely. Unlike Izuku, Todoroki, and Ada, who were each told to pretty much stay in bed until school next Monday if possible. The greenette shuddered at the very thought. He was praying his fosters would at least let him code a bit. Maybe if he tried puppy dog eyes. They never worked on his mom, but Mei swore his were a deadly weapon. Recovery Girl did a few tests to make sure his blood pressure and such was showing signs of his healing. And then it was a short waiting game. The nurse entertaining him with stories of past training mishaps his senpais had somehow managed. Finally, just before lunch, Yamada strolled through the door, finished with his 2 English classes for the day. The blonde listened quietly as the medic gave him one last rundown of all of the symptoms to watch out for and what kinds of things they should be doing to help Izuku with his recovery plan. And then with one last kiss, the teen was up and giving the old woman a sleepy wave, and his foster father guided him as he limped into the hall, the greenette's backpack slung over one thin shoulder. Once they were in the SUV and Yamada had double-checked that his passenger was buckled in, the man turned to give him a bright smile. Okay, kiddo. Where do you want to go for lunch? My treat. Just don't tell Chiyo I didn't take you straight home yet. That got a small giggle out of the freckled boy, and after a few minutes of discussion they pulled out of the hidden garage and headed to the nearest ramen place. It was a small tucked-away hole in the wall that was generally pretty quiet. Even when it was at its busiest, something about the atmosphere seemed to dampen the outside world. They found a parking spot surprisingly close, and Yamato led his charge down the street to the restaurant, pulling open the door for him and ushering the small teen into a booth. A waitress quickly stopped by to greet them and let them know the daily special, tonkatsu with nori. Izuku eagerly asked for that, the thick broth sounding absolutely delicious at that moment. Yamada asked for the same and also requested an extra serving of soft-boiled eggs for his ward, insisting that eggs were a great way to recover from blood loss. The teen wasn't quite sure about that fact but did not protest the hero's kindness and concern. He was well aware his little skirmish had scared everyone in his life and was willing to let them dote a bit to help them feel better. He smiled quietly as the vibrant man chatted at him while they waited, sipping contently at his matcha tea. Occasionally, he would ask a question to prompt the blonde into another tangent, interested in all of the interesting stories about hero work and hijinks at his agency. Izuku hadn't had much one-on-one time with Yamada, but he found he was quite enjoying himself. The man could be loud, sure, but he seemed to know how to calm it down depending on the situation. And he was a really good storyteller. Maybe that's how he got into the radio business. Their food was tabled fairly quickly and they dug in, the greenette humming in satisfaction at his delicious serving of noodles. After a few minutes, his handler for the day raised an eyebrow and pointed at his eggs with his chopsticks. The freckled boy rolled his eyes, showing his teenager perfectly, but obeyed with a small smile, basking in the simple kindness of the man's concern. When they were done and paid up, they wandered back out to the car. Izuku's steps a bit slower now that he was full and really starting to feel the full effects of Chiyo's quirk use. It wasn't even 10 minutes into the drive back to the apartment before the boy was slumping against the window, out cold. Mike just chuckled at the sight, pleased that his plan had worked. Though it was a bit of an experience trying to carry the green teen and his bag up to their home, he managed somehow, and without Izuku stirring even once before he was settled into his own bed and left to rest peacefully for the afternoon. Shoes left at the door and hearing aids docked and charging. The blonde hero kept the bedroom door open and made his way down the hall to his studio, planning on drawing up a playlist for his next show well within earshot of his ward just in case. Aizawa unlocked the door, letting in his mentee and foster son before he closed it and locked it behind them, taking off his heavy boots and kicking them to the side casually, a habit he knew his husband hated but he never really cared enough to break. Hitoshi had already taken off towards the stairs, probably eager to see his friend and take a shower after their long day of training. A small clink alerted the underground hero to a presence in the kitchen. Ducking his head to hide his content smile in his scarf, he went to greet his loud mouth. He rounded the divider wall and felt himself soften a bit at the domestic sight of the man he married putting together a tea tray, complete with the cat-shaped cookies that Hitoshi kept picking up from the bakery he liked. "We're home," he rumbled, causing his Ashi to spin to face him with a wide smile. "Welcome home, Shu. How did training go?" The dark-haired man hummed quietly, taking a step forwards to accept his traditional welcome home kiss. "It went well enough. Hitoshi is making good progress with the capture scarf, and the voice modifier is really doing wonders for his versatility. I might ask Izuku about making him some power souls as well though, since he had a slimmer build. I think they would really help him pack a bit of extra strength into his kicks and jumps. He tends to just barely miss the landings when we practice free running." Ashi chuckled as he picked up the tray. "I'm sure the little one would be more than willing to help out. The pink listener too. Pretty sure they were telling me she was the one who designed the engine those things use in the first place." Aizawa shuddered a bit at the thought of the chaos child. "Well, someone else can ask for her help. That problem child scares me." His husband laughs at his drama as they head up the stairs. Shouta knocked politely at the open doorway, announcing their intention to enter, but waiting until they got the go-ahead. Izuku was sitting up in bed, his purple shadow hovering beside him, obviously reluctant to leave even if he knew he really needed that shower. With a smirk and an eyebrow raise, Aizawa fixed that issue quickly, Hitoshi excusing himself and all but running from the room in teenage embarrassment. With a snort of amusement, Hisashi skipped over to their bedridden ward, setting his snack across his lap with an energetic "ta-da" and an excessive jazz hand moment. Enduring the cringe was worth it for getting to see the way the teen's eyes lit up in wonder, surprised at the kind gesture, obviously having expected the tea he had been offered to be a simple cup of green tea and that be it. Instead, he now had a pretty spread of fragrant herbal blend and dainty cookies, with a napkin folded into a flower to top off the look. Wow, thanks." The smile he sent the blonde man was blinding, even with the bed head and eye bags dampening its effects a bit. "No problem, kiddo. After a long nap like that, you absolutely need a good snack. Dinner will be in about 2 hours or so. Any requests?" Green eyes blinked up at them. "No, I am good with anything." The voice hero hummed thoughtfully. Well, RG said to feed you things high in iron. Does teriyaki tofu sound good? The greenette nodded, looking happy he didn't have to choose. His bubbly blonde caretaker ruffled his hair playfully. Okie dokie kiddo. I'm going to be down the hall again for a while, so yell if you need anything, okay? Izuku nodded with a small smile. Happy Yamato was happy and touched at the care he was being shown. The louder man bounced from the room, heading back to his studio, and the teen switched his attention to the other guest in his space. Aizawa propped his hip against the desk, standing casually and doing his best to project a relaxed air. So, how many of those articles have you read? The teen flinched a bit, but recovered quickly, shrugging nonchalantly. A couple, and mostly the ones people have sent me. And, are you doing okay with the publicity? Izuku hummed, taking a sip of his tea. I am okay. There have been some rude comments, but it's not anything I've never heard before. The dark hero hummed thoughtfully. That's not exactly comforting, kid. But if you think you're okay, I won't push. Just know that Hisashi and I are here if you need to talk. And remember that overgrown cockatoo is an expert in public relations. There was a pause before the teen nodded, smiling shyly. Thank you. Of course, kid. Now I'm pretty sure it's my turn for a shower. I'll see you at dinner time. Izuku hummed in acknowledgement. And the man left him to his snack, passing Hitoshi in the hall with a ruffle to soggy purple hair, fully ready to shower and then crash until dinner time. They ate dinner in the office that night. The adults not really wanting Izuku going up and down the stairs while he was still prone to dizzy spells. They gathered around the big desk. Comfortable chairs and stools from Yamada's studio pulled up. The food was yummy, as usual, but Izuku felt himself quickly flagging at the normal end-of-day chatter. Hisashi noticed him starting to doze off over his nearly empty plate and reached over to tap the back of his hand with a smile. Hey kiddo, Chio said you could try for a shower tonight as long as you cover your stitches with the waterproof bandages. Do you want to, or would you rather wait for the morning? Suddenly the teen was hyper-aware of his greasy curls. They had gotten most of the blood and dirt off of him using rags and warm water at the hospital. But after a few days of sitting in the residues, a shower really did sound heavenly. He gave the man his best puppy dog eyes, not even having to give him his answer verbally before the voice hero was laughing and nodding. I'll help you cover the stitches once I'm done eating, kiddo. Before you go gather your stuff though, I just need to let you know that we have some workers coming in to fix some things downstairs tomorrow. We planned to have them here while you were gone and Sho and Hitoshi were training so they wouldn't be too disruptive. But well, that's not really an option now. If they're too loud for you to rest, let me know and I'll set you up a futon in my studio, okay? The teen waved a hand dismissively. That's okay. It's my fault I'm here anyways, SS, so there's no need to go out of your way. The blonde frowned at him, but it was his husband who replied first. Midoriya, just because you had to come home early doesn't mean you're in any way a bother. We are all just glad you're okay. And that you're still here to be able to rest and recover. Green eyes blinked up at the dark hero in confusion, obviously a bit unsure of what to say in that situation. Yamada sighed quietly and reached over to gently ruffle short curls with a small smile. Go grab a change of clothes, kiddo. I'll meet you in the bathroom in just a minute. The teen nodded and stood slowly before shuffling off down the hall. Hitoshi started gathering up dishes. I'll get started on cleaning while you'll do that. His blonde foster father smiled up at him. Thanks, kiddo. I'll be down in a bit, so just leave the pots and pans to me, okay? Shouta just grunted and took half of the plates before Hitoshi could hoist them. I'd rather you got down the stairs without an incident. Without saying anything else, he walked off, carrying his part of the dishes to the far-off sink. Lime and Lilac shared a quietly amused glance at the grumpy man's antics before Hitoshi followed after him obediently. The last few days of internship week passed fairly peacefully. Izuku did end up napping in the floor of the soundproofed studio for an afternoon. A loud noise just so happened to startle him awake just as Aizawa was peeking in to check on him that morning, and he put his foot down against any protest. Nezu and him had a short class over video chat on Sunday. Only his second or third with the rat, but just like the other times he felt like he stepped away with a whole new wealth of knowledge to draw upon. And as intimidating as the small mammal was, he really did find himself looking forwards to the next lesson. And after a Sunday evening visit from Recovery Girl and a healing-fueled sleep, Monday morning saw the smaller of the two boys shuffling into their homeroom class feeling a lot more steady on his feet. He was still under orders to watch his energy levels and to take a break if he had a dizzy spell, but he honestly thought he would be fine. The rest of Wano were extra rambunctious when they walked into the classroom, all abuzz with the excitement from their internships, talking over missions and new skills. It wasn't until it was nearly time for the bell that the topic of Hasu was brought up. A few of their classmates turning to the three heroes in training that they knew had been on scene when the Namo appeared. They did their best to dodge direct questions about the hero killer, but Izuku did mention that Power Loader had helped take down one of the monsters, and that got most of them off of his back. They all scrambled into their seats when the bell rang, and Aizawa walked in. giving his customarily stern lecture about taking their lessons from the last week to heart, and then immediately throwing them a reminder of their next challenge. Finals. A collective groan went up and Izuku wholeheartedly agreed. He had no idea how finals would go for him with his wide array of classes, but knowing Nezu they would completely drag him through the ringer. As Aizawa pulled the schedule up on the smart board, showing what tests Wana would be taking when Izuku flipped open a notebook and started writing up a study guide, trying to figure out what time should be spent on which subject, as well as trying to make sure he set back time for his extra support department projects. Once their homeroom teacher dismissed them for a free study period until their next teacher came in, Izuku found himself converged upon by his small group of friends, all asking for help with one subject or another. Kaminari practically begging for him to re-explain the last few algebra lessons. The greenette just laughed and held up his phone to text Hatsume-san, asking if she would mind them all studying at the shop after school. With her quick reply about making sure to have snacks prepared, they all started texting their own guardians to let them know they had a study date. In the end, Kaminari, Mina, Kirishima, who was dragged into it by the other two, and Todoroki, who was asked to come by Izuku directly, all gained permission to go. Itoshi made sure to text Mei so she knew to invite her support friends as well. It was her family's shop after all. She sent back a stream of gibberish just as they heard the faint telltale sound of something exploding down in the labs. Viridian and Violet eyes met in mutual amusement as Izuku sent their friend a playfully chiding text. He didn't see the new message on his scheduling app giving him his timetable for his own finals until halfway through lunch. When he saw it, he immediately pushed his tray away and slammed open his notebook to finalize his study guide, making sure to give himself more earlier slots for history and literature since those would be on the first day and they were his weakest subject. He missed the fond looks he received from his tablemates as he mumbled to himself about what chapters he should go over first. The sprawl of teenagers and books was honestly a bit impressive. Mia had cleaned off most of her workbenches before they got there and made sure to set bowls of snacks at the center of each so there would always be brain food within reach. They had ended up bringing along Kuroyama and two of the other support students who had overheard her asking the large designer to come. When they had all swarmed in through the back door, the Pinkette had simply plopped down at one of the benches with the announcement that she would be working on her biology notes. From there they quickly organized themselves, each of them saying what they needed to work on and grouping up to help each other. Izuku wandered off to change, fully intending to help with the orders while he was there. But Mia put her foot down on that idea quickly, grinding it into dust with the power of a disappointed mom look. The small teen scuttled back to his stool quickly, though he was dressed in his coveralls and undershirt, far more comfortable than the stuffy UA uniform. Completely oblivious to the 3 sets of eyes taking in the way the shirt pulled tight across his shoulders as he reached out to snag his notes from his backpack. And his 3 admirers were completely oblivious to the rolled eyes from their own observers. The late afternoon and early evening went by smoothly, with the kids all taking turns going around and refilling drinks and snacks as needed. The biggest distraction from their studies were the 2 added support students trying to catch glimpses of the parts and such Mia carried past as she filled one order or another. Eventually, though it was nearing dinner time and most of the students had to get home, there was a rush of chatting as they all relaxed, letting their brains rest after a few hours of memorization and problem solving. Hitoshi leaned his weight against Izuku's back, resting his arms across the smaller boy's shoulders. "Hey, just texted Zashi. He said he and Sho will pick up dinner for us and the Hatsumes on the way over here, so we get to sit tight." Ignoring the looks from those around them that were not in the know about their living situations, Izuku nodded. "Okay, I'll go help Hatsume-san close the shop while we wait then." The greenette hopped from his seat and rushed off, almost sending his friend tumbling when his brace abandoned him. With a small chuckle and a shake of his head, he moved over to help Kaminari pack up the rest of his things. "Hey dude," he greeted with a small smile. "You want to study again this weekend?" The bubbly blonde nodded excitedly. "Yes please. I think Midoriya is really helping me with algebra. He explains things so well. I got a 75% on our last quiz, so my average is definitely going up." The electric teen looked thrilled, small sparks lacing across his fingers as he beamed up at the taller purple-haired boy. Shinso softened a bit at how happy the other looked. "That's great, Kami." They were interrupted from further chatting by a quiet cough, turning to come face to face with their most stoic classmate. "Todoroki," Kaminari prompted with a small head tilt. Yes, sorry. I was wondering if I could also possibly impose this weekend. I feel like the atmosphere here was way more agreeable than that in the study at home." The other teens exchanged a glance before Kaminari was grinning and nodding. "I don't see why not. Right, Shinso? Here, hand me your phone. I'll get your number so I can let you know when we decide to meet up." In a flurry of his usual energy, the blonde had exchanged numbers with the heterochromatic teen, and then with Hitoshi's prompting sent Todoroki his and Izuku's numbers as well. Knowing the green teen would appreciate not being left out, Kaminari then swung an arm around their cold peer's shoulders and led him away, chattering excitedly about something or other school-related. Shinso watched in amusement as the pair of clashing personalities coexisted, heading off to the train station. Dinner had gone well, the adults chatting and plotting while the kids tinkered and played around. Hitoshi eventually took Izuku's almost empty plate of Sabnik fat air and guided him to the couch to rest as they waited for everyone else to finish, smiling indulgently as the other boy dozed off on his shoulder. It wasn't too long after that the men wrapped up their pleasantries with Mia and ushered their charges to the car. They soon pulled up to their apartment building, thankful for the elevator after such a long day. They stepped out of the lift, but Yamada stopped the two boys before he unlocked the door. "Okay, kiddos, we have some fun things to show you. We finished setting up your surprises while you were studying, and I can't wait for you to see." Izuku tilted his head in confusion, but Shinso looked vaguely excited, though he tried to mask it with a knowing look. "This is about what those construction guys were here for last week, right?" The blonde snorted and ruffled his wild purple floof. "Yeah, they installed the big things, but we had to set up the rest of it ourselves. And just for future reference, Sho is terrible with a hammer." Incredulous purple and green blinked in shock at their gloomier guardian, the man hiding his slight blush in his capture scarf. "Shut up, Zashi. You're no better." His husband just laughed and turned his key, letting them all into the Jenkin to take their shoes off. As soon as the kids had their slippers on, Hizashi was gently snagging their hands, chirping out a bright "Shinso first," and leading them into the living room proper. There, hanging from the ceiling in the corner in the perfect spot to soak up late afternoon sunlight, hung a seat. It looked like a strange combination of sturdy hammock and recliner, and it undoubtedly looked like the most comfortable napping spot Hitoshi had ever seen. He excitedly ran over and Hizashi, laughing, showed the teen the small trick to getting in and out without dumping himself. He then showed him the pocket on the side where there was a high-tech looking controller hidden. When the teen looked up at the men in shock, Aizawa grinned and pointed to the TV stand where a top-of-the-line holo projector stood waiting. "We only got 2 games to start with, but I'm sure we can find more that you'll like once you get used to the controls." There was an unexpected sniffle from the usually more stoic of their foster's kids, and Yamada practically melted, pulling the boy from his new favorite spot and giving him a big hug. "Are you okay, kiddo? Do you not like it?" But Shinso shook his head violently before rubbing the small traces of tears from his eyes. "No, I love it. It's a lot. That system is really expensive." "Well, yeah, we wanted to get the best for you. You deserve something nice after the hell of a year you've had so far, kiddo. We were hoping this would help you relax a bit on those nights when your insomnia acts up." The taller boy looked a bit overwhelmed by the statement, still coming to terms with actually being cared for after years of neglect. So Izuku stepped in quickly to keep him from spiraling. The greenette walked over and powered on the new holo system, checking that it was set up properly, and then immediately nerding out when the start screen for a game showed up floating in the center of the room. Shinso followed his prompt and started up the game, the two of them freaking out over the graphics and how smooth the controls were. They screwed around for about 10 minutes before Aizawa cleared his throat to get their attention. "We still have another surprise to get to, and then Izuku needs to go to bed so Chiyo won't kill us." He wasn't expecting the surprise on the small teen's face when he looked up at him. "And another surprise. This wasn't all." Yamada chuckled and draped an arm around his shoulder, guiding him to the hallway. "Nope, not all. We got you some things too." "Oh, you didn't have to do that. I'm happy with what I have." Really?" Another chuckle and a hair ruffle, and then they were turning into the training room. "Of course we didn't have to, kiddo, but we really wanted to." With that, Aizawa stepped around them to open up the closet door. Only, it wasn't a closet anymore. It was a whole room filled with suspiciously familiar equipment. Izuku was sure he stopped breathing for a second in his shock, before stepping forwards through the door and turning in a circle to take in all of the tools, noting the brand he had started to favor by the solid wooden handles and the 3D printer in the corner. He turned back to look at the 3 people in the doorway, disbelief clear on his face. Aizawa stepped forwards once more, crouching down to get below eye level. "We wanted you to have a place to relax too. The younger Hatsum helped us pick out some starter tools and supplies, but let us know if we missed something you need, or if you come across something you really want." "Okay." The blonde took that moment to slip around them, heading to the large work table and pointing out the most expensive thing in the room, the desktop Hatsum-sen had put together for them. "This should be powerful enough to run most equipment off of, so if you need us to spring for another system, let us know, okay? I know your friend mentioned you might like a Glow Forge, whatever that is, but they are on backorder right now, so no, I really don't need it. PL please. This is already too much." Green eyes were filled with overwhelmed tears, and the 2 men exchanged a quick glance before Shouta, still crouched, gently snagged a freckled and scarred hand. "Look, Midoriya, Izuku, we are your guardians now. That means we've willingly accepted the job of keeping safe, cared for, and happy That means providing you with things to help you reach your dreams, or toys to help you wind down after a long day. But this stuff costs nothing. Hisashi and I have 5 jobs between us, not counting the extra work I sometimes do on commission from the police department. This didn't even make a dent in our savings, not really. So please just take a breath, accept that we are going to buy you things, and say thank you. And then go check out all of the fun things your friend picked out for you. There was a pause as Izuku fully soaked in the sincere words. But then the teen nodded slowly and tried unsuccessfully to wipe the tears away before stuttering out a choked thanks. His best friend then stepped forwards much as he had earlier and played distraction, poking around the 3D printer and asking if the other boy would show him how to work it sometime. Eventually, they did have to pull the greenette away from his new workshop, insisting on him going to bed and promising that he could look around more tomorrow. The men left their wards in the upstairs hallway as they went off to get themselves ready for bed and patrol respectively, and Hitoshi followed the freckled teen into his room quietly. They sat on the bed, looking at each other, conveying their shock and hope through their wide eyes alone, before eventually just giggling to themselves in helpless disbelief. Eventually, Shinso gave his smaller friend a goodnight hug and wandered off, most likely to play around with his new game, and Izuku changed out of his coveralls into more comfortable joggers for bed, settling in and staring at the wall. He played every interaction he had ever had with his guardians and Hatsune-sen over in his head, trying to make their actions fit with the worldview he had grown up with and failing. Eventually he fell asleep, thinking of painless hugs and beautiful tools. Izuku stared blankly at his phone screen as they sat in the classroom waiting for school to start. He hadn't told Shinso yet. The other boy hadn't slept at all and was currently trying desperately to catch some Z's at his desk. Honestly, he wasn't quite sure what he was going to do about the message that had popped up on his phone. Mom, hello Izuku, how are you doing? I was wondering if you would like to grab tea soon. I want to catch up, and I have someone I would like you to meet. How should he respond? Did he want to see her? He kind of did. Their separation was quick and unexpected after all. He wanted to know if she really meant she didn't want him anymore when she gave up their home. Maybe all of this was just one big misunderstanding. And who did she want him to meet? Should he go? He didn't have an answer by the time the bell rang, so he put his phone away and did his best to push the issue from his mind. After all, he had a whole busy day of classroom jumping ahead. The greenette rushed around as he packed orders. Today was one of the days he and Hitoshi ate at home, so he needed to get this last order packed up in time for them to make the train. He's sure if they missed it, one of their guardians would pick them up with the car, but he really didn't want to inconvenience them if he didn't have to. He's scrambling up the step stool, box of accumulated parts under one arm when it all goes wrong. Hey Izuku, Hitoshi had just started to round the corner to check and see how much longer he would be waiting, only to watch an alarm as the smaller boy teetered precariously. He dashed forwards before he fully registered what was happening, getting behind Izuku just in time for 140 pounds of muscle to slam into him, sending both of them to the ground. The two boys laid stunned amongst the mess of sprawling parts for a moment, winded at the sudden fall. After a moment, the purple-haired teen groaned breathlessly from his spot beneath the disaster that is one Midoriya Izuku. Hearing him, the freckled boy startled into a scramble to right himself, only for his hand to land on a ball bearing and send him slamming back down face first with a yelp. Hitoshi wheezed and placed a hand on his assailant's back to keep the other boys still while they figured out the situation and how to get out of it without breaking any of his ribs. After managing a few deep breaths, he lifted his head up, intending to look around to see where the worst of the mess was. Instead, he came face to face with the emeralds that had captivated him many times over the past few months, looking down at him with quiet concern. He felt his face light up at the realization of how close their faces were when Izuku's breath tickled across his skin. It wasn't like they didn't cuddle regularly, but something about this position felt a lot more than their friendly nap-time puddles. Toshi, you okay? Purple eyes flickered down to his friend's frowning mouth, noticing that Izuku had been gnawing at his lips again. There was a raw patch that he kind of wanted to kiss better, and was that a freckle he hadn't noticed hiding in the corner of his mouth? Hitoshi. The boy in question grunted at the reminder that he had been asked a question, looking back up a bit to find that green eyes had widened and that Izuku himself was now blushing furiously behind his freckles, lit up like a neon sign. It was almost too adorable to bear. Hitoshi let himself admire his crush for a second longer before sighing out a yeah, and removing his hand so his friend could start the process of standing again. Though this time he was a lot more careful about watching where he placed his hands. Mia came around the other end of the row of shelving just as he managed to stand and held his hand out for his still-down friend. Midoriya-kun, the customer, just asked, "Oh crap, are you two okay?" She hurried over, kicking metal pipe ends and other rattly bits out of the way uncaringly in her rush to look them over. By the time they had assuaged her worries and cleaned up the mess, something that took a while since some of the smaller parts had to be repulled when they couldn't find where they had run off to, the train had long since come and gone. Hitoshi called Aizawa as Izuku ran to the restroom to attempt to scrub off some of the grease on his arms and face. He was sort of successful, though he would have to shower before bed to get the last of it, and any more he picked up when he went to play in his own workshop with the special body wash Yamada had insisted on him using. He ran over to give Mei a hug before they left. The girl was elbow deep in a project she had snuck out of the school labs and nearly unresponsive to his affection. He chuckled and waved to her mom as they heard the familiar honk of the horn from their Foster's SUV. The ride home was uneventful, and they showed up just as Yamada was plating up large servings of eggplant parmesan with toasted French bread and dipping plates of spiced olive oil on the side. They chatted their way through the delicious meal, Mike and Midoriya ganging up to tease Hitoshi about a recent incident he'd had with his capture weapon, and Aizawa mentioning that the two of them had done well on an ethics essay he had assigned, though he wouldn't give them their exact grade yet. It wasn't until after dinner, when he was settled at his new computer and opening his phone to his coding mode playlist, that he was reminded of the text from that morning, and all of the difficult questions it brought up. But now that he had had a whole day to let the situation sink in, he had a better idea of what he wanted for himself. It would be good if he and Enko could make up. He would always have a place in his heart for her. She was his mother after all. But going about his day had reminded him of what he had now. Yamada and Aizawa and their loving home and horde of cats, the Hatsumes and their can-do-it attitude and constant support in anything he need help with, and Shinso. He tried to ignore his blush as his throat drifted back to the small accident from earlier. The boy had looked amazing, all flushed and breathless underneath him. Scarred hands reached up to slap freckled cheeks to get the drifting greenette back on task. He could panic about his now undeniable crush later. Shinso was always there for him, no matter what he needed or when. There were also the friends he had made at school in 1A and 1H, especially a pretty blonde who was always down for hijinks. Yeah, he would like to get along with Enko, but if this didn't work out he would be okay. With that thought in mind, he sent his reply before diving into one of the many projects he was behind on. Me, hi mom. Sure, I have a bit of free time after tutoring this Sunday. There's a nice cafe down on 8th Street. Does 1 p.m. sound good? The crunch for finals was real. Almost all of the students were participating in study groups, and even those that weren't were getting help from teachers or tutors hired by the school. The library was nearly constantly filled to capacity, looking like a silent war zone as teenagers ran around trying to find one book or another. Izuku's group wasn't much different. Not even counting the groups they hosted at the shop once a week, they often found themselves going over throughful areas in their studies around the lunch table. The greenette was quickly gaining popularity with everyone who asked for his help with anything science or math related. His easy explanations and sweet, non-judgmental nature bringing in more and more of one to their ever-growing lunch huddle. The tables for that area of the cafeteria were now almost always full of Class 1 and 1H students as they mingled and helped each other cover their worst subjects. The greenette did his best to save back time for his own studies. He was the only one of his friends to be taking the advanced Japanese history class after all. But he also couldn't leave anyone else hanging when they asked for help. He was going to be a hero after all. Having teachers for guardians turned out to be a blessing. They were scary good at sniffing out test stress and nudging them in the directions they needed to go, either by suggesting a subject change or by forcing them to take a break altogether. Izuku lost count of the number of snacks and such Mike had brought to his workshop in just that week alone, always bringing a warm smile and a bit of laughter in with the treats too. Soon, though, it was Sunday morning and Izuku was hopping on a train for his tutoring session with Nezu. He was really starting to look forwards to these weekly meetings. There were still some weeks when they had to cancel due to unexpected circumstances. Nezu was still a hero after all, but he was still given a task to accomplish by the next Sunday over his app when that happened, so he really felt like this bit of extra tutoring was really helping him along. He had a file folder tucked snugly in between 2 textbooks in his bag today. Last week's assignment had been to scope out a secret from as many of the teachers on campus as he could. He had the file he had compiled backed up on his computer at home. But he knew Nezu liked the old-fashioned format of paper files when they played games like this. He especially liked it when Izuku coded all of it in a new version of the codes he had been using in his notebooks. If he made it even a little bit of a challenge for the principal to read, he would get extra credit. He was excited to see if any of his intel would be news to the mammal. He knew he had a whole new world of blackmail for his guardians after he hacked into their emails and the cloud where their text conversations were stored. The next time Yamada tried to get him into those damn leather pants, he knew he would pulling out the video of the man bursting a city block swath of windows because he saw a spider, and the cover-up emails from the HPSC letting him know they blamed it on a villain who got away. Maybe it was petty. Maybe he did kind of like the way the pants made him feel about himself. But he would not wear them in public. Just know. He grinned as he hurried up the stairs to his meeting, excited to see what his next task would be. He hoped it had more to do with hacking. He thought he was getting pretty good at that particular skill and was excited to learn more. The door to the office opened as he walked up and he met the fanged grin from the animal in front of him with a blinding one of his own. He was regretting this already. Freckled hands fidgeted with his battered phone nervously as he stood on the busy train. His mom hadn't really answered any more of his questions when he had texted her back during the week, telling him that she was too busy to text much and that the person she wanted him to meet was a surprise. He had eventually just let it go, knowing that if she didn't want to reply, she wouldn't. That was just how she had always been. So now here he was, headed to their meeting, and really wishing he was headed back to the Yamezawa apartment instead. He had just gotten a new coding challenge from Nezu after all. But no, he had agreed to see her. He really did wish they could have some form of working relationship. She was still his mom after all, so he needed to give this a try. His stop buzzed across the signs and he sighed, making his way to the doors as they opened into the station near the coffee shop. He was a bit early, but he figured he could snag them a table and doodle a bit while he waited. Maybe try and figure out a roundabout to the problem he had been having with his newest project. Who knew that getting a life raft to fit into a marble could be so difficult? He knew that if he could figure this out, then he would be one step closer to heroes being able to carry a whole arsenal of rescue gear on them at all times. Maybe if he could figure out a super thin but durable new fabric base. Oh, it would have to be water and fireproof too. Maybe a new coating to put on something like a chiffon or organza. He hummed to himself as he got to the shop and stepped up to the counter. He was brought out of his musings though when the barista squealed upon spotting him. "Oh my god, you're back. How have you been, little greenie?" He blinked up at her before smiling shyly. Hi, I guess it has been a while, hasn't it? It was Shikaze-sen, right? Yeah, oh, it's so good to see you. I watched you and your friends in the sports festival at UA. I can't believe all three of you little troublemakers got in, and you just dropped off the face of the earth. I guess now that you're all going to a big league school, this tiny little shop just isn't good enough anymore. And no, it's just, I moved. And so did Shinso, so this isn't on our way to school anymore. Luckily his panic was stopped by a giggle. Who knows what he would have said if he had been allowed to keep rambling. Midoriya, I was just teasing. It is good to see you though. How have things been? He flushed a bit and stammered out a polite response, chatting back and forth as he placed his order before finally having to move out of the way when a new customer came in. Once his coffee was handed over, he looked around for a spot to sit, finding a nicely lit table by the window and settling in to wait for his mother. He played around on the cat game again for a while, frowning when his phone froze halfway through the entrance sequence for a new cat and sighing when he realized he needed to try and work on the old thing again. He had gotten it upgraded quite a bit from the factory stats by just tinkering around with it, but it was a few generations old at this point, so it was still a bit slow. He wondered if May would have any ideas on how to speed it up without making it burn a hole through his pocket. It was then that he realized it was 20 minutes after their agreed time to meet. He looked around, hoping he had just missed her coming in, but no, she hadn't shown up yet. With a sigh, he restarted his phone and settled back down. He would give her a bit more time. It wasn't uncommon for her to be late after all. An hour and a chocolate donut later, and he was contemplating just getting up and leaving. Maybe he would go hang out with Shinso at Kaminari's place. The two boys were supposed to be studying, but knowing the blonde, he had long since derailed them from the subject of biology. Just the thought of his two attractive friends made him blush. Regardless, he thought that they would make him feel better about being stood up, even if he didn't tell them about who he had been meeting. He was scooping his crumbs onto a napkin to clean up a bit before he left when the bell above the door jingled cheerfully, heralding the arrival of another short greenette. He sat up from where he had been leaning against the table, starting to raise a hand to get her attention, only to pause as he noticed the person who followed her in, stepping briskly through the door she held open for him. It was a man, tall, maybe mid-40s, with blonde hair and a 5 o'clock shadow. Something in the way he walked, heading towards the counter like he owned the place, gave the teen an uncomfortable feeling in his gut. But Izuku shoved down the instinct. He would wait to judge until he had actually spoken to this newcomer. He couldn't hear the exchange at the counter, but he was surprised to see Shikaze's ever-present smile falter for a second. But then the young woman was turning away to make their drinks, and the teen was left wondering if he had imagined it. After a few minutes, with their refreshments acquired, the two he was waiting on made their way over to his table. "Izuku, it's so good to see you." His mom bubbled at him, though he noticed the tense said to her smile. She turned to her companion with a small hand gesture. "Kurai, this is my son. Izuku, this is Meishu Kurai, my new boyfriend." The teen blinked up at her in shock for a moment before finding his voice. "The boyfriend?" The short woman waved off the question with a flippant hand wave. "Yes, boyfriend. I'm an adult and I'm allowed to date." "Oh, that's not what I..." She cut him off with a small glare before he could finish. Once she was sure that he wouldn't continue arguing, and pulled out the chair across from him and sat, before waving Kurai into the seat next to her. "Anyways, we are here to talk about you. So Spill, how is that school treating you? I heard you got hurt again a few weeks ago." "Oh, Yes. IW was unlucky enough to be in Hasu when the Namu attacked, but that W wasn't UA's fault. His mom scoffed. I disagree. You shouldn't have been anywhere near Hasu that night. But they just had to feed into your hero obsession and let you go on those dumb internships. Mom, she cut off his protest with a swipe of the hand. Whatever, Izuku. I'm not here to argue with you today. I'm here to make sure you aren't dead and to let you get to know the new man in my life. Honestly, the teen was floundering, unsure of how to deal with this new situation, and kept off balance by the woman's comments. Luckily for him, the man in question, Kirai, chose that moment to step in. Dark eyes glared at the boy from under a heavy brow, a small frown seeming to be his resting face. So, you're Inko's kid, the quirkless one. Izuku felt himself flush behind his freckles, embarrassed by the direct question. But still he nodded politely, determined to make a good impression. I see. You really aren't much to look at, huh? At least your mom is pretty enough. You must take after that useless father of yours. Okay, forget about making a good impression. Large green eyes stared at the man in incredulous silence, shocked by the audacity. Apparently that was taken the wrong way though, as Kirai kept going. But who knows, some girls like plain guys. So, you have anyone you're interested in at that fancy school of yours? Izuku's thoughts immediately went to Shinso, and something must have shown on his face because the man instantly started ribbing him. Oh, he does. So, who is she? A pretty little hero student. Izuku looks down at his empty coffee cup, flustered at the conversation but still eager for this all to work out. He played along. He's in the Herocy course. He smiled to himself, once again thinking of a sassy smirk and sparkling purple eyes. But he didn't get the reply he expected. Instead of more teasing, there was silence. After a moment he looked up, confusion on his freckled face. He was met with strained expressions that he couldn't quite place. Eventually Inko spoke up once more. Izuku blinked up at her in confusion before hesitantly answering. Yes. His mother's brow went from strained hesitance to furrowed fury in a split second. Oh my god, she muttered, before saying it louder and more firmly. Oh my god, I knew letting those two faggots house you would corrupt you. I won't stand for this. The teen in front of her went pale at her outburst, shocked by the intensity and the slur. Mom, no son of mine will be gay. So unless you straighten up right now, you don't get to call me that. The teen reached out across the table in an effort to calm her with a gentle touch, only for his hand to be slapped away by Kirai. Don't you touch her. We don't want to be infected by anything that's wrong with you. I agreed to meet with you because this damn court case is more trouble than it's worth, so getting you back willingly would have made our lives easier. I was even willing to overlook you being an atrof, but you're way more fucked up than I thought you would be. I won't have it. You can stay with your little queer caretakers. I don't want something so disgusting anywhere near me. The man slammed a fist down on the table for emphasis, knocking Inko's tea over and making a mess. Izuku yelped and lurched backwards out of the way of the hot liquid, only a bit of it managing to catch his shoes. Hey. No, shut up. I'm tired of how much trouble you bring. Inko has been complaining about you for years. I thought there was no way you were really that bad, but now, I don't even want to be in the same room as you. He paused for breath, obviously gearing up to even harsher words in his rage, but he was interrupted by a calm and frigidly cool voice. Then leave. I don't want you causing issues in my shop anyways. Standing to the side of the table, hands on her hips and looking downright murderous, was Shikaze Suzushi. The man across from Izuku blustered for a moment, obviously not used to being told no. But the young woman stood firm. If you two do not leave within the next minute, I will call the cops. To illustrate her point, she pulled her phone from her apron, waving it threateningly. With a growl, the man gave in. Fine, we were done here anyway. With that petulant little bit of venom, he stood and yanked Inko up by the arm before storming out of the front door. The two who were left watched until they were out of sight of the large front windows. As soon as she was sure they were gone, Shikaze spun to face the shaken teen. Oh my god, are you okay? Izuku took a moment before even trying to answer, taking a deep breath to try and calm the trembling in his hands. Once he was sure he wouldn't start crying, he nodded and grabbed a handful of napkins to start trying to clean up the mess still dripping onto the floor. I am sorry, for disrupting your shop. Let me clean this up and I'll go. To his surprise, the napkins were pulled out of his hand, the barista bending down a little bit to look him in the eyes. Yeah, no. You are going back to the break room to chill out for a bit and call a responsible adult to come pick you up. I am going to clean this up and then take my break so we can chat for a bit. She then snagged him by the wrist and led him behind the counter, ushering him through the back kitchen area and into a small room with a big, comfortable-looking couch, a small table with 2 chairs, and a tiny kitchenette. With a few gentle nudges, he was settled in one of the chairs and she looked at him pointedly. It took him a second to realize what she wanted. He dutifully tugged his phone out of his pocket before hesitating. Will Shinso work? I don't want to bother my Fosters. But she was shaking her head before he could even finish. just his luck. The nice barista was too much of a goody two-shoes to just let him leave. I need an adult. I need to make sure you will be taken care of after some of the things I overheard them saying to you. He sighed with all of the teenage drama in his body before taking a moment to debate. Eventually, he dialed Aizawa's number. He knew Mike was probably busy at the radio station, but his husband should just be home taking a nap before patrol. The greenette felt bad for interrupting his rest, but he would have felt worse if present Mike had to cancel his sad show. The phone rang twice before a groggy-sounding hero picked up. Hello. Izuku fidgeted for a second, prompting the man to question if anyone was on the line before he meekly spoke up. Hi Aizawa. See, can you maybe come pick me up? There was a sudden uptick in rustling from the other line. Where are you and what happened? The freckled boy winced, not really wanting to explain but knowing that Shikaze would probably spill the beans later anyways. Toffee's coffee on 7th Cent Street. And I am met with him, my mom. It didn't go well. There was a moment of silence. Even the movement from the man on the other end seemed to pause. You did? What? No, never mind. Sukachi and I will be there soon and you can explain then. Yes, sir. Is there a manager there I can talk to, kid? Izuku handed his phone over to the barista, who smiled gently at him before stepping away to speak to his guardian. She was gone for a few minutes, leaving him to sit and try and calm his now raging anxiety, before she eventually came back, bringing the teen his phone and a wonderfully blended herbal tea. Okay, kiddo. Your foster dad and a detective will be here in a few minutes. I got that spill cleaned up, so now we just get to chill for a bit, okay? The teen allowed her to lead the conversation, chatting amicably about UA and what he and his friends liked about the school. Eventually, there was a knock on the door and the worker who was covering the front led in the two men they were waiting on. Shikaze led Tsukachi away, apparently to get a copy of the tapes from the office, but Aizawa stayed. The man crouched down in front of his ward and looked him over for injury. Are you okay, Midoria? The freckled teen nodded, green curls bouncing a bit with the motion. I am okay. Really, this has just been blown a bit out of proportion. The pro hero hummed a bit to himself before sighing and standing up. Right, well, as soon as you have a quick chat with Tsukachi-sen we can get out of here and go home, yeah. Oh, okay. His guardian went and sat on Suazaki's vacated chair, looking curiously at the cup sitting in front of the teen. This seems like a nice little place. I might have to stop by and try some of those treats in the case up front. The greenette smiled at him tentatively. I recommend the Bear Claws. This is actually where Hitoshi and I met and we came here a lot before. Well, Yue, the hero nodded. I see. Well, maybe we should bring Zashi next time. He likes quaint little businesses. They settle back into comfortable silence for a few minutes, content to just be for the most part while they waited for the other two to come back. Luckily, when they did come back into the break room, the questions didn't take long. Izuku explained how his mother texted him and asked to meet, and why he didn't say anything out of fear of angering whoever he told. From there, he just quickly went over the events of the meeting before closing in on himself and waiting for any kind of negative reaction. He had just ruined Aizawa's afternoon after all, and he had needed to come out to his foster to explain where the meeting went wrong. But instead of more yelling, or any of the three adults telling him how disgusting and weak he was, instead Tsukachi turned his questions to Shikaze, getting her side of the story recorded as well for posterity's sake. Funnily enough, Izuku thought the situation sounded a lot worse coming from an outsider's perspective, but he couldn't really dispute anything she said either. Eventually, the detective had everything he needed to add the incident to the upcoming court case, and with it they were allowed to leave, but not before Aizawa bought a box of treats to bring home with them. It wasn't till they were on the busy train home that Aizawa addressed the elephant in the room. As they waited for their stop, the man turned to his ward with a sigh. Midoriya, I think I can understand why you didn't say anything when she contacted you. But the next time you decide you want to do something like this, please bring one of us along. All we care about is whether or not you are safe and happy. And if you keep us out of the loop, then we can't help with that. The teen flushed miserably with embarrassment, but still nodded his acceptance for the new rule. He knew that the two pros worried about him and Shinso, but he really thought he could handle meeting with his mom by himself. He never imagined it would have gone so wrong. At most, if he was honest, he would have thought she would have stood him up, or just left after a minute of making sure he was alive. He had no idea that the man she had brought for him to meet would be the catalyst for that shit show. The doors near where they were standing slid open with a cheerful chime, and the teacher guided the small teen off the train, heading in the direction of their home. With a small ruffle of verdant curls, he stepped past to walk a bit ahead. You'll be okay, kid. Besides, the two of them were wrong about everything they said about you. The teen paused for a second amongst the foot traffic, a bit stunned, before he hurried after the retreating form of his guardian, trying to be subtle as he wiped away tears. It felt really nice to be accepted. Unfortunately, Izuku had to sit through a lecture when Yamada got home. He didn't yell, just went into a long and detailed spiel on why not telling them about Inko contacting him could have gone badly. illustrating his points with news clips about kids being abducted by estranged parents, and how badly some of those instances had ended. It was an uncomfortable and emotionally draining talk, but it could have been worse. Izuku didn't think he would have done well if his foster father had yelled or hit him. As it was, he just sat there and did his best to not flinch at the insinuation that his mom was dangerous, and tried to memorize the alternative options for what to do in the future. After he was done, instead of walking away like most authority figures in his life would have after telling him he did something stupid, the blonde hero stooped down to offer a hug instead. And then, like the kind man he was, he offered to listen as Izuku went over what was said during the meeting. So the teen spilled. Already tired and confused from his long day, he just needed to talk it all out, it seemed. He rambled on, fighting off tears, about the new boyfriend and how scary he was, big and muscular with a resting glower, and of the sideways comments on his quirklessness, and of how things had all gone wrong with his embarrassed admittance to liking a boy. He completely broke there, sobbing at the reaction he had received and how much it hurt to know his mom thought him disgusting. He had known she didn't particularly like him after his diagnosis, but her absolute rejection of the little part of himself he had just started exploring hurt way more than he would have ever guessed. He couldn't help but feel like she had just gone from not liking him to completely hating him, and he didn't know what to do about it. Mike was surprisingly soft-voiced as he began soothing the teen, starting up quiet reassurances and kind observations as soon as he was sure the boy he was holding was done unloading all of his stress and confusion. It felt like an eternity later when the kid stopped crying and just slumped against his guardian. The hero settled and decided to just sit there and be Izuku's comfort for now. He had no doubt that the episode at the coffee shop would cause ongoing issues, doubts and self-hatred he and Shoto would have to nip in the bud. But right at that second he was happy to let the poor boy rest and regain some semblance of self-control. Shinso hummed as he took the elevator up to their floor. He and Denki had a blast. They didn't get much homework done, but the 3 hours of kicking the electric blonde's ass at Mario Kart was worth it. The sideways flirting was nice too. It was refreshing to have someone who was blatantly interested in him and willing to make it so obvious. He knew Kaminari was a flirt to everyone, but he honestly thought there might be a spark there. Maybe if he could get over his raging crush on Izuku, he could give Denki a real chance. The two of them did have fun together, and he would admit to himself that the blonde hero-to-be was very attractive, slim and a bit wiry, with a pretty face and an infectious smile. He was currently refusing to think about the small conversation at the mall, and the fact that he had looked more into polyamory during one of his early morning insomniatic web-jumping escapades. He wasn't sure anyone else would be interested in a polycule, and he was 100% not brave enough to ask. He dug his key from his pocket as he made it up to the door, contemplating if he wanted to boot up his new game. After playing hours of video games, did he really want more video games? Maybe he could take a nap instead. He made quick work of kicking off his green Converse and heading into the living room, intent on trying to nap in his floating chair of heaven. So imagine his surprise when he finds his best friend huddled up miserably against their guardian, eyes and face red and puffy from excessive tears and seemingly half asleep. The purple teen felt his heart jump into his throat. "Izuku, are you okay?" He hurried over to his friend and crouched down next to him, feeling the tension in his chest ease slightly when green eyes blinked down at him. At least the smaller boy was responsive. "Hi Toshi, did you have fun with Kaminari?" Shinso leveled the greenette with an unimpressed look, but answered the question anyway. "Yes, he's bad at Mario Kart. Now, do you want to tell me what happened or not?" He would push one more time, but if his friend didn't want to share, he wouldn't make him. One blink, two, and then the smaller teen cracked, frowning and letting loose a small sigh. "I saw my mom today and it didn't go well. That's all. I'm okay." Shinso frowned up at him, wanting to know more, but knowing better than to push this particular issue, so instead he sighed and did his best to give his friend a soothing smile. "You want to go play Animal Crossing and forget about it for a bit?" The smile he received in response was very rewarding, and Yamada let go of his charge so Hitoshi could pull the still sniffling freckled genius to his feet and lead him upstairs. The hero did call after them to let them know he would order dinner in about an hour or so. He was acknowledged with a wave of a pale hand just as the two teens started making their way up the stairs. Hazashi snorted quietly to himself in amusement, silently thinking about how sweet the two of them were to each other and comparing their relationship with a certain other relationship he himself had experienced during his own high school days. With a huff he levered himself up from the couch and headed into the kitchen. He may order dinner in, but since he came home early he might as well make everyone a pick-me-up in the form of his famous pink lemonade cookies. Shouta scowled down at his phone. He had just finished going over everything with Tsukachi. The unsolicited contact from Inko would definitely help them with the court case, but honestly he wished the kid had told them when she tried to get in contact. He could have saved himself some hurt if they had been able to take care of that bitch for him. He groaned quietly and levered himself up from where he was sitting at the small desk in their bedroom. If he wanted to get the kid a new phone and make sure he was switched over to their plan, he needed to leave soon before the store closed. He had confiscated his current phone when they got to the apartment. The kid gave it up easily enough, probably thinking it was some form of light punishment for not telling them. He would let him think that for the moment, until they handed over a replacement in the morning at least. Honestly, they should have done this immediately when Izuku was placed in their care. But it had slipped through the cracks with everything else that had happened. Shinso has a phone that was being paid for by the government since he had come straight from the foster system. But Izuku's was still being paid for by his mother, which was something that, now that it had been brought to his attention, he would not let stand. He made sure he had everything he needed for patrol, patting down his belt pouches and reseating his capture weapon, sliding his own phone back into his pocket before heading down to the kitchen to grab a snack to last him until he could stop at a late-night food stall or something later on. He finds his husband singing along to something playing over his hearing aids and dancing around the kitchen. The pink batter staining the spatula he was waving, giving away exactly what he was making. With a small huff of amusement, he walked up behind his Ashi and wrapped his arms around his waist in a gentle hug. "You better save a few of those for me," he grumbled good-naturedly near the other man's ear to make sure he could hear. The blonde laughed and nodded before turning his face to press a kiss to his partner's cheek. "Of course, Sho. I wouldn't dream of keeping these away from you. No promises on how many will be left, though." The underground hero chuckled a bit himself, knowing that these particular treats never lasted long. He kept up his loose hug for a minute, just basking in Zashi's relaxing presence, before he sighed and pulled away to find that snack. He made sure to get a proper kiss before he headed out the door, though. Kisses from his Ashi were his good luck charms after all. The quiet intermission went by far too quickly for everyone at UA. The first morning of the written exams dawned bright and cheerful, and Shinso made sure to flip off the offensive sun on his way out to the car, irritated by its optimism. Izuku blinked blearily from his seat in the car, watching out the window as the streets passed, obviously not taking in a thing, only seeming to really try and rouse himself when the car slipped into the shadowy calm of the tunnel to the employee parking lot. By the time they all make it to the hall outside of the teacher's lounge, both teens finally seem a bit more ready for the day. For all that Izuku looked like a walking zombie and Hitoshi resembled an irritated cat, their fosters shared fond amusement in watching them both beeline for the coffee machine as soon as the door opened. Shouta set his bag down at his desk before following his kids, determined to not let the two gremlins drink the whole supply before him. Mike himself just settled in for the day, well aware that his husband would bring him something eventually. He pulled out his stacks of grading and set to work with the backdrop of grumbled teasing and light giggles. What a nice way to start a busy day. The blonde hummed quietly to himself as other teachers and staff started filtering in, piles of papers at the ready. Semester finals were a team effort after all. Lunch came quickly yet incredibly slowly. The mass of teenage stress headed for the cafeteria while discussing how things went on the first round of their tests. Izuku was in full-blown fidget mode as he anxiously recounted his specialized tests to Hitoshi, completely believing there was a 50% chance he bombed them. Hitoshi was busy trying to calm both him and Kaminari, who was sure there was a 100% chance that he failed. He mentally bemoaned the cafeteria's lack of coffee as he ushered the two of them along to grab some food, picking out things he knew both would like while they were too busy bouncing their anxieties off of each other. Eventually, the three of them found themselves at their usual spot in the middle of the tables their classes generally congregated around, and Hitoshi passed Izuku off to Mei. She immediately launched into a spiel about the interesting questions on the theoretical physics exam, asking for his opinions on her answers and effectively distracting him from his own mind. From there, Hitoshi was able to calm the electric blonde to his left, assuring him that he had been doing so much better on the mock exams Izuku had given him, and that he was sure he did well enough to pass, anxiety or no. Eventually, even Shoto paused his discussion with Yaoyorozu to chime in with a blunt observation or two of his own about how well Kaminari had been doing, though he seemed confused by Momo's knowing smirk once he turned back to her. Eventually, everyone was convinced to settle enough to eat their food, and Hitoshi accepted the relieved looks from his two friends once they realized what was on their trays, rolling his eyes fondly and nudging their food closer so they knew he wouldn't take not eating as an answer. The sheepish smiles were almost as good as caffeine. The tests that afternoon were just as exhausting, taking up all of their brain space until the last bell let them know that they were free for the day. Exhausted kids slumped back into their seats, passing tests to the teacher who walked amongst the desks and washing their hands of the stress for the moment. Soon Aizawa-sensei was at the front of the room for dismissal, reminding them that the next day, Thursday, would be a half day. They would have the afternoon off before needing to be at the school nice and early for their last test, the practical exam. He then locked eyes with Midoriya to make sure the kid remembered that he actually had to stay late Thursday for the support practical. Green eyes blinked, and then a nod of confirmation soothed the teacher enough for him to finish releasing his hellions for the day. and then it was over, for the moment at least. And teens around the room started up subdued chatter as they packed bags and checked phones and otherwise readied themselves to go home. Izuku and Hitoshi hung tight for a few minutes until the rest of their class had headed off, before they got up themselves and joined Aizawa in his trek to the teacher's lounge. They really hoped Himada was already there and waiting for them. Neither of them wanted to do anything but go home and collapse on the couch to watch something mindless on TV for a few hours. Their wish was granted. The blonde hero was standing by his desk, bag slung over his shoulder, and chatting with Midnight. Aizawa smiled slightly as his husband laughed at one of her bad jokes, before making their presence known with a cough and a raised eyebrow that had his partner giving their friend a quick hug before rushing out of the room. And when they make it home, to the couch and yummy snacks and a dumb baking show, all of them take the moment to just relax. The teens sprawled out together while the two men cuddled and chatted about the schedule for the rest of the testing. Until, eventually, snacks weren't enough and Yamada scrolled through takeout places calling out options until they all settled on something so he could order. And when the food showed up on their door and already sleepy kids were ushered into the kitchen to sit at the table, the two heroes couldn't help but share a look, overly fond of the two charges that they had been entrusted with, happy for the quiet moment they were getting to share. Hitoshi was settled into a desk chair in the lounge, waiting on his best friend to finish his first practical while guzzling coffee in an effort to replenish his energy. That morning hadn't been too bad. He had taken the chemistry and algebra finals as well as Japanese literature. The two more brainy tests he felt he did well on due to all of the drills and quizzes he had done with Izuku and Denki. The lit test he actually found kind of fun, going over short stories and poems and riddling out their pretentious meanings. Despite that it went okay, he really just wanted to go home and nap. But the rest of his household were stuck on campus until the end of the day, and he wasn't really in the mood to take the train alone during lunch rush. So he hunkered down with the Nectar of the Gods and a cute cat game on his phone to wait out the 2 hours until Izuku was finished. He had just really zoned out to the happy chimes of the train arriving with new friends and the happy jingles of kittens receiving treats when he was jolted out of his game by a tap on his shoulder. Looking up, he met the dark blue eyes of Midnight, the woman giving him a soft smile. "Hey kiddo, you waiting on the Grump and the rock star?" Hitoshi grins up at her, enjoying the nicknames. "I'm waiting on Izuku actually. He's taking his support practical." Her eyes went from lightly teasing to purely mischievous. "Ooh, well, Izuku, huh?" she purred, and Hitoshi suddenly knew he wouldn't like what she was going to say next. "Do you enjoy waiting on pretty green boys? Or perhaps you prefer blondes?" Hitoshi was right. His face flushed red and he absolutely hated that she was able to get a rise out of him that easily. That's none of your business." That's not a denial," she drawled. "Which means I was right. But about which I wonder. Midoriya, Kaminari, both?" The teen in front of her looked away, trying not to react further. But she seemed to figure him out anyways. "Ooh la la, how lovely. You know Yama and Zawa used to have a third. If you want tips you should ask them. Just be delicate about it, yeah." They didn't separate from him because they wanted to. With that she gave a little wave and a tada now and was gone from the room before he had any real chance to process that new information. Hitoshi sat in slightly confused silence for a minute before he groaned, downed what was left of his coffee, and went to go and grab another cup. He was going to need brain juice if he was going to have a gay crisis. Izuku was abuzz with leftover nerves as he hopped along beside his taller friend, telling him all about the test he had just finished, describing the theoretical force field projector he had been given to put together. The project, a test of every skill and safety rule they had learned that semester, and of the fact that he had actually figured out the coding hiccup that had been keeping the thing from working, and how he had gotten it halfway operable before his 2 hours were up. Hitoshi, for his part, nodded along to the parts he understood, mostly by virtue of spending so much time with geniuses, and hummed encouragement through the things he had no clue about, letting the smaller teen get his nerves out of his system. Once they hopped onto the train, he managed to get Izuku to tone his voice down by lowering his own to a whisper and asking question. The frenzied hybrid student followed his example by instinct, and he latched onto the queries and ran his tangent around in a different direction. And soon enough they were home and collapsing together on the couch, Hitoshi texting Himada that they had made it home so the man wouldn't be worried while he was giving one gen ed class or another their English test. From there they finally relaxed, the new gaming system booting up so Izuku could give playing the sandbox game a try, and Shinso cuddling down with a blanket and one of the keys. Baroness watching them all from the top of the TV stand with pure disdain as befitting her station. Once Izuku finally got tired of trying to beat one particularly ferocious turtle, he sighed and set the controller down, turning to his friend and smiling fondly at the sight of Rookie snuggled down amongst purple fluff, bright blue eyes staring out at him solemnly, completely unbothered by the quiet snores coming from her cushion. He was really happy he got to live somewhere with cats. He would have never known what he was missing since his mom's old apartment didn't allow pets. With that bittersweet thought, he decided he wanted to show some gratitude to the two heroes who had taken him in. And after a moment of thought, he decided he would make them dinner that night. With his plan in place, he got up quietly to head to the kitchen, going straight for the fridge so he could see what kinds of groceries they had stocked. Eventually, he settled on nikujaga and pulled out the potatoes and veggies to start washing and chopping them, tossing them into a pot with soy sauce, sugar, mirin, and dashi to cook down a bit, adding in some beef as soon as he managed to get it chopped thinly enough and spiced and seared in a skillet. As everything cooked down, he started giving the kitchen a deep clean, figuring he might as well since there were still dishes left from breakfast sitting in the sink. And since those didn't take too long, why not wipe down all of the surfaces? But since he wiped all of the crumbs off the counter and table into the floor, shouldn't he sweep? And if he's sweeping, he might as well mop. By the time he realized that he probably should stop himself before he went through or reorganized the spice rack, it wasn't his kitchen after all. There was only about 10 minutes before the heroes should be home. He checked on the sweet and savory stew and was pleased to find that it had cooked down quite a bit, the potatoes starting to go soft and the onions pretty well see-through. He decided he could add the shirataki soon and grabbed them from the cabinet, setting them in the counter near the stove so as to be in easy reach. He wandered over to the rice cooker, deciding to make a simple sweet rice for dessert, setting the rice to cook and getting out the rest of the ingredients, milk, cinnamon, and brown sugar, mixing them in a bowl to pour over and fluff the rice with when it was finished. Just as he was setting the bowl down, he heard the front door unlock. The greenette smiled at the traditional announcement of "we're home" and called back a welcome before making his way back to the stove. "Wow, something smells great in here. Are you cooking, kiddo?" The greenette turned to face the entrance to the kitchen with a shy smile. "Why, yeah, I thought I would make dinner. Was that okay?" Mike beamed at him. "Kiddo, if it tastes half as good as it smells, then it's more than okay." Curls bounced as a head was ducked in shy acceptance before their ward turned back to plop the packaged noodles in the simmering pot, quickly replacing the lid before starting a timer on his phone. It should be done in 15 minutes, but everyone says USH should let it cool for at least another 10 so that the veggies soak you up more flavor. So, he stops when a hand ruffled his hair, gently bringing his attention back. "Okay, so 30 minutes or so." "Awesome. I call first shower show." With that cheerful acceptance, Mike hurried from the room, obviously eager to get the gel out of his hair since he didn't have a patrol that night. His husband just huffed and rolled his eyes fondly before giving his own ruffle to short green curls and heading into the living room, probably to wake up Shinso. Izuku hummed to himself as he set the table, heating up a kettle of water so he and Yamada could have some tea with their food and setting cups of water by Shinso and Aizawa's spots. By then the rice cooker was chiming and he had to quickly mix the milk mixture in, closing the lid as soon as he was done so that the rice could stay hot and soak up the milk. The kettle beeped to let him know the water was ready, so he snagged 2 mugs down from the cabinet and pulled out some tea bags, jasmine for Yamada and a basic green tea for himself. He poured the water over them before moving the cups to the table. By that point the noodles were finished and he sat a cat-shaped trivet in the center of the table and moved the pot over so everyone could serve themselves. The rest of the household seemed to sense that food was theirs for the taking. Yamada ushered the other two into the room at the moment Izuku was done setting things up, the man beaming and singing the smaller teen's praises while the quieter man just ruffled green curls on his way to his seat, earning a blush-tinted smile for the both of them. Hitoshi slumped into his own chair, obviously groggy from his nap, but still seeming eager for the food he had been smelling. He smiled up at Izuku, thanking him when he was past the ladle. And with that, dinner was served. Comfort food with a side of compliments. Yamada made a game of seeing how much he could make his foster son blush with his sincerely sweet words. Once dessert was eaten and leftovers put away, Hitoshi waved the rest of them off, taking the chore of dishes easily. So Izuku was free to go relax. Not before he received no less than 3 thankful hugs from Mike though, which made him giggle even as he made his escape to his workshop. He felt surprisingly lighthearted as he settled in his chair, gearing up for a late night, finishing the last of his coding work for the semester. He would have to learn more recipes soon so he could cook for everyone more often. He was surprised by how fulfilled he felt after his little dinner escapade. He had a smile on his face as his fingers started waltzing along the keys, content with his day. They weren't ready. Izuku had theorized that they would change the finals up from what they had discovered to have been more robot fights the year before. Had even gone into a long spiel about the rapid progression of Class 1 after their unplanned encounter with villains at the USJ. But this little surprise had not been on his list of guesses. Oh boy, how he regretted not doing a full calculation of odds now. Hindsight sucked, because now he and Hitoshi were on a bus with All Might of all people, heading to training grounds Gamma to go head-to-head with the #1 hero. And whose idea was it to assign him to All Might? What was a Quirkless nobody going to do against a Quirkist powerhouse? But he had to try. If not for himself, then for Shinzo. The other boy's grade depended on this just as much as Izuku's, and he would not make the boy fail just because he couldn't keep up. So with a deep breath, he pulled his travel notebook out of one of his pockets and started planning, tilting the page so the purple teen looking over his shoulder could read as well. A couple of signed suggestions helped the greenette iron out the rough plan quickly. His friend caught a few blatant mistakes in his lines of thought, more practical lessons showing their helpfulness for the brainwasher. The smaller boy took his advice in stride, adjusting as needed to give them the best chance of passing. By the time the bus pulled up to their testing area, they had no less than 3 backup plans. Plan was simple though. Run. Hope the man thought they would try to fight him and instead book it to the exit. Short and sweet. Get in, get the fuck out. That didn't help their nerves any, of course. It was just their luck that they drew the short straw of being paired with All Might. Surely Kaminari or Todoroki would have been a better choice for him. But no, someone had decided the 2 least physical students in class needed to go up against the most physical hero in the school. Lovely, but they had been issued the challenge, so they at least had to try. He knew Hitoshi really wanted to go to that camp. Izuku did too, of course. But the purple teen had said something a few days before about how he had never really left the city and was excited to see what the countryside would really be like. So really, there was no way the green-haired teen would go down without a fight, not after such a soft admission during a late-night study session. It only took 5 minutes for the test to set up once the bus dumped them at their site. All Might disappeared into the cityscape, finding a place to start his own part from while the 2 teens stood outside the gate. And then the buzzer sounded and all 3 of them were in motion. Watched closely by the rest of the students and teachers in the observation room, save Zero, Minta, and Midnight, who were en route to their own test. The 2 heroes to be ran at the word go, heading straight through the fake city, aiming to cover as much ground as they could before they ran into their teacher, Villain. They raced down the main street, managing to cover a little over half of the distance to the other gate before a large gust of wind blew them off their feet and away from each other. Izuku landed with a clang against a guardrail, feeling his ribs protest as his breath was forced out of his lungs. He saw Hitoshi tumbling down the sidewalk opposite him, before the teen was forced to a stop by an unforgiving mail drop box. Both of them had managed to scramble to their feet by the time their opponent appeared from the ether like a terrifying old god, though neither had quite managed to find their breath from where it had been lost. Luckily for them, All Might decided to take that moment to monologue, giving the 2 kids the chance they needed to catch their bearings. After a moment, and a meaningful split second of eye contact, Hitoshi was raising his voice, trying to distract the hero and catch him with his quirk, and Izuku was slowly easing his way around the pillar standing in the middle of the street, letting his friend take the attention as he did his best to sneak past and away, aiming for victory. Too bad their villain in this exercise was one of the oldest acting pro heroes in the country. Before either knew what was happening, Izuku was flying through the air and straight into Hitoshi, both of them going down in a twisted parody of a bowling ball and pin. Once they managed to untangle themselves, Izuku snatched his partner by the wrist and dragged the both of them into the alleyway beside them, dodging and through a side door of a building and motioning for Hitoshi to keep quiet as they made their way through the empty structure and out a window on the other side. They ran a few more doors down before heading back inside and hunkering down to take a quick breather. Plan B. Fuck. End noted. A couple more seconds of rest and then they separated. Izuku headed back through the door they came through while Hitoshi went in search of another exit. The small greenette dodged away from main streets, trying to stick to shadowy side roads and 2 clean alleyways even as he circled out to the east before inevitably headed back towards the exit. He knew his partner would be doing the same to the west. Plan B required them to not get caught together. Unfortunately, it was sooner rather than later that he heard the telltale sound of overpowered punches and Hitoshi trying to talk himself out of a bad situation. And the smaller teen knew that this was his chance. He picked up speed as he ran, forcing his feet down hard against the pavement before turning on the kinetic motors in his boots. He went from a normal sprint to a bouncing run, launching himself forwards off of first the sidewalk, and then every semi-flat surface available, pinging between walls and parking meters and street signs like a demented rabbit. He heard a loud crash a few streets to his left and had to stop himself from going over to check on his friend. Hitoshi was trusting him to get to the exit, so he had to trust Hitoshi to play the part of distraction. The gate was within sight when things went wrong once again. There was another great gust of wind and pressure, and then Izuku was being smacked to the ground mid-jump. He felt the telltale snap of at least one rib as he bounced, only to quickly come to a stop when a limp weight pinned him down against the concrete. He choked out a protesting breath and tried to roll over, only to catch sight of familiar purple fluff. Well shit, Toshi. A small groan was his only reply as the lanky teen laid prone on top of him, either out cold or too stunned to move. He heard the too loud voice of All Might going on about something or another nearby and decided to just tune him out. Honestly, he was tempted to turn off his hearing aids so he wouldn't have to even be aware of the undertones of pity and derision layered under whatever the number 1 hero was saying. He took as deep a breath as he could before starting to wiggle out from underneath his friend, doing his best not to irritate his ribs and other bumps and bruises while also trying to keep from hurting Hitoshi more as well. Once he was able to sit up and get a good look at the other boy, he felt his veins freeze in breathtaking anger. Shinso was indeed out cold. A large gash on his forehead surrounded with rapidly bruising pale skin showed where he had taken a nasty hit, the blood dripping down that side of his face, staining indigo eyelashes an ugly brownish red. Izuku settled the other boy down gently, shifting him from where he was still pinning his legs so that he was laying flat before stripping off his cropped jacket and sliding it under the taller boy's head. With that done, he finally looked up to meet the gaze of the villain standing across from them, green eyes snapping in fury. "How dare you?" he snarled, characteristic stutter nowhere to be found. "This is a test. How dare you hurt him that badly? We are students. There is no reason to go so far." He ignored the man's excuses, statements that this was proof they shouldn't be in the hero course, that he knew the curriculum would be too much for the quirkless and weak-quirked students. He just slid his hand into his pocket and pulled out some of Kuriyama's tiny bombs, tossing them towards the blonde carelessly, not even checking to see which ones they were before he was rushing after them, Kyoketsu Shoge in hand and sparking dangerously. He swung the weight overhanded at the hero, the glimmering metal blending in with the sparkle of flying red glitter. It was grabbed from the air by a ridiculously large hand, only to be let go with a yelp as All Might remembered the weapon was electrified. The capture foam that had splattered around his feet tripped the large man up a bit as the teen kept going after him, swinging his weapon with the grace of an angry demon. Green light sparkling off of the windows around them as Izuku spun into his next strike. The reinforced cord wrapped around an oversized forearm, dealing electrical damage even as the greenette used the anchor point to swing himself around and out of All Might's direct line of sight, coming around from the hero's left side where he had noticed he favored his ribs a bit. He himself ignored the pain in his own ribs as he launched forwards into a kick, spinning for momentum. His height served him well in that moment as the panic-blocking arm sailed past his head with an inch to spare. And then his reinforced boot slammed into the number one hero's torso with all of Izuku's 160-odd pounds of weight behind it. The teen noticed a small spray of blood flying from his opponent's lips, but he was already flipping into his next move, using the momentum of his foot bouncing back from the statuesque monster before him to twist his body into position, his hands finding the ground before they were launching him up and over onto All Might's shoulders. The cords of his favored weapon held taut between his two hands and slipped easily under his teacher's chin. He heard the satisfying surprised noise as he let his weight hang from All Might's neck like some sort of demented necklace. For a moment he thought he might be able to actually win, but he shouldn't have even entertained the thought, because within the next second the man was kicking off the ground, sending both of them slamming into a nearby wall. The teen felt something else in his chest snap as he was crushed between a brick wall and 400 pounds of heroic bullshit. Still, he refused to let go, hanging on for dear life as he was slammed back again and again. After a minute or so, All Might lost his footing and both of them tumbled to the ground. The teen's hand slipped at the unexpected change of elevation and his enemy managed to slip the cord free before yanking the whole thing away from the boy underneath him. There was a second's pause as he caught his breath, glaring at Izuku and pinning the smaller figure down through sheer might of his bulk. The teen saw murder in those eerily glowing eyes, rage that a quirkless child had managed to give him any kind of trouble. And Izuku knew in that moment that if he didn't end the test soon, the teacher might really do something they would all regret. He desperately reached for his belt, trying to get a hold of something to help. Large hands shot out to try and catch his wrists, but both of them froze for a second at the sound of Aizawa's voice. "That's enough." The exclamation caught the two fighters off guard, not expecting to hear the underground hero here. But even as All Might turned his head to look over his shoulder, Izuku clocked the tone, frustrated, angry, and in pain. And suddenly he knew exactly what was going on, just in time for his fingers to catch on to the exact thing he needed. As the villain pinning the greenette down realized that it wasn't Aizawa who had called out, the battered handcuffs clicked snugly into place onto a stupidly huge wrist, sounding the death knell for the test even as the announcement of the teen's victory rang out over the loudspeakers. There was stunned silence in the observation room as Midoriya and Shinso were announced as the winners of their match. 16 teens and several pro heroes stared at the wall of screens, showing the cityscape. It wasn't until the number one hero moved to stand from where he had pinned the small green teenager that anyone in the room moved. Yamada and Aizawa dashed through the door into the hall, leading towards the small parking garage used for buses and such for these training areas. Recovery Girl yelled after them to bring the kids back to her temporary field office since it was closer, even as she hurried in the opposite direction to get as much of the needed supplies out as possible, calling for one of her third-year assistants to come over from the main campus as she did. She would need the extra hands. The two men forewent the bus option once in the garage, instead snagging one of the large Rangers sitting off to the side, an all-terrain vehicle vaguely resembling a golf cart in basic shape. but a golf cart on steroids and ready to take on a mountain. It was much faster than a bus, after all, especially on the perfectly flat roads of the campus. Principal Nezu's voice came over their earpieces, still turned on and tuned in from their own tests. Eraserhead, All Might has been ordered not to touch the students until you get there. Once you have secured Midoriya and Shinso, let him know I expect to see him in my office post-haste to discuss why he did not stop the exam when ordered. Will do. Are the kids okay for the moment? Yes, I have told them over the loudspeakers to stay put and await your arrival. They are currently sitting together and Midoriya is doing his best to administer first aid with what supplies he had on his person. I'd like to remind you of the larger first aid kits at the gates for when you get there. Mike chimed in at that. Yes, sir. ETA about 5 minutes. Are the other students taken care of? Yes, I had Hound Dog and Snipe take them down to the locker rooms and they will head back to their classroom from there. I will also send Midnight after them when she gets back. They are handled for the moment, so you two just focus on your kids. Neither of them responded to that. It wasn't necessary. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that they would take care of their boys. 4 minutes and a quick pause to snag a first aid kit later, and Mike was kneeling in front of 2 battered and exhausted teens. Hey kiddos. Hey, what hurts? Let me see. After a bit of coaxing, Izuku pushed his friend forwards a bit, worrying that the head wound had yet to stop bleeding. It took 3 butterfly stitches and a lot of reassurance that the purple-haired boy wasn't going to die before they could get anything out of the smaller teen about where he himself was hurting. Normally, Shinso would have been more help with convincing the other to speak up, but the obvious concussion was making him clam up a bit, struggling with the fear of losing his quirk control. But eventually they got him to admit that a probably broken rib was the worst offender, and deciding that neither kid was going to die immediately, they got the 2 of them up and onto the Ranger, settling Shinso in the front passenger seat with Yamada since there were handlebars there to help keep the dizzy brainwasher in his seat. Aizawa delivered Nezu's message curtly before hopping into the seat next to the small greenette. He readied himself to catch his charge on the off chance that he slipped. Not that it was likely on the well-made roads of campus, of course. Luckily, they made it to Recovery Girl without further incident, pulling into the garage and bustling the kids through to the small room set up as a nurse's office as quickly as they could without causing further harm. They were settled onto cots and made as comfortable as possible, Chio immediately starting in on seeing how bad Shinso's concussion was after his bout of unconsciousness during the test. She was mid-exam when her assistant showed up and took over where Yamada had been dabbing at the cuts Izuku had on his arms. She asked the boy to take off his shirt so she could start looking after his ribs. He untucked his shirt and gingerly pulled it up over his head, drawing a gasp from Yamada and a sympathetic hiss from the 3rd year when he revealed the mottled collection of rapidly darkening bruises across his chest and back. Aizawa just stood and stormed from the room, unstoppable and on a mission. The assistant, who introduced herself as Hikari, poked around with gentle fingers, murmuring apologies for every flinch or wince she caused. Eventually, she decided there was no internal bleeding, but that he really needed an X-ray before they could tell how many broken bones he had. Unfortunately, the X-ray machine was in the main infirmary, so that would have to wait for a little bit. Chio was finished looking over Shinso by the time her assistant was finished cleaning and bandaging Midoriya's various cuts and scrapes. The decision to move to the main office was made. The 2 boys were helped onto a bus and everyone settled in for the short drive. Once they got back to the main campus, things went quickly, proper treatments and examinations taking place, ending with the 2 teens passed out and sleeping off a quirk-filled kiss. Once she was sure they were resting, she pulled Yamada aside to give him the full rundown on their injuries. Hitoshi had a concussion, dislocated shoulder, and a fractured wrist, along with various cuts and bruises. And Izuku had 2 broken ribs, a broken collarbone, and massive deep tissue bruising. She started lining out their care plans. Even with the use of her quirk, both boys would be down for the count for a few days and would need to be cared for. Mike took notes on the blank margins of the papers she had given him. Most of this was stuff he had dealt with before, either after his own injuries or those of his husband and other pro-hero friends. Theirs was a dangerous profession after all. That being said, he really didn't want to do anything wrong when it came to his kids. Once her impromptu lecture was finished, she left her patients in Hikari's care and stomped from the infirmary off in the direction on Nezu's office. Yamada almost felt bad for All Might, but he couldn't really bring himself to care about that particular idiot, so he shrugged it off, instead spending his time helping the 3rd year dab grit and grime off of his charges with a damp sponge. Nezu glared down his snout at the hero seated in front of his desk. He was doing his best to rein in his emotions, to pull back the instinctual urge to destroy the thing that endangered his young. The man had bullied his way into that matchup, and pushed with the threat of calling the HPSC until he got his way. Nezu had given in, thinking that it would be a good exercise for the boy in thinking outside the box in a tough situation. He would never have dreamed the idiot sitting across from him would have gone so far in the name of a test. So while he fought with himself, All Might got the pleasure of enduring his ire silently. The man himself looked a bit concerned, but also a little confused, which was not helping Nezu think logically. Honestly, if he didn't have to worry about the commission, he would let the man bear the full brunt of his rage. As it was, he was attempting deep breaths, trying to get to where he could speak at a normal volume and cadence. He had almost managed it when Aizawa burst through the door, capture weapon flying, eyes blazing a brilliant gold. An avenging god, or rather, an angry father. The underground hero loomed over the commission's poster boy, demanded in an angry hiss, "Where the fuck do you get off hurting children like that?" "Aizawa, I assure you, all I was doing was trying to challenge them." Shouter reared back a bit in shock at the reply before he snapped completely. "No, that is not what you were doing. You were beating those two boys into the ground. And I want to know why. Why would the #1 hero, or any teacher, think it would be a good idea to do so much damage to their students during a test of all things?" "Oh well, Yagi rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. "I probably shouldn't have gone quite so far. But I'm so unused to holding back for students who are so much weaker than average. You can't really blame me when I've never had to dial it back so much before." There was a sharp crack as All Might's nose broke, blood gushing like a fountain and splattering across the office as well as Aizawa, where he stood with his fist still raised. "How dare you call them weak?" the furious hero growled out. "Those boys are anything but weak. Both of them have fought tooth and nail for everything they have now. They have shed blood, sweat, and tears to even have the chance that those with powerful quirks are handed at birth. They are stronger than any one of their classmates and would most likely win in an even match. So how dare you hurt them just to prove to yourself that your quirkist views are right? I should strangle you right here and now and take out one more thing that is wrong with this world." Luckily for the large blonde, Nezu stepped in before the furious father could make good on his threat. "He is right, Yagi. You have gone too far in pursuit of a personal opinion. And on top of that, you have seriously harmed students that you promised to protect when you signed your contract with me. Thus, I think I am plenty justified in terminating that contract effective immediately. I will not have someone who I cannot trust around my students on my staff." The larger man sputtered, spitting more blood onto the beige carpeting and fancy desk in front of him. "You what? You can't fire me. I'm still looking for I still need this job." The principal across from him bristled. "No, I can and have fired you, Yagi Toshinori. I do not care about your ulterior motives, especially since you being here has proved detrimental to my charges. You will just have to find another way around your predicament that does not involve UA." Further objections were ignored while Nezu turned to give Shouta a look, warning him against further aggression. Power Loader and 13 are both on their way to escort Yagi to the teacher's lounge to collect his personal items and then off of campus. "I ask that you stay here so we can discuss what all needs to be done before the training camp." The gloomy hero bit back his irritation, knowing well that the rat was looking out for him. So with an accepting grunt, he stepped back and slumped against the wall. Both of them ignored the disgrace of an ex-teacher as he continued to protest his expulsion. It took a while before his escorts showed up, so it was lucky both had experience with keeping silent despite wanting to lash out. Eventually, though, the door opened for Power Loader and 13, and the two of them all but dragged Yagi away. Nezu flipped the TV on his wall on to follow their progress and make sure there were no issues. Once that was set up, he turned to the mess on his desk and floor with a sigh and pulled out the remote for the cleaning pots. Aizawa stepped forwards to help, sorting through the papers on the desk. He did his best to keep the stacks organized as they were, while also pulling out all of the bloodied ones that would need to be reprinted later. "Thank you, Shouta-kun," his boss said with a sigh as he wiped down the desktop with a strong disinfectant. "No, thank you. If you didn't fire him, Hisashi and I were going to quit." His old mentor accepted the almost ultimatum with a somber nod. "I've been looking for a reason to let him go since the commission forced him on us. This was the first thing he really did that was in violation of his contract." Aizawa sighed and slumped down in the other chair, lifting his feet for the robot currently shampooing the carpet. "I'll have to move my schedule around a bit after the break so I can take over heroics again." The mammal nodded. "Yes, let me know if you need someone to take over one of your ethics classes. The business ethics teacher could probably take one without much issue." They spoke for a few more minutes on what needed to be done to shift classes around to account for a missing staff member. But honestly, it didn't take that long since Yagi had only been there for less than half of the school year in the first place. From there, Nezu decided to switch topics to something he had been planning to speak about after the tests were over anyway. "By the way, Shouta-kun, I got an email yesterday from the police department. There were several updates I wanted to make you aware of." The dark-haired hero waved a hand to signal him to continue. "Well, first off, Shinso and Hatsume's old middle school has been completely restaffed, but with Alder they hit a little snag. The courts fined the teachers but didn't insist they be fired or lose their licenses. I have my suspicions as to why. Because the child who was most harmed was Quirkless. Most likely, I will do my best to have them do a retrial, but I am unsure if the results will be any better." He paused there to let them both stew in their hatred for such a corrupt system, before moving on to the next update. There was also an update on Midoriya & Co. It seems that 2 days after her little meeting with Izuku-kun, she transferred from working at the hospital she has been at since before he was born to a tiny clinic across town. It seems her newly revealed partner had also transferred from that hospital to the same clinic around 2 years ago. So they've most likely known each other for more than 2 years, and yet she never mentioned him to Izuku. I've got a bad feeling those two are up to something. Do you have a court date for his custody hearing yet? Not yet. Apparently there was some sort of hold-up. She apparently recently filed some new paperwork, and that needed to be gone through before they could set the date. Aizawa sighed and ran his hands down his face in exhaustion. Anything else? No, Shouta-kun. That is it for today. Now, it seems Recovery Girl is almost here, most likely to give Yagi a piece of her mind. You should go ahead and leave before she realizes he is gone. The tired pro paled a bit before standing up with a grateful nod. He left the office just before the nurse in question turned the corner of the hall, obviously on a warpath. He stepped out of her way respectfully before hurrying away before she could realize her target had already left the office. Checking in on his little family was much more important than getting chewed out by a terrifying hero healer. In retrospect, they should have expected the mess that was 1A being told to go home after they watched their teacher and the number 1 hero beat the ever-living shit out of their classmate. As it was, Hound Dog and Snipe were unprepared for the viciousness of their reaction to being dismissed. The counselor immediately started running damage control, but by that point the last straw had been laid. Aizawa was called for and reluctantly left the little family he had just reunited with to go and coax his panicking class to calm themselves. When he arrived at the classroom a few minutes later, he wasn't surprised to be able to hear raised voices all the way down the hall. Also unsurprised at the curious faces peeking out of 1B's doors. He ordered them back into their room before he steadied himself and opened the door to his own mess of little monsters. Enough. His exhausted tone cut through the class like a knife. Instantly they quieted, though it wasn't to last. An anxiously trembling Kaminari stepped forwards quickly to confront their teacher. Sensei, are Izuku and Hitoshi okay? What the hell happened? Why didn't All Might stop when Nezu told him to through the comms? What's going on? Shouta sighed quietly before motioning for the shaking kid to sit down, prompting his other hellspawn to do the same. He ended up surrounded by a half-circle of teenagers ranged around him on all of the closest available surfaces, including the floor. Okay. First off, Midoriya and Shinso will be okay. They are currently under observation in the infirmary, but are in no immediate danger. Second, All Might admitted that he held a bias against the 2 students he was paired against and let it cloud his judgment. He is being held accountable for that, and you will all be informed of any information needed about that situation soon. But trust me, Nezu will do what is needed. The principal is very fond of his students. Now, raise your hands if you have questions. He was unsurprised by the number of hands, but he still groaned internally at the delay in getting back to his husband and kids. Yes, Yairazu. The tall girl shifted a bit where she was sitting primly in a chair. Sensei, All Might, he has been rude to Midoriya-kun before, and I was wondering, is it because of his quirk status? Right to the crux of the matter. Damn, kids are too perceptive really. It might help them as pros, but it would be rough in most other situations. Yes, All Might has made it clear to Nezu that he doesn't believe those lacking a quirk, or possessing a weak quirk, are fit to be heroes. He is wrong, and if any of you have similar concerns, let me know and I will schedule conference time for us to go and discuss your issues. Should he be outright telling these students that the number 1 hero is a quirkist piece of shit? Probably not. But again, they were perceptive enough to read between the lines no matter what was said, so did it matter how he told them. A lot of the hands went down with his answer, which was good. Next he called on Kirishima, slightly concerned by the uncharacteristically dark look on the boy's face. His question clued Shouta in on what the issue was though. What if we don't want to be taught by someone who is quirkist? Someone who hurt our friends? Aizawa couldn't stop his small sly smile as he remembered All Might's dismissal less than an hour before. He met Red Eyes squarely and confidently assured the boy, "You won't have to worry about that. Trust me." The redhead nodded and a lot of the others visibly relaxed. A few more questions, most of them just the kids being nosy about their missing classmates or trying to dig more into the All Might issue, all fended off with short answers and warnings when they pushed too far. And then Aizawa was making eye contact with the 2 other teachers in the room, raising an eyebrow at a Nuian query. The man huffed and nodded. Right, Hellspawn, I need to get going soon. Remember to not talk to anyone about these issues until UA puts out a press release so you don't end up stepping on any toes, alright? Other than that, you are all released. Remember, the extra credit essay for ethics is due on Monday if you want to put one in. Also, Hound Dog will be available during his usual office times tomorrow if any of you would like to speak to him about anything. If you need anything else, you have my number. But don't blow up my phone, okay? He got confirmation that they would text him if needed. And no, they wouldn't call him for unimportant things, as well as a few well wishes for the rare 2-day weekend. He finally made his escape. He stopped by the teacher's lounge on his way back to the infirmary. grabbing 2 mugs of coffee and a pile of grating for the wait he and his husband had ahead. Shio was very adamant that they not leave until after Hitoshi woke up so she could check his concussion one more time. So they would most likely be at the school until late afternoon. He should probably ask Hisashi what he wanted to order for dinner that night since he was sure none of them would want to cook. With a hum and a second of thought, he also sent off a text. He knew Hisashi had already let her know what had happened, but he would invite them over so everyone could confirm that the 2 boys would be okay. Izuku sighed from where he was half sprawled with his feet over Hitoshi's lap. His ribs and collarbone ached fiercely even after several hours of accelerated healing, and he was having a lot of trouble getting comfortable, unable to lay on his belly because of the ribs, but too tender from the massive bruising on his back to really settle for too long. His friend, on the other hand, had no such qualms. He had simply sat down on the couch and leaned his head back before he was out cold once more. When the Greenette's phone timer went off, he nudged the brainwasher with his foot, careful not to jar the arm that was cradled in a sling as he did. After a few more gentle prods, violet eyes flickered open. MHBH. The smaller teen chuckled lightly. Hey, sleepyhead. Just checking in. Can you tell me what year it is? Shinso answered the question easily before settling down a bit further into the couch and passing back out. With a snicker, Izuku left him to it, resetting his timer for an hour and turning the TV on in the name of distracting himself from how sore he was. He had just started in on a How It's Made run marathon when Hisashi made a reappearance from upstairs. The man looked a lot more comfortable now, in baggy and worn yellow sweats and a black t-shirt that was at least 2 sizes too big. His hair was pulled back into a mess of a top knot and his eyeliner was almost completely removed, just a few residual smudges around the outer corners. Izuku waved a greeting, not really in the mood to talk. He got a soft smile in return as the English teacher passed by on his way to the love seat where a pile of tests awaiting grading sat on the side table. The next hour passed in a haze of satisfying machines and pen scratches. Just before his timer went off again, Aizawa rounded the dividing wall to the kitchen. Hey, he got their attention softly. Any idea what you all want for dinner? Izuku muted the TV and hummed to himself. Before signing, Toshi really liked that place down the road with the curry rice. Does that sound good? Yeah, kid, that's fine with me. Why don't you go ahead and wake Hitoshi up to make sure that's what he wants while I grab the menu from the drawer? The man disappeared back into the kitchen while his charge got to work, sitting himself up slowly and waking up the other teen. By the time he successfully succeeded in getting Hitoshi up, the adults were already huddled together on the love seat looking over the paper takeout menu and debating options. It took another minute or so before he was able to get his friend to comprehend words and he was able to ask if he wanted the curry rice. At the groggy nod, he smiled and signed the request to Yamada, who was dialing the restaurant. It took 30 minutes, but eventually they all sat around the table and dug into the various types of comfort food they had ordered. Izuku dug into his plate of gyoza, realizing that he was famished after a long day of fighting and healing. There wasn't too much conversation until the food was almost gone, all of them too tired to really be up for chatting. But as Izuku bit into his last dumpling, Aizawa sighed and spoke up. All Might has been fired from his position at UA. Dark Eyes carefully watched for the reactions from the 2 boys, studying them to make sure they didn't take the announcement wrong. At first, both teens had just frozen, and then Izuku was slowly lowering his food back to his plate, a look of shocked consternation on his face. He glanced over at Hitoshi uncertainly, obviously looking for a cue on how he should feel. Unfortunately, the other boy was a blank slate, seemingly stuck in his own world as he processed, so he was stuck trying to work through it on his own. His mind raced as he went through several different repercussions from the new situation. The one that stuck out most to him was that All Might would seek retribution for his termination. He felt his anxiety rise as ways that the HPSC or the hero himself could cause problems played through his brain. He blinked and finched as Yamada seemed to materialize crouched in front of him. Hey kiddo, wanna share what's going on in that bright little brain of yours? Izuku blinked again, feeling like he was floating in his stress even as his eyes started to mist over. I am sorry. He's going to see cause true belief for UA and it's all my fault. ISH, if I had been sent stronger or had a quirk then this wouldn't be a problem. Oh kiddo, Mike started before he was cut off by his husband. No Izuku, Aizawa started, his voice stern but kind, booking no argument but understanding why the teen felt the way he did. None of this was your fault. Even the kids in Wana who have physical quirks would have had trouble if that idiot had come at them with that level of aggression. What happened today was neither of your faults. It was the culmination of Quirkless society letting that asshole have his way too often. And if he decides to complain about his termination, I will happily fight him and break his nose again. He is not getting near any of you kids ever again if I can help it. Izuku's breathing hitches once, twice, and then the tears broke free. It was really awful, he admitted as he was scooped out of his chair and into Yamada's lap, soon joined by a shaking Hitoshi who had finally unfrozen. When he used Hitoshi to hit me, I thought we were both going to die. His purple companion hugged him from behind gently, careful of bruises and still twinging ribs. "I'm sorry, Izu. I should have been stronger, smarter. He caught me and used me to hurt you." He trailed off with a sniffle of his own as there was a knock on the door. Aizawa murmured about getting it and stood to do just that. There were a few minutes of quiet voices at the door before the sound of running feet made both boys flinch, only to relax at the loud and familiar sound of Mei's voice as she ran into the kitchen and slid on her knees into the hut, buzzing with questions and rambled demands. It took a while to calm her down, enough for them to actually tell her what exactly happened, and then a while longer to calm down a furious Mia. But eventually the adults let the teens retreat into Izuku's workshop while they talked over tea. An hour later, when they heard a small explosion and cackled laughter, they smiled to themselves. The boys would be fine. It might take a few more rounds of reassurances and maybe a few hugs, but this probably wouldn't hurt them long term. Monday was the day they received their results. To the relief of many, most of the exams were passed. Kaminari in particular was ecstatic with his results on his biology and algebra tests. As soon as he was handed back his papers, he was out of his seat and sprinting at Izuku for a hug, completely ignoring Aizawa's annoyed drawl to sit back down. Izuku himself passed with flying colors, Itoshi's scores following not too far behind, and most of their main lunch group also did really well. The only tests that had been failed were a few of the hero practicals, and Aizawa let those students know that while he would let them come to the camp, he would be giving them extra work. The threat didn't dampen their celebrations for long. When lunch rolled around, it found almost all of 1A and half of the first-year support course gathered around 3 tables, most of the teens standing and moving around as they celebrated and compared grades. Mei was bouncing in place, jerking Izuku around by his arm as she did so, babbling his ear off about how Kaminari had really helped her boost her English grade and how she was excited for dinner that night. The plans being that if they all passed, then the Hatsums would meet the Yamezawa household at a nice restaurant in celebration. Mia had picked the place. Apparently she had only been able to afford to go once before, and the food was to die for. And Izuku knew the woman was almost always right about food. The greenette hummed in response to her enthusiasm and guided her a bit closer to the table, smiling as he caught sight of Shinso and Todoroki coming back with food for Mei, Denki, and him. The 2 quieter males of the group once again making sure their more easily distracted friends were taken care of. They would make great heroes. Mei was tricked into sitting by turning her chair around so she could straddle it, and then his arm was switched for her chopsticks. And soon their group were sitting down, chatting with the still too excitable teens who were milling around them. Congratulations and gentle teasing filled the air, and Izuku was just happy to be able to bask in the school-related chaos without fear for once. He settled in to eat with a smile as he discussed the finer points of Yaoyorozu's biology test, the boy explaining some of the facts and concepts she mixed up or got wrong. Izuku stared up at the entrance to the mall with trepidation. Somehow he, Hitoshi, and several of the support kids had been convinced to participate in 1AS class trip. The greenette hated malls, but Kaminari's hopeful look when the others had asked them to join had made it impossible to say no. He would just have to ask the others to use his money to pay for whatever he wanted to buy. It would be embarrassing to be refused service in front of such a large group. Luckily, the boys plus Mei almost immediately walked over to a rapidly growing group of teenagers almost as soon as they stepped through the main doors. Uraraka called out to them in her unbelievably chipper way. They were 3 of the last to arrive, followed soon after by the few remaining stragglers as everyone discussed how to break up into groups so everyone could go to the stores they needed. Izuku ended up in a group with Kaminari, Kirishima, and Asui. All of them needed some sort of clothing item, so they were headed to make a round of some of the clothing stores until they found what was needed. They made it through 3 shops before Izuku found what he needed. A black undershirt with sleeves, almost as nice as the one he lost during the sports festival. A quick try-on proved it fit well, snug to the skin but not tight enough to restrict movement. He grinned to himself and snagged the money from his wallet, walking over to Kaminari. "Hey Dunky." His friend turned to look at him with the normal peppy smile. "Hey man, what's up?" The smaller boy fidgeted a bit before holding out the shirt and cash. Do you mind paying for this for me?" The other boy gave him a slightly confused look but agreed easily enough. And Izuku followed him around while the electric teen looked for a new pair of shorts. Eventually Kaminari gave up on finding any he liked in that particular store, and they walked up to the counter to pay for the shirt. Izuku hung back a bit, trying to not draw attention to himself. Unfortunately, it seemed like the store attendant had noticed the greenette handing off the money and shirt. She glared at the 2 boys and demanded to see their IDs. With a sigh, Izuku stepped forwards and pulled his free, knowing the barked order was for him and that she could care less about Denki. He set it on the counter and drew his hand back quickly, knowing that leaving an anchor point like that too close to a possible threat wasn't a good idea. The attendant only glanced over the small bit of plastic before she was clicking her tongue in disgust. "Thought so. We don't serve null." Izuku internally winces at the slur and mourns the loss of the nice shirt. But before he could de-escalate the situation, his friend was stepping forwards with a frown. I don't appreciate you calling my friend a slur. And I'm the one buying the damn shirt, so if you'd let me pay, we'd love to leave. Deku, don't go lying to me. I saw him give you the money. And this store reserves the right to refuse service. The argument was loud enough to attract the attention of the other customers, including their classmates. And Izuku's skin prickled at the attention. Deku, leave it. Let's just go, okay? He tried to pull the blonde towards the door to no avail, yelping a bit as sparks started to fly as the other teen continued to argue about discrimination. That seemed to be the last thing needed for the rest of his group to step forwards, obviously trying to figure out exactly what had angered the normally sunny boy so fiercely. Isui stood herself between Denki and the sneering lady while Kirishima grabbed a hold of the blonde, wrapping a quirk-hardened arm around his shoulders while he spit and sparked and yelled in ever-growing fury. Izuku turned to the redhead and asked him to bring Kaminari outside before they got into trouble. Once the struggling duo had made it almost through the door, he turned to pick up his ID, flinching with the lady's parting sally of, "That's right, Nulls and their friends aren't welcome here. If I see you again, I'll call the cops." He nodded and turned to go, coming face to face with a wide-eyed Isui. He averted his gaze, wishing he could banish the mortified flush he feels across his face. "Come on, we need to go," he mutters to her before leading the way out. They find the other two boys sitting on a bench nearby, Denki still agitated and speaking quickly to Kirishima, though thankfully he had stopped yelling. When the two green-haired teens walked up, the blonde stood abruptly, causing Izuku to flinch back a bit. Kaminari froze at the movement, realizing that he had scared his small friend and immediately feeling awful. So he took a moment to breathe, determined to not do it again. After a few seconds' pause, green eyes peered up through messy curly fringe, and the human generator gave him an apologetic look and opened his arms in an invitation. Once the smaller teen accepted the hug, he knew it was time to apologize and wasted no time. "I'm sorry, Izuku, but that lady was so out of line. Calling you a slur and refusing you service was wrong, and I just reacted. I didn't mean to upset you." He waited in suspense for a moment while he held his friend, holding his breath and praying that he would be forgiven for making a scene and causing the other boy distress. He was rewarded when Izuku finally fully looked up at him with a wobbly smile. "I know it's WR wrong, but it's leg legal and more trouble than it's worth to fight it." That made his classmates deflate a bit, sadness at him accepting that kind of situation taking over. The freckled teen sighed and decided to change the topic. "Come on, I'm thirsty. Let's go find something to drink." They ended up near a bar, stuck sitting at the small fountain as they sipped at their drinks. They had just started to relax, chatting about predictions for what kind of training they would be doing at camp when another group of their peers stumbled upon them. It was the group of mostly girls, Uraraka, Yaoyorozu, Jiru, and Todoroki, that found them there. They converged on Izuku's group with smiles and chatters of finding a really cool music shop. Izuku smiled and nodded politely as Yaoyorozu told him about Jiru introducing her to classic rock and how she was excited to do more research into the subject when she got home. They were all caught off guard when a stranger in a hoodie threw his arm around Izuku's shoulders, exclaiming in excitement about UA students. Their surprise quickly turned to horror when a pale hand latched onto a freckled neck and a familiar and terrifying face was revealed peeking out from under a dark hood. Shigaraki stepped back with a tut as Yaoyorozu made to move, half dragging his hostage off the bench. The small teen choking and forced to stand and arch his back to keep from adding too much strain on his airways. Now, none of that, brats. If you try anything, I can kill your friend here and maybe 20 others before you could stop me. So stay sitting and we will have a little chat. I do love informative cutscenes." He waited for a minute, staring down the petrified teens, waiting to see if they would try him. None of them moved, and he took that as a good enough answer. He scratched idly at his neck as he hummed to himself in thought before glancing down at the boy in his grip. "Tell me, hero brat, what is so different between Stain and I? Hell, what is so different between you and I? You shattered my arm and killed my Namu the last time we met after all. Why is that different from me killing what I don't like?" Jiru opens her mouth to speak, a sarcastic remark obviously ready to fly. But Yamomo quickly stopped her, hand grasping hand. The taller girl terrified of making the situation worse. Izuku took as deep of a breath as he could with the pressure slowly tightening around his windpipe. He realized suddenly that he would need to take charge of things. Shigaraki was obviously fixated on him and the others were floundering. If he didn't try and de-escalate things, they could get worse far too quickly. He wrangled his voice into submission, ignoring the high-pitched sound ringing through his head and managing to stutter out a response to the aggressive question. I think the difference is I in intentions. Like since Stain killed F for an ideal, and he made that ideal known. And I killed to pure protect others. And others understand that. But no one knows or understands your intentions. There was a low growl from the man behind him and the greenette flinched as the hand around his neck tightened even more. My intention is to kill All Might. Why yes, we know the what, but we don't know the why. There was a brief pause before the hand keeping the smallest boy in place tightened brutally. A look at the face of the man holding him captive revealed a terrifyingly sadistic grin. Izuku gagged as his airway was almost completely restricted. In a panic, his hand inched up as if to try and pry paper-dry fingers free, even though he knew that move would most likely end up with a pinky dropping into pace and his own untimely death. But at this rate he might die either way. Before he was forced to make the choice, though, a familiar voice rang out, anger dripping from quirk-laced words. "Hey you, the fuck do you think you're doing?" Shigaraki's responding snapped reply cut off after the first syllable, eyes going blank and grin fully dropping into absent neutrality. And when the order came, the man gently released his hostage with no hesitation. As soon as deadly fingers were clear, Izuku was caught by Kaminari, who lurched forwards to support him, off balance and fighting to catch his breath as he was. The electric boy all but carried his friend a few feet free of the danger zone and helped him sit on one of the benches. Todoroki then stepped up to offer a small chunk of ice wrapped in a few paper napkins, guiding freckled fingers around the parcel and then lifting them to hold against the rapidly darkening bruising. Both boys obviously shifted to block a hazy green gaze from viewing the villain, even as they listened to Shinso grill the others about what had happened and Asui's calm explanation to the police on the phone. Eventually, the smaller boy managed to get his breathing somewhat under control, though it still rasped painfully, and he slumped further as exhaustion quickly fought through the adrenaline. The two who were watching him shared a concerned look as the obvious vacancy steadily thickened. Recognizing the beginnings of shock, Kaminari grimaced a bit before forcing a small smile and crouching down to be level with Cloudy Green. Once his friend's eyes drifted over to meet as he started talking about his mom's, his favorite drink, anything innocent he could pull out of his ass, really. Doing his damnedest to keep the other teen as present as possible. Soon the others from Class A and H were grouping up, setting a protective circle around the group and keeping an eye on the disarmed villain in their midst. May in particular, with an unknown baby out and pointed towards the man. It wasn't long after they all made it to the group when there was the sound of running feet and a shout of "kids." Most of the shaken teens turned to look for the familiar voice, finding two of their teachers frantically weaving through the crowd. Aizawa well in the lead, with Mike's distinctive hairstyle showing him following after. Unfortunately, their lapse in attention provided an opportunity. Several screams rang out from startled hero students as a familiar black mist sprung up from nowhere. They pulled the trigger on instinct but stopped almost as fast when she clocked that her target was disappearing and that she ran the risk of hitting someone else. The portal closed, vanishing as quickly as it had come. Hitoshi cried out as his connection was forcefully severed by distance, his nose gushing blood as he all but collapsed to the floor, Kirishima leaping to catch him before his head smashed into the tiled floor. And then their teacher was amongst their massive panicking and frantic movement, sliding to his knees by the freshly downed boy even as his partner made a beeline for their other kid, crying out in shock at the sight of dark red, purple ringing Izuku's throat. As the men started grilling the more stable of their students on what happened, the police started arriving as well, evacuating the rest of the mall. It would be a while before the UA kids were all safely home, but they had at least all made it through, and Aizawa and Yamato were infinitely grateful. So they did their best to calm those who were shaken and help the police gather statements. Even as their two fosters were checked over by paramedics, at least they were all alive. One minor inconvenience of living with their teacher reared its ugly head a week after the mall incident. Aizawa grumbled as he led the way to the drive near UAS Gate, the meeting place for the two classes going to the training camp. They saw Vlad walking over from the main building as well. Both teachers nodded to each other and settled to iron out any last-minute details. The two boys were too tired to even try and listen in, dropping duffel bags to the sidewalk before following after their stuff. Once sat on the curb and leaned against each other, Shinso broke out the thermos an amused Yamada had handed him on the way out, noting the 3 small cups screwed onto the top with a snort. Once the two of them had their cups of sweet awake juice, Aizawa whipped his head around and paused his conversation for long enough to come and snag coffee for himself as well, the teen snickering quietly at his coffee senses. It was another 30 minutes before the buses showed up, parking alongside the curb. The two drivers stepped out to converse with the teachers. Izuku ended up half in Hitoshi's lap by the time Ida and Yaoyorozu were stepping out of a Bentley and thanking the Yaoyorozu chauffeur for the ride, rolling large suitcases behind them. Shinso greeted the new arrivals with a nod, not willing to do much more in case he woke his friend from his doze. The others showed up in 2s and 3s, Shoji and Takoyami and Sato, Jiro and Mina, Asui and Uraraka, one after the other stepping up to the growing group. Class B gathering on the other side of the teachers in their own drowsy huddle. Kaminari sat down on Izuku's other side when he arrived, rubbing at his eyes and yawning, giving his classmates a sweet smile though not yet awake enough to talk. Todoroki for his part stood nearby, quietly exchanging greetings with Shinso. When the last few stragglers finally walked up, just before the official meeting time, the teachers called for attention, silencing the general hubbub of teen chatter. They announced which bus was for which class, the gleam in Eraserhead's eyes a worrying hint as they did so, Izuku catching it even as he stumbled to slightly numb feet. A glance at Hitoshi proved the other boy had caught it too. There wasn't much they could do about it at this point though, so they loaded up with the rest of their peers, tossing duffel bags into the underbus storage. And if Izuku happened to switch a few weapons out of his costume case and into his carry-on, well, no one saw him, so did it really happen? The drive was long and kind of boring, but Izuku found himself suddenly too wired to sleep. He ended up as a pillow for Kaminari instead, singing back and forth with Hitoshi across the aisle with an occasional question about the meaning of a sign from Shoto in the row in front of them, the heterochromatic boy doing his best to keep up with the conversation, the rest of their classmates chatting or singing or otherwise occupying themselves. The noise got louder the more they woke up and the further out of cell service they got, and eventually even Denki couldn't sleep through it, grumbling and blinking around before flushing in embarrassment over having drooled a bit on Izuku's shoulder. But all he got in return for his stuttered apology was a bright smile and a question meant to drag him into the conversation. 3 hours later, the bus was pulling over at a rest stop, Aizawa telling his hellspawn to unload and stretch for a bit before the rest of the trip. Again, something about the wording seemed off to Izuku and Hitoshi. It had them slipping knives and still new capture weapon into their pockets and under their shirts, just in case. They would find out how right they were to be nervous in just a few minutes' time, while tumbling down with a landslide, a Cheshire-edged grin following after them. Luckily, or perhaps deliberately on Pixie Bob's part, no one was hurt in the fall. Most had even managed to land upright and ready to move as needed, save a few of their less graceful peers like Minta and Sato. Izuku cringed as a roar echoed through the trees, heralding the thunderous rush of a giant beast. Those closest to it sprang into action, attacking in a loose approximation of a real formation, Kaminari and Shoto at their head as heavy hitters. An ice spire slashing the attacking monstrosity in half showed it to be made of dirt. Izuku put 2 and 2 together and did his best to come up with a plan. It's Pixie Bob's quirk. Kaminari, fall back, your quirk won't work. Close-ranged fighters up front, long range behind, and those at a disadvantage guarding the rear. Yaoyorozu, can you make some staves for those whose quirks won't work here? The girl nodded and got to work, handing out staves to several of the less combat-oriented quirk users. Most of them would have no experience with the weapon, but luckily you don't need much training to hit something with a stick. Izuku snagged one for himself, spinning it in a few sharp movements to get a feel for the weight and balance and stepping up to take his place near the front. And so they went, marching forwards quickly through the woods, beating back the giant earth beasts as they appeared but mostly trying to just keep moving. At one point the greenette broke his stave in a block against a swiping foreleg and took a tumble as the blow connected with his belly. But then Kaminari was stepping up from the rear to take his place in the fight, and Jiru and Hagakure stood over him as he found where his breath disappeared to and climbed to his feet. And then the 3 of them slipped back to their own spots as Izuku pulled his 2 knives from beneath his shirt and leaped forwards once more. He was aware of the shouts and warnings from his classmates, and played into their called plans as best as he could, backing up Shoto as the other boy used spires and creeping ice to destroy or slow down their enemies. He heard Hitoshi from behind, barking orders to keep them all coordinated, his voice cutting through the sounds of fighting and forest surprisingly well, using his fundamental knowledge of his capture weapon to fling the fabric alloy out like an extra long whip or to tug swiped paws away from intended targets. Yaoyorozu stood near the purple-haired boy doing her best to come up with plans even as she helped the others protect the rear. It was hours before they broke through the trees and into the clearing around the lodge. Almost half of them collapsed into a pile of exhaustion as soon as they realized they made it. Hitoshi stepped forwards to join Izuku and Shoto even as the greenette turned towards the heterochromatic boy in concern, taking in the icy breath and the frost blooming across his tracksuit. Todoroki-kun, you really need to warm up. Freckled hands snatched up chapped and red fingers, and Izuku started doing his best to gently rub the feeling back into them. Hitoshi himself frowned in worry at seeing the shivering and whispered an apology as he stepped up behind the elemental boy and wrapped himself around him back to chest. At the small sound of confusion that brought Hitoshi chuckled. Fire might shock your system right now, so body heat is your best bet. Nearby a blonde heard the comment and whipped his head around from where he was chatting with a slightly battered Kirishima to see what was happening. With a gasp he sprung up from his patch of grass, and within a second Kaminari was ducking under Todoroki and Izuku's arms as he plastered himself to the taller boy's front. SHOTO sandwich. He cheered happily. They stood for a while, letting their friend warm up a bit as their teacher and the wild pussycats welcomed them and explained how the rest of the day would go. As they talked, Izuku looked around, noticing a small child standing to the side with a grim glower. The teen himself frowned at the glare he received as he locked eyes with the little boy. Once he was sure his friend was warmed up enough to use his fire and their teacher had dismissed them to go drag their belongings from the bus to their assigned room, he wandered over to the child slowly. Hi, I'm Midoriya Izuku. What's your name? He yelped and stumbled back as a tiny fist lashed out towards his crotch, dodging back and away far enough for the blow to miss luckily. Mandalay turned towards the sound and took in the scene. Coda, don't attack our guests. The boy clicked his tongue and turned to trudge off into the trees. HMPH, whatever. Izuku watched him go in concern, standing there until Hitoshi called him over to help with the bags. They had missed lunch, so most of class did their best to tide themselves over with hidden snacks that were shared around as they set up their living area for the week. They had about 2 hours to kill before dinner, so after their sleeping bags rolled out and shower things separated to be grabbed after dinner, they broke into smaller groups to go and explore. Izuku ended up with Hitoshi and Asui, walking through the lodge to familiarize themselves with where everything was. They ran into a group of Class B in the lounge area watching the news. Hitoshi was just going to nod a greeting before moving on to continue their wanderings, but a snide whisper caught his attention. Oh, look who it is. 1AS villain, ugly girl, and freak. The pale boy froze, slowly turning towards the speaker. Monoma. Of course. The blonde boy was looking far too smug, smirking over to meet a furious purple gaze. But before Shinso could fully react, his smaller green counterpart was stomping forwards to grab a handful of ridiculously expensive cardigan. You wanna say that again? Izuku hissed. I had my hearing aids turned down, so I don't think I heard you correctly. Because I'm sure you didn't just call Toshi a villain. And I'm extra sure you didn't call Tsu-chan ugly. Instead of backing off, the copycat doubled down. What are you gonna do about it, freak? Use your quirk on me. Instead of giving the other teen the reaction he had wanted, lurching back hurt and cowering, Izuku leaned in. His free hand dragged a cord-trailing blade from somewhere beneath his shirt. The hooked green blade came to rest in the divot between collarbones, still warm from its hiding place. The blonde paled rapidly at the feeling of a sharp point against skin. I don't need a quirk, Monoma. The greenette stated simply, matter of fact and sure of himself. Everyone else in the room stood frozen, watching the two boys, but unsure of how to stop the train wreck happening before them. The long minute of pause is broken by a rough cough from the doorway. Several heads whipping around to see Eraserhead standing there with his arms crossed, frowning even as Asui peered around her teacher to see what had happened while she was racing off for help. Unfortunately, Izuku didn't waver from where his green gaze was locked on icy blue. The man sighed in exasperation at his foster son's antics, already sure he had a good reason for pulling a weapon on a fellow student. Problem child. Knife down, please. His response was a huff, a bit rude for the normally sweet and polite child. But the knife did lower away from pale skin, so Shouta counted it as a win. Even though the blade hadn't yet been resheathed, still held in freckled fingers ready for use. But the hero would take what he could get, unwilling to push his foster son too far too fast when he still needed to find out what exactly had set him off. Someone want to tell me what happened here? A few of the teens around them shared glances, but it was Monoma who drew himself up in indignant fury. He attacked me. All I did was point out a few issues and he jumped me like an animal. I knew he was less evolved, but this is ridiculous. Shouta flinched a bit at the last comment, caught off guard at the blatant discrimination from a hero student, and in his surprise he wasn't fast enough in replying. Hitoshi responded first. He's the animal. Have you heard yourself, you pompous fuck? Always snapping and growling at us for no damn reason like a fucking chihuahua. The blonde Class B student was already gearing up a reply, but Shouta wasn't about to let things get worse. Enough. Asui, go and get Vlad. Monoma, what exactly did you say to set them off? The blue-eyed brat only glared up at him, obviously unwilling to say. Kendo stepped forwards uncertainly. Sensei. Monoma didn't really mean it, so please. A gold-tinted glare cut the girl off. He knew the president of Class B was soft-hearted and in particular seemed soft on her more unhinged classmate. But he wasn't going to take a proxy apology for something the boy wouldn't even repeat. No, Monoma, what did you say? He put weight behind the words, the slight glow of his barely restrained quirk adding a bit of extra pressure. Finally the teen relented, grumbling that he just called them what they were, and after another minute of glare admitting exactly what he said. It was bad, enough that Shouta would have to talk to the other teacher about sending the boy home. But now that he had the answer from the source, he turned to the rest of the room. Right, class, be back to your rooms for now. Snag any of your own class you see on your way and I'll have someone come fetch you for dinner. He turned towards his foster sons. You two and Asui should wait in here for when I get back, okay? He received nodded affirmatives right as Vlad and Asui walked through the open doorway. After that it was a bustle of movement as the Class B students fled the room and Aizawa gave a basic overview on what had happened. They then led the two remaining Class B kids away to the kitchen where no one but the pussycat should be at the moment to have a talk and decide what to do with the blatantly bigoted hero student. He would return to his kids as soon as he could to make sure they were okay. By the time Izawa returned, the three teens had been joined by several of their peers. A small group of hero students gathered on the couches watching a movie and trying to help their obviously upset classmates calm down. The man sighed at the scene, already exhausted, and it wasn't even the first full day of the training camp. With a grumble, he made his way over to the group, scooping up the remote from its place on the coffee table so he could pause their movie while he talked. He then settled onto the table himself, facing the small group of three teens in the center of the huddle. He met each of their eyes individually, making sure they really were okay for himself. After he settled that bit of protective rage that was trying to seep into the air, he got on with letting them know how things would go down. "All right, kids. For now, Monoma is on probation. We would have sent him home, but honestly that would be a headache and a half. So instead he is to be escorted at all times by a teacher or one of the pussycats. He will not be participating in any of the fun activities planned for the week. And once school starts back up, he will be watched closely. If anything like this happens again, he will either be kicked to Genet or expelled completely, depending on the severity of what he does. I would have expelled him today, but Vlad honestly thinks with some therapy we can help him. So he is getting one chance to redeem himself. That being said, if any of you are uncomfortable with him being around in any way, shape, or form, let me know and I will remove him from the general area, or request the bus drivers to take him home." He quieted then, letting all of the teens, but especially the tree in front of him, absorb the information he had just given them. After a moment, he was rewarded by hesitant agreements from his foster sons as well as a stoic nod from Isui. With that, he stood, letting them know he would be in the mess hall if he was needed, and wandered away to let them continue the movie. He had some paperwork to start on. Dinner had been delicious. The pussycats had prepared a large spread of fried rice and simple meat dishes, things that made it easy to set platters in the center of the long tables of the mess hall so the starving teens could serve themselves. They did warn the kids that from then on all of the meals would be prepared by the students. Breakfast and lunch made by a rotation of 10 kids from each class at a time, and dinner a large group effort. They were hoping to instill some practical kitchen skills into the kids by the end of the week. But now that their surroundings were explored and their meal was eaten, the kids were all excited to hit the hot springs. Especially Class A. Tired and sore after their ordeal, they had been looking forward to a soak since they reached the lodge. It wasn't until they were filing into the small locker area outside of the utilitarian shower area that Izuku realized just how little privacy there was in an onsen. He hesitated by the cubby he had ended up by, listening as the other boys chatted around him, staring blankly at the wall as his panic screamed through him quietly. He hadn't decided on what to do before a hand on his shoulder dragged him back into his surroundings. Most of the others had already started to trickle into the shower room, settling down on the stools to rinse themselves off. He turned his head to find Hitoshi, frowning slightly, violet eyes showing his concern. And of course the other boy was able to cut right through to the problem. "Izu, if you're uncomfortable, I'm sure Aizawa will let you come back and shower later. But if we want to be heroes, we all need to get used to scars eventually. And if anyone tries to judge you for yours, I can always brainwash them into doing something embarrassing so we have blackmail on them. Kinda hard to talk shit when someone can ruin your social standing." The greenette snorted, touched that Hitoshi would even offer to use the quirk he hated so much in such a way. Moreover, he knew the other teen was right. He couldn't hide his scars forever. There wouldn't always be a private changing stall or a separate room ready for him on site. And the profession they were all aiming for was notoriously dangerous. Scars were a part of that. With a deep breath, he made up his mind, stripping off his overshirt and shoving it into his laundry bag. His friend clapped him on the shoulder once more before wandering off to finish getting himself undressed. By the time the greenette had stripped, towel slung around his waist, the rest of the boys, sans Shinso, were already pretty much finished washing themselves and had moved on to the much-awaited soak. He spent the next few minutes gathering up his courage even as Hitoshi leaned against the wall nearby, waiting on him. Eventually, though, he felt as ready as he could be, so he rinsed off the last of the suds and stepped over to join the taller boy. They stepped out into the yard together, surveyed the scene of 2 classes worth of teenage boys winding down for the evening. It contained chaos of small splashes and teasing. They made their way towards the far side of the hot spring where their quieter classmates having settled there together. They had almost made it when a low whistle stopped them in their tracks. The boy with the rotation quirk from Class B was sitting on a rock and leaning back into their path. "Prue, what the fuck happened to you? Did you get hit by a truck or something?" Izuku flinched back, feeling self-conscious and uncomfortable as the comment and the loud volume dragged everyone's attention towards his exposed torso. Hitoshi stepped in front of him to at least block him from Sen's overly intrigued gaze. The greenette couldn't see it, but the glare his friend gave to other boy was practically lethal. His hissing, "That's none of your damn business," half feral with irritation that all of his reassurances about scars was about to go down the drain. The excuse-ridden reply from Sen was cut off by a lecturing as the robotic boy waded over, arms swinging as he went into full lecture mode. Shinso snagged Izuku's hand, turning to make sure his friend was okay. only for his eyes to lock onto something over the greenette's shoulder. He smirked and stepped to the side, making the shorter boy turn to see who he was looking at. He immediately felt concern, his own insecurities forgotten about when he saw how flushed Kaminari was. "Denki," he asked lowly, stepping closer to where the blonde was sitting. "Are you okay? You aren't overheating, are you?" He leaned in a little to make sure the other teen was okay. Hands on his knees as he checked the other over. Unbeknownst to the freckled and scarred boy, Hitoshi was stood back and to the side, arms crossed and grinning sadistically. When golden eyes flickered over to meet Indigo, he licked his lips slowly, a teasing air to his stance even as he made the visual suggestion. With a whimper, the blonde's hand hurried up to stem a nosebleed before he made a hurried escape, begging off help as he all but ran away. Hitoshi chuckled before snagging Izuku's arm to keep him from rushing after their flustered classmate. "Leave him be, Izu. Let him cool off, yeah." With that, he all but dragged the other back towards their initial objective, ignoring the slumped form of the 1B student where he was still being lectured, now joined by a few of his own classmates as they either tried to calm Ada down or put their own 2 cents in. With a sigh, the purple-themed teen stepped into the water next to where Todoroki was leaning back against the edge of the pool, eyes closed until he felt the water shift. Heterochromatic eyes blinked open, peering up at where the 2 newcomers stood over him. He nodded in greeting, eyes taking in details quickly before he caught himself and pointedly looked away. Hitoshi couldn't tell if the slight pink of his cheeks was from the water or embarrassment, but he liked to think he was being appreciated in turn, because he 100% had checked the other boy out as he showered off earlier. After a minute of tense uncertainty, his stress coming back as the distraction of Kaminari fully dissipated, Izuku joined them, quickly sinking up to his chin in the steam, an obvious attempt to hide from the occasional curious glance still thrown their way. Hitoshi made a note to sick Aizawa on them about their rudeness later. Eventually, though, most of them decided they didn't feel like bringing it up again and focused back in on whatever shenanigans they had been pulling before. If a feral purple glare helped them along with that decision, none of them dared say anything about it. And bit by bit, Hitoshi was rewarded for his efforts by Izuku slowly relaxing at his side. He started chatting with Shoto, talking about possible team-up moves and signing along for Izuku so the other boy could add a comment if he wanted. Well aware that the greenette had removed his aids for comfort. Just because he had made them waterproof did not mean he liked the feeling of them when they got wet. And while the smaller teen was adept enough at lip reading, following along with signs was much easier for him. And indeed, after a while, the small freckled teen just couldn't resist jumping in with a comment about how their planned move would be better if the both of them had retractable ice skates built into their boots. If they could get used to the feel of using the capture weapon and ice to speed up their combos, it would be a brilliant addition. Hitoshi groaned internally at the thought of having to master yet another skill. But he knew that getting along with Shoto meant they would probably be working with him in the future. So learning how to deal with his winter wonderland was a must. After about an hour, the 3 of them climbed from the water, muscles feeling better even as their skin looked like so much dried prunes. They made it back to the lockers and dried off efficiently, still chatting about whether enlisting a professional skater to teach them would be a benefit or not. By the time they were dressed and back to the room assigned to the class of boys, Izuku looked a lot better, less stressed and like he was more than ready for bed, yawning every other minute or so. With a grin, the purple teen dragged him over to where they had set up their futons in the corner, joined shortly by their bed neighbors as the rest of their number trickled in from the baths or last-minute toilet runs. It took a while for things to quiet down, even after Ada hit the lights with a stern reminder of their early morning. Both Shoto and Hitoshi grew envious as Izuku once again took out his hearing aids, thus quieting their more rambunctious classmates and leaving them to deal with Kaminari and Siro's unruly debate about video game genres. But eventually even the more energetic boys lost the fight with sleep. A long day of traveling and a several miles-long hike combining with a full belly and a nice bath and taking their toll. The first full day at camp started with a bang. Literally, the 20 students chosen from each class for breakfast duty accidentally knocked over the refrigerator somehow, and the loud noise woke everyone who was still in bed with a slew of startled curses. The chaperones all raced for the kitchen to make sure no one was dead, followed by the rest of the students as they all disentangled themselves from their sleeping bags and other bedding. The scene in the mess hall was chaos as a frantic Kirishima tried to lift the appliance back into place with the help of Yanagi, and a bewildered Manga tried to herd an angry Kamakiri away from an obviously spooked Kaminari. Most of the rest of the students stood back, against the cabinets or in the main area of the mess in the name of staying out of the way. The exception being Shinso, who nudged a stressing Izuku towards Shoto as he slipped into the room to check on Kaminari. If he inadvertently placed his back as another barrier between the blonde and the irate Kamakiri, well, no one could say shit. Eventually, the teachers got the story of what happened from Yaoyorozu. The spider that had made Denki scream was guided outside, and the fridge that had been yanked to the floor by a startled Tetsu was righted. Once the damage to the grocery was assessed, most of the teens not on cooking duty wandered back to their rooms to either grab a few more seconds of sleep or to start getting ready for the day. By the time they had all filtered back in, breakfast was set up buffet-style on the counters, cereals and milk along with options of eggs, bacon, sausage, toast, and an array of cut fruits. They all went through one by one to grab what they wanted, joined a few minutes after the last person went down the line by Kiwaro and Kodai once they finished the dishes. Soon food was devoured and the kids were herded to the clearing outside for the first day of training. All of them gathered around the adults as the homeroom teachers gave safety lectures before they were split up into 6 groups and herded to different areas where Pixie Bob and the other pussycats had set up specialized terrain or equipment for each individual student. Izuku ended up standing on padded mats a bit away from the rest of the group. Hagakure, Shinso, Ajiro, and several of Class B with him. Tiger stood in front of them with a grin, arms crossed and something like sadistic glee in his eyes. Those of you who have me today are the ones with less physical quirks, or quirks that are only marginally helpful in a fight. Today we are going to focus on how you fight Quirkless. Take Midoria and Ajiro here for example. Both of them have several years of martial arts training and their styles show that. I want to try and get the read of you closer to their level. And as for you too, Midoria, I saw that you've had at least some tumbling training. I want you to focus more on integrating that with your style. I've seen you use a few flips and such in the recorded matches, but now I want you to get creative. Try adding in other skills. Mix it up. Handsprings, cartwheels, rollovers, anything in your back pocket that you've never tried in a fight, now is the time. And Ajiro, you're too rigid. You are not used to sparring with people who use different arts, and that's okay. You have a good starting point, but now is the time to branch out. So for today you're going to be Midoriya's target as he goes wild. Neither of you pull your punches. It's time to duke it out and reach for the stars. And as for the rest of you, now his grin turned positively feral. Well, you're up against me for the day. By the time they broke for lunch, all of the kids in Tiger's group had at least 3 bruises and an embarrassing story to never tell. Izuku refused to even think about how he had accidentally misjudged a jump and pretty much teabagged poor Ajiro. And the blonde was nice enough to agree to never mention it again. In exchange for Izuku never talking about his own mishaps, of course. Mutually assured destruction was a good way to keep things hush-hush. Izuku had been assigned lunch duty that day too, so he wasn't even able to take a break before he was shoved into the assembly line for sandwiches that Ida had organized. He was tasked with chopping and then adding the veggies to a large platter so everyone could add what they wanted to their sandwiches. He was glad he had some experience with cooking because watching Ida try and cut onions was actually painful. And if he was just as slow as the taller boy, the veggies would never be done. By the time the platters of half-made sandwiches were done, everyone was starving. The piles of meat and bread didn't stand a chance as they were swarmed by a small army of teenagers. The adults, wisely, made their own sandwiches in the kitchen, not even attempting to get in between the kids and the food. Soon enough, though, they were being herded back outside and regrouped, this time with different instructors as they were coached through a new set of drills or training exercises. Izuku was actually sent inside once all of his yearmates were settled. Ragdoll took him to an office with a large computer setup. Apparently it was their control point for any rescue operations in the area. But it was also the only computer set up to receive any signal this far out in the middle of nowhere. Ragdoll quickly set up a call, explaining that every afternoon he would be getting lessons from either Nezu or someone of the rat's choosing. Apparently he should expect to be surprised by some of his guest teachers. It took a few minutes of securing the line and a whole slew of passwords. But then they were being patched into Nezu and Ragdoll left them to their lesson, which was an entire lecture series on dissecting quirks that seem to defy the laws of physics and paring them down into something that actually makes sense. Needless to say, Izuku had a blast for 4 straight hours. The process of making dinner was an experience for everyone involved. Most of the teens had minimal kitchen skills at best, and some of them were active disasters when within 5 feet of a knife or fire. So deciding tasks was a skill in and of itself. Izuku once again ended up chopping veg, coaching some others who had never done the task before, but who were not likely to hurt themselves through the process. Once everyone had gotten the hang of things, he allowed himself a moment to people watch, huffing out a laugh at a very bemused-looking Todoroki who was being dragged around by Mina so he could light the fires for the outdoor cooking area. The curry came together relatively quickly. It was a bit messy. Not all of the vegetables had been cut evenly, and the roux had been a bit bland in the name of saving the kids who couldn't handle spice. But it was palatable, and Izuku found himself enjoying sitting down to eat outside with his friends. But he was only halfway through his plate when he noticed movement from the tree line. He turned to look, finding Kota slipping away into the woods. With a frown, he shoved one last large bite of his food into his mouth before standing and excusing himself, waving off Hitoshi's question. He made a second plate and hurried off in the direction he had seen the little one go. Finding a well-worn path half hidden in the bush, he followed it quietly, looking around at the darkened trees and wondering where the track led to. He found out soon enough. After following the path up a sharply rising series of rocks, he came out onto a little ledge in front of a shallow cave. Koda was sitting with his back to the rock face, staring out over the edge of the cliff forlornly. Izuku frowned to himself for a moment before announcing his presence with a cough and a kicked rock. The little boy startled a bit, spinning in place to face him, before scowling and turning back away. "Go away. This is my secret base. Go find your own." The greenette hummed. "This is a pretty cool base. Don't worry, I won't tell anyone about it. I just wanted to bring you something to eat is all." That only got him another glare. "I don't want your stupid curry. Go away." With a sigh, the teen settled down near the boy on a rock, setting the plate on the ground between them. "I understand if you aren't hungry, but I'd really like it if you tried to eat anyways. There have been times I've had to go without food and honestly it never ends well." Another glare. "Great. I don't want anything made by you stupid hero wannabes. I hate all of you, going around showing off your stupid quirks and beating up stupid villains for the stupid cameras." He hates hero society. Izuku could honestly relate to the feeling even if he had always wanted to be a hero anyways. Instead of saying that though, he asked a question. "What if I don't have a quirk to show off? Am I still a stupid hero wanabe?" That seemed to throw the little boy off, just as he had intended. "Ew, what?" The greenette chuckled before leaning back and looking up at the mass of stars strung across the sky. "I'm Quirkless Koda, and all I've ever wanted was to be a hero so I could help people. Pretty stupid, all right." Dark eyes blinked up at him in confusion, obviously at a loss of how to respond. The teen just smiled down at him for a moment before nudging the plate closer with his foot and standing to leave. "Eat up. Why, you never know when you'll need the extra energy." With that parting comment, he headed back down the slope towards the lodge, hoping he had shifted the little boy's ire towards heroes as a whole at least a little bit. Izuku groaned and tried to rub some of the tension from his temples before going back to stirring the giant pot of stew. The last 2 hours of that day's lesson had been on the theory of relativity and how it might influence the quirks of astronauts. Nenzu had even patched in a contact from NASA to give a short lecture on ways the agency was trying to counteract common issues. It was fascinating, to be honest, but hard to follow. He had written copious notes for things he planned to go and do further study on during the rest of their break. He had a feeling he would be reading a couple of Stephen Hawking's books. Shinzo snorted at his display in sympathetic humor even as he flipped the chunks of meat he was searing. The two of them had chatted about their afternoon lessons as they got set up for helping with dinner. Shinzo himself looked just about beat after 4 hours of struggling to control his capture scarf, and his hands were wrapped to protect bloody blisters. He was eager for the day when he had built up enough calluses to protect his hands from the chafing. He was also thankful that Iearazu had taken one look at him whapping his fingers before dinner and promptly switched him from dish duty to the lighter work of shoving beef around a pan. The heat was still unpleasant, but he was way less likely to get an infection. Luckily, the pre-made stew base the heroes had provided meant the meal only took about an hour to put together. The teens were very appreciative of that fact and practically inhaled the filling soup and the rice that had been made alongside it. When they were done, the kids in the remedial lessons were dragged back into the building as Pixie Bob and Tiger lead the rest of them into the trees for an activity. Eventually, they made it down a well-worn dirt road to a large clearing. Mandalay greeted them with a smile and a wave from where she was setting up a few lanterns hanging from a tree. The Pussycats explained the little bonding activity they had planned for the night, a test of courage, where one class would set up in the woods and scare the other before switching roles. Safe to say, Izuku was a bit uncertain about the event. He had never fared well in the tests of courage he had been forced into during middle school, though to be fair, those often turned from scare each other witless into scare the quirkless kid until he cries. So not fun for him, even though the others always found it hilarious. He really hoped this wouldn't go the same way. Class B won the rock, paper, scissors round and decided to be the scarers first, so they headed onto the darkened path while Class A drew lots to determine who would be partnered with whom. Shinzo looked pained when he drew Ada, and Izuku had to stifle his laughter. The greenette got lucky and drew Jiru. She was down to earth and pretty chill, so he hoped she wouldn't spook easily. They got in line behind Aoyama and Uraraka. The two louder classmates tittered nervously to each other as they waited, much to Jiru's amusement. Izuku himself was too busy signing back and forth with his purple shadow, ribbing the taller boy about the fun he was about to have walking through a haunted forest with a robot. The freckled boy almost died of laughter at the mental image of Ida trying to jump into Shinzo's arms from fear, mirthful tears springing to his eyes as the pale insomniac swore to drop him if it happened, face selling the deadpan delivery. Soon enough, though, it was their turn to head through, and Mandalay was ushering them to the start of the trail and handing Jiru a flashlight. Within seconds of starting down the path, the light from the lanterns was completely obscured by the thick trees, and they were plunged into darkness. Saved from being completely blinded by the thin stream of light from the torch, Izuku shuddered at a cold draft against the back of his neck, feeling the hairs on his arms stand up at the creepy feeling of being watched. He glanced over at his partner, watching as her jacks hovered around her, obviously listening for the Class B students in the trees around them. Jiru nudged him and pointed off to the right, giving him just enough time to brace himself before Kiwaro jumped out of the shadows and darted across the path. The greenette was suddenly grateful for being paired with the girl. He was sure he would have screamed if she hadn't warned him. They continued on, jumping over a softened spot on the ground and walking around thin threads of glue strung like spider webs across the path. It looked like Class B mostly planned for jump scares and weird texture traps. They had just made it past the halfway point, getting their courage badge from Ragdoll, when Izuku smelled it. The familiar tang of smoke carried to him on the breeze, and he froze for half a step before reaching out to grab Jiru's arm. She turned, mouth open to ask what he wanted before her head snapped back towards where they had come from. Eyes widening, her jacks lifted, obviously listening for something. She then dragged the greenette off the path, angling back towards Ragdoll. The further they went, the stronger the smell of smoke, until eventually they could see the rock where the heroine had been sitting through a gap in the trees, except she wasn't sitting anymore. The green-haired woman was struggling with an assailant, a man who was dragging her backwards over the rock, arm around her neck and hand clamped firmly over her mouth. Izuku sprinted forwards before his brain even fully registered what was going on. Using the rock like a pommel horse, he jumped into a 180 flare spindle, using the momentum on his up and over to send his raised leg slamming into the back of the man holding Ragdoll. He stumbled, almost tipping head first over the rock, and was forced to let go of his target so he could catch himself. He turned to face the teen with a growl, somehow showing his rage even through the full coverage mask he was wearing. "Hey, what the fuck, man? Wow, good kick." Izuku settled into a stance even as he clocked Ragdoll, using a communicator to let the other teachers know there was at least one villain and a fire in the woods. He leaped forwards again as the man's focus started to shift back towards the heroine. He needed to give her enough time to coordinate with the others. It was their best chance to get everyone out safely. He swung a punch at the villain's stomach, aiming to distract, incapacitate, whatever he could do. Unfortunately, the man was able to dodge, sliding back into the side, spouting contradictory statements as he did. So Izuku pressed forwards, determined to keep the momentum. If he could make his adversary retreat completely, that would more than likely be the best thing they could hope for in this situation full of unknowns. There was a slight twinge behind his eye, and then Mandalay was speaking, using her quirk to relay what she knew of the situation to the students and other chaperones, only to add 2 more villains to the count a minute or so later as the clearing at the start of the trail was attacked as well. The greenette spun into a kick, only to pull up short as the villain dropped to the ground in a heap. Ragdoll dug quirk suppression cuffs out of her belt from her place standing above her attacker, calmly getting the situation under control before looking over at the kids under her care with a smile. "Thanks for your help, kittens. Now let's get you guys to safety back at the lodge, okay?" They hurried back down the path, leaving the downed man to be picked up later. When Izuku had a sudden horrible realization. Ragdoll, is Kota at the lodge? He could have sworn the woman cursed under her breath as she reached for her communicator again. It took a couple of back and forths with the homeroom teachers before Ragdoll was able to confirm that the little boy was indeed not safe at the lodge. "I know where he is. I can show you." They kept running as Ragdoll relayed their plan to the others and coordinated with Aizawa. Afterwards, she nodded to the teen and told him to lead the way, also giving Jiru the order to stay close and keep an ear out for other students they could grab on the way. They raced through the trees, heading up the slope to the north of the lodge. They managed to snag a few other students as they went, Yanagi and Komori from Class B as well as Ida and Siro. But then they hit a wall of pinkish gas and had to pause to assess. Ragdoll used her quirk and cursed again. "It's a knockout gas, and it seems several of your classmates have gotten caught in it already." She once more relayed information over the comms, trying to figure out what to do in this hard situation. She kept glancing around her at the kids she had gathered. A conflicted look in her eyes showed Izuku all he needed to know. He walked up to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Ragdoll-san, you need to get the others out of the gas, right? Let me go around it to get Kota and send the others back to the lodge. It only makes sense to split up here for safety." The green-haired woman started to reply before they were interrupted by Jiru tugging on her sleeve and pointing to the right. It took a moment, but then they could hear it too. Their hero escort motioned for them to stay put before sneaking off towards whoever was there. The purple-haired rocker was watched closely by her peers until she suddenly relaxed with a smile. "It's Yamomo and Aoyama." The others let out sighs of relief and were soon joined by Ragdoll and her new acquisitions. But by the time Yaoyarazu stepped out into their small area between trees, Izuku had concocted a full plan. "Yaoyarazu-san, Can you by chance make gas masks? The elegant heiress nodded, holding out the one she had obviously made for herself already. Yes, I was going to suggest making some more for you all as well. He smiled at her, a gleam in his eyes as he shifted a few pieces around in his brain. Wonderful, Ragdoll. We should all use the masks, and you can take several of the others to snag the students who are in trouble while Yanagi, Zero, and I head over to snag Koda. There was a pause, and then the woman relayed his plan over the comms while nodding at the raven-haired teen to make the masks. Once they all had protection from the gas, Ragdoll gave them all one last warning to not do anything stupid and to head to the lodge as soon as they retrieved their target. From there they split up, Izuku leading his 2 escorts further up the mountain as the others ran in to save those who needed help. He really hoped they all made it back to the camp safely. He only glanced back once, but by then the others had already disappeared, swallowed up by the murky night and the swirling smoke. Izuku was really glad he had slowed his little group down before they burst out of the tree line and out onto Koda's ledge. He was less glad to find a 7-foot behemoth towering over the boy menacingly. He hissed out a silent breath as he studied the situation, brain whirring like a computer as he figured out what he needed to do about the situation. He took stock of what he had on his person and the 2 friends he had brought along, trying desperately to figure out how to get the 6-year-old out of danger. He didn't have the time to perfect a plan though. An oversized fist being pulled back galvanized them into action. Izuku pulled his singular knife out from where it was strapped along the back of his belt under his shirt as he ran forward. His first strike was a desperate one, aiming for the back of the villain's knee. A dirty move, but less lethal than a lot of the other options he had. The knee folded as the tendons were cut and Izuku continued his dash, scooping up Koda in one arm as he passed, putting as much distance between them and the man as he could. Now the issue was the fact that there was a bulky and angry obstacle in between them and the path to safety. He spotted Zero and Yanagi stepping to either side of the path behind the giant, taking up defensive positions that would also be better for their more long and mid-range quirks. That left Izuku himself as the best choice for close combat. He stashed his latest acquisition behind a large rock, hoping to apply the out-of-sight, out-of-mind rule. Stay here and stay quiet, he ordered, keeping his eyes at the adversary who was building up into a full-blown tirade about killing the teen who injured him, and about murder in general. Izuku tuned him out, trying to figure out the best angle for attack, zeroing in on the man's arms when he booted up his quirk. He cringed. Any kind of physical power-boosting quirk was a bad matchup for him, especially factored with the size difference between the 2 of them. This honestly looked uncomfortably like the first Namu situation. He receded his grip on his knife, desperately missing his preferred weapon and internally kicking himself for deciding the cord was too uncomfortable for a walk through the woods. He would do anything to have the tasing aspect to help deal with the muscle-based quirk they were facing. As it was, he would have to make do. Green eyes darted over to Zero and a freckled hand gestured unobtrusively, using the signals Aizawa had taught them in class to lay out a very basic plan. The hero equivalent of cover me, I'm going in. When he got a positive signal back, Izuku leaped forwards, slicing a thread out with his blade even as he was forced to leap to the side to avoid a too powerful punch. The air displacement from the blow was almost enough to cause the small teen to lose his balance. The show of strength was frightening. The teen suddenly glad he had lamed the man in one leg. He never wanted to see what a properly balanced punch from Muscular was like. The greenette twisted as he slipped past his opponent's arm, plunging his knife into an exposed shoulder, aiming for the joint once again. But even as the knife sunk in the first inch, Izuku realized that the blow wouldn't be effective. He yanked his hand back as the severed muscles writhed and reformed, a gruesome display of unfortunate self-healing. His next dodge wasn't quite quick enough. The backhand caught him in the upper arm and shoulder, sending him flying sideways. The steep rocky side of the mountain caught him before dropping his stunned body to the ground. The greenette tried to get up quickly, but his body wasn't obeying him, that or the world was spinning too quickly and he was being held to the ground with the centrifugal force. His ears rang as he wrestled an arm from where it was pinned underneath him, managing to lever his torso up after 2 more tries. As his wits mostly returned and his hearing faded back in, with an annoying buzz from a now untuned hearing aid, he realized Yanagi was standing over him, using the rocks and sticks from around them as ammunition for her quirk. Looking past her, he saw quick flashes of movement as Zero raced around their enemy, harrying Muscular with small lengths of super sticky tape in annoying places. He was very glad he had asked them to come with him. If they hadn't, he would most likely be dead. And then where would little Koda be? The tan teen gritted his teeth and pushed to his feet, ignoring the minor spike of pain from the arm that had taken the initial hit and the side that had cushioned his landing. He could move, and that was what mattered in the moment. He would gladly listen to Chiyo yell at him later, since that meant he would be alive. He stepped up beside Yanagi, taking the free moment to study the man once more, watching how he moved on his bad leg. but one barely missed grab was his signal that his rest time was up. Zero was tiring out quickly and Izuku needed to end the fight before he got hurt. Green eyes locked on their only chance and the boy cringed even as he settled on the only viable plan of action. He quickly muttered out his shaky plan to Yanagi. When she nodded back her acceptance, a grim look in her eyes as she acknowledged the desperate move, he took a breath before racing forwards once again. Poltergeist-yeeted rocks sailed by him, straight at Muscular's face. The villain forced to block his own line of sight in the name of not getting a broken nose. And that split second Izuku seized his chance. He slid in low, under another blind swing, and popped up behind the man. Once in position he leaped as high as he could and wrapped his legs as far as possible around a too bulky torso. His arms went over super-bulked shoulders, one hand scrambling for purchase on shifting muscles. The other brought his knife around and up, sliding the blade home in the socket of a mechanical eye with a schnick of severing wires. Then with a wrench and a twist the prosthetic came free. The roar of rage and pain from Muscular was loud enough that the tiny greenette almost released his hold. But he knew deep down that if he didn't take hold of this last opportunity then he would be putting the others in danger. So he tightened his grip and swung the knife down once more. He would never forget the sound a human eye makes as it pops. But the deed was done. He jumped free of his victim, unfortunately catching an elbow to the cheek as he did. But it only just clipped him so he was able to roll to his feet fairly easily, signaling wildly for the others to retreat even as he raced to the rock where he had hidden Koda. Scooping the boy up he turned to watch as the villain stumbled around clutching at his face. Timing his moment he took a deep breath and yelled, his voice bouncing off the rocks around them and echoing strangely. "Careful, asshole. You don't know where the edge is now, do you?" The man froze even as Izuku started moving, walking as fast as he could while keeping his footsteps silent. He tucked Koda's face into his shoulder. He wasn't sure how much of the fight the kid had seen, but he didn't want to scar him further if he could help it. They made it safely to the path back down to the lodge, joining up with the other two before they started moving faster. Now that it was unlikely the villain would be able to follow them by sound, they needed to prioritize speed. Izuku shifted his bundle of child from his arms to his back as he ran, the tiny lump clinging tightly when he did, and a small, suspiciously wet face burrowed into the back of his neck. Yanagi ran ahead of them, gazing back and forth as she made sure their way through the trees was clear, while Zero pulled up the rear, keeping an eye out to make sure Muscular didn't stumble upon the path out of his makeshift prison. Izuku was glad for the chance to take a mental break. Now that they weren't in immediate mortal peril, his head was absolutely killing him. He could feel the steady trickle of blood soaking his hair where his skull had met the side of the mountain earlier. He was sure he had at least a minor concussion if he judged by the nausea. Of course, that could also have been caused by having to gouge out another living creature's eyes. He pushed those thoughts away yet again, in favor of making sure he wasn't sent sprawling by a tree root. It would really suck if he made it through that fight only to die by Klutz-induced incident. They made it back to the clearing around the lodge quickly, finding a whole group of teens milling about in the open space, taking care of first aid or standing guard over the injured. Just as they stepped free of the forest, there was another twinge behind his eyes as Mandalay sent another message out. All UA students are authorized to use their quirks in self-defense. They have a target that they are here for. Group up and protect each other. Izuku staggered into their camp with his little escort, quickly finding Vlad King where the man was standing and organizing the shaken gaggle of children. "Vlad-sensei, there is a sixth villain up the slope. He is incapacitated for now, but I'm not sure how long it'll take him to figure out his way down." The hero took one look at him and blanched. "Jesus, kid, you look rough. Take the kid and go get patched up. Komori is leading the first aid area." The greenette nodded and headed towards the small gaggle of teens who were gathered around a huge first aid kit. By the time he made it over, Yanagi was already set up and motioning for the teen to sit on the ground next to her. "Here, Midoriya-kun, let's get that head wound bandaged before you lose any more blood." He gave her a grateful look, but set the lump on his back down first, turning to face the pale and shaking boy and kneeling so he wouldn't loom. "Koda, are you hurt anywhere?" Dark eyes widened, before the 6-year-old seemed to regain some of his normal spunk. He crossed his arms with a glare. "That meanie head didn't touch me. But you're bleeding, stupid, so go get a band-aid or something." Izuku chuckled and went to stand up. "Yes, sir." He was going to say more, make a joke to help the boy feel better, but his vision almost completely blacked out when he stood. "Whoa, Izuku." The text thing he knew, strong and curiously temperature-inconsistent arms were lowering him gently to the ground while warm hands tapped at his cheeks. He blinked his eyes open, finding a worried blonde crouching in front of him, ordering him to stay awake. "I'm okay, thanks." He tried not to slur but wasn't wholly successful. "No, you're not," Shado's level voice said from behind him, where the larger teen was letting him rest against his chest. "I am though. Just stood up too fast." Kaminari used the grips his hands had on his face to keep the smaller teen from turning to look at his friend. being careful of the rapidly darkening bruises that were already starting to hide his favorite freckles. Izuku, please, for the love of video games, stop moving and let us bandage your head. There was a whimper nearby and a small voice asked, is he okay? Aw shit. Kota totally watched him faint. He heard Inagi gently soothe the kid. Yes, Kota-kun, I am sure he will be just fine. He just has a concussion and that can make you really woozy. She went on, calmly explaining what a concussion was and how you could tell if someone had one. Obviously distracting the boy as Komori came over to help Kaminari check the still bleeding cut on the side of Izuku's head. She had the blonde hold the short green curls out of the way as she hemmed and hawed for a moment before deciding that a packet of wound seal and a bandage would have to do for now until a professional could stitch him up. She got to work cleaning out the cut first, making Izuku hiss with the sting of alcohol. Denki hushed him soothingly, rubbing his thumb across his free curls where his hands were busy keeping the green strands out of the way. From there it was fairly quick work for Komori to dump a bit of wound seal on the damn thing and then wrap him up. She then left them to go help Ragdoll and Yaoyorozu with what was apparently one of several trips bringing back unconscious students. Kaminari grilled his friend about his other injuries when she was gone, but Izuku was fairly certain that while he might have a few fractures, nothing was broken. And the worst of the rest was just going to be some nasty bruises. After they were sure he wasn't dying, Yanagi let Kota come sit with them while she went off to help someone else. The young boy came and sat beside them and started rambling about his favorite Saturday morning cartoon. It took the greenette an embarrassingly long time to realize the child must have been told to keep him distracted so he wouldn't go to sleep. Kaminari soon joined in as well, helping the boy jump from topic to topic when he ran out of things to say. The whole time Shadow was a solid presence behind him, keeping him grounded even when his head decided to spin at every little movement. He was distracted for a bit by studying just how different the temperature was for each side of his friend's chest. He did tune back into the conversation though when Kota got more animated, gesturing with his hands and describing something with lots of action. He sputtered when he realized just what the topic was. Yeah, and then he took out the big dummy head's eye just like my mom did. He saw Denki pale before glancing over at him, but he kept a smile up for their little charge. Oh, is that so? That must have been really scary. Izuku winced. He had really hoped that Kota hadn't watched the fight. No, that part wasn't scary, just kinda gross. But not scary cause Midoriya only did it to protect us. And Sosa-Oba said the people who protect you shouldn't be scary. He then went on a rant about how Mandalay felt about their number 2 hero being such a jerk to children, completely oblivious to the fact that the man's son was sitting right by him. Shadow just chuckled and added in his own 2 cents, egging the boy on. Soon enough there were cars coming up the long drive and Izuku was forced to turn his head and hide his eyes against his pillow's neck when the flashing lights made his head rebel. More heroes were showing up and cops were organizing searches through the woods. Paramedics gathered at their first aid area, finding the kids in need of immediate help and starting to load them up in the ambulances as quickly as they could. Izuku was put on the lower priority list since he was bandaged and coherent. He was given a triage tag around his wrist to mark him as the walking wounded, the green minor bit removed. Shadow was also given a tag, but his had all the tabs on it. Kaminari and Kota, who had both avoided all injury and smoke inhalation, were left alone to be taken care of by their chaperones when they rounded up the uninjured later. Through all of the hustle and bustle, a growing sense of wrongness started to nag at the greenette. He could tell the other two felt it as well, though they kept quiet for Kota's sake. It wasn't until Aizawa appeared out of the tree line, looking around desperately and all but ran for them when they were spotted, that Izuku realized what the wrongness was. Honestly, in retrospect, he should have realized as soon as he got back to the lodge. He blamed the damned hit he had taken to the head. His brain must have been way more scrambled than he thought. His foster father dropped to his knees in the grass and started demanding answers from his other 2 students. Izuku braved another glance up through the blaring lights to gauge his expression and his heart dropped. He cut across Denki's answer, needing to know before anything else was said. Zawa, where's Toshi? The look on the man's face told him what he needed to know. It was distraught and solemn, pain and anguish hidden behind an almost blank mask, but not hidden enough from Izuku. He let out a choked no before the man even started talking. His friends tried to calm him down, but as soon as the words they took him registered in his ears, the 3 of them were forced to hold him down to keep him from his attempt to run into the forest to find his friend. Aizawa tried to rationalize with him, to explain that they spirited Hitoshi away through one of those damnable warp gates, that there was no way to find him amongst the trees. But the small greenette wasn't in the headspace for rational. All he knew was that his friend, crush, love, was gone. Kidnapped. He wailed at them to let him go, that he had to find Hitoshi, completely uncaring of the scene he was making. Eventually, after a quick exchange with a paramedic over the head of the hysterical teen, Aizawa gently wrestled his charge onto a gurney. They strapped him down tightly. Unable to sedate him with a concussion, they did the next thing that they could to keep him from worsening his injuries. Aizawa tried to soothe him through his pleading. It took far too long and way too many tears, and it ended in Izuku staring listlessly up at the ceiling of an ambulance, hand held by Shoto as he rode with him to the hospital. His foster had wanted to go with him, but he was needed to help the last of his students at the scene. Izuku couldn't find it in himself to care one way or the other. The feeling of wrongness had crashed over him like a wave, and now he was stuck drowning it. Itoshi was gone, and nothing would be right until he was back. Izuku floated in and out of awareness in the large hospital room that was being used for a chunk of the kids from the camp. They had them separated into two groups, one for those with physical injuries, and one for those affected by the unknown gas. The tiny country hospital was struggling a bit with the large influx of teens, so they did what they could, converting a large conference hall and a communal waiting area into spaces for the younglings in need. The teen was distantly grateful that they were too busy to check everyone's quirk status. Izuku had been placed in a bed near a large window with no blinds, able to watch as the sun slowly rose above the horizon, the light steadily killing off the darkness of a night full of terror, bringing forth a new day. Except the teen couldn't seem to let go of the shadows holding his mind captive. Flashes of blood and desperation stained the back of his eyelids, visible every time he blinked, but completely ignored in the face of the deep feeling of loss the greenette was trying to process. His best friend was gone, taken right out from under their noses, and Izuku hadn't even tried to help him. A roster of his classmates were assigned to keep an eye on him. He wasn't allowed to sleep for 12 hours, so those who weren't injured were asked to help the nurses. Todoroki was the one on concussion duty when Yaoyorozu awoke from the quirk exhaustion-related slumber. The others who were awake all greeted her quietly before asking for what all she had done during the events. All of them who were up to speaking had been passing stories back and forth, comparing each other's memories and trying to get a picture of the whole giant battle. It was a very rough picture so far, with most of the students in the area where the gas had been unconscious or resting after carrying so many others free of the danger. The greenette in the corner had, of course, been listening even if he wasn't consciously processing the conversation. The idle hum of quiet voices passing between his ears and into his memory bank even though he wasn't really paying attention. But when Yaoyorozu mentioned she had set a tracker on a Namu that Ragdoll and her had seen in the forest, his brain went from idle to racing. A tracker meant they could find the Namu. And if they found the pet, they would find the master who had taken his friend, who might be more than a friend. He was standing before he really knew what he was doing, crossing the room in unsteady but determined strides. Yaoyorozu-san, the tracker, you have a way to hunt it down, right? Well, yes, that is the point of a tracker after all. Good, give me the link or signal translator, whatever it is that you used. He was aware of the others around him exclaiming and trying to herd him back to bed, but he wasn't budging. He stared the scared young woman down, standing at her bedside and clutching at the railing to keep from falling over. Toshi wouldn't leave me there. I will not leave him. Midoriya, she started, seemingly moved by his words. But then she studied his face, focusing on his eyes, and let out a trembling breath. I can't do that. I'm sorry. He grit his teeth at her denial, almost snarling. Why the hell not? He swatted away the hands trying to guide him back, away from the target he had locked onto. The elegant heroine-to-be did her best to keep composed, though she did look regretful. Because you are obviously injured, and not in any state to safely rescue our classmate. I will give the transformer to the heroes and they will save him. You really need to rest. He struggled against the arm Todoroki had wrapped around his chest, not wanting to be dragged back towards his bed. No, I have to get to him. I have to help him. He saved me. I can't. Please, Momo. He was wailing by the end, once more in a full meltdown. Kirishima stepped in to help Shoto after the taller boy accidentally got scratched by desperately flailing hands. By the time they got the greenette back to his bed, the nurses had been alerted and were there to help them strap the small teen back down once again, only giving him sad looks and nonsensical soothing noises as he pleaded with them. A few minutes later, Aizawa and a very disheveled Yamada burst into the room. Izuku, the blonde man, raced across the room, kneeling by the bed and starting to try to talk his ward down. Aizawa turned to a slightly battered Todoroki. What happened? But before the heterochromatic teen could answer, Yaoyorozu drew the attention to herself. I'm sorry, sir. It's my fault. I'll tell you what happened, but we should speak outside so we don't upset him further. Aizawa frowned but agreed, waiting for the young woman to slip out of bed and following her into the hall. He trusted his husband to calm their foster son while he dealt with the rest of the mess they were all in. And indeed, though it took a while, way past the time when Yaoyorozu was returned to her bed by a nurse insistent on checking her vitals, but eventually Izuku was relatively calm once more. Yamada had resorted to undoing his restraints and scooping the child into his lap, leaning back against the propped-up bed. He hummed and gently worked tangles free from the curls not squashed flat by the bandages. A freckled cheek was pressed into his chest as the teen quietly cried out the last of his tears. He's gone, Yama. The teen whimpered quietly, softly enough that most of the others wouldn't have heard him over their own whispered conversation. The hand in his cropped curls paused momentarily before starting back up on its ministrations. I know. Sho and I will get him back. He's been in talks with the cops in UA since he got here. The boy didn't really respond, just turning to bury his face against the hero's collarbone. After another few minutes he sighed in defeat. My head hurts, he admitted, not turning his eyes away from their dark hiding spot. Mike let out a sympathetic hum, rubbing a hand up and down a still slightly too prominent spine. I'm sure it does, sweetheart. I'll call a nurse and ask about painkillers, okay? But you still can't sleep for an hour or so until Chiyo gets here and helps you out, okay? The teen gave a small nod and snuggled in closer, seeking what comfort he could get in the moment. Yamato motioned for the two boys who had taken up residence in a plastic two-seater by the bed to snag the remote off of a nearby side table and press the button for the nurses. Kaminari, who had shown up a little after Yamato when his own checkup had finished, did as asked. The normally cheerful teen looked positively despondent at the situation and the state of his friends. When the voice of a nurse came over the device in his hand, he explained that Midoriya Izuku needed something for pain, getting an affirmative before the nurse hung up. Hizashi then went about asking the greenette what else hurt, going over the summarized list Shouta had given him when he arrived. Out of the cracked humerus, sprained shoulder, and the fractured zygomatic, he said none of the major injuries or various cuts or bruises were bothering him too much. Likely his head hurt worse because of the crying and stress, and that pain was blocking some of the other pain. Soon enough a nurse arrived with something to help, shooting it into his IV port before reminding them to call her if they needed anything else. From there they spent the time until Recovery Girl arrived and made her way to them, just keeping the greenette away. He didn't really respond to them much when they spoke to him, but he did make sure to blink in acknowledgement when he was nudged, showing that he hadn't dozed off with his eyes open. Eventually Chiyo appeared by the bed, Izuku high up on her list of patients to see quickly. She tissed and hummed over his cart before giving him a very gentle peck on the cheek. He was asleep before she had even turned away. The inside of the space he was trapped in was the worst. He couldn't really tell where he was, just that it was small and that things were moving around outside. He couldn't move, forced into a fetal position, but his head was so fuzzy he didn't really have the motivation to try. It was an awful duality. He existed, he was aware, but his head felt muddled and confused, almost like he was drugged. A sharp contrast to the fear and adrenaline from the forest. Coming back into the real world again was more than jarring. He wished he could say he fought back, that he stood up for himself and went down swinging. But as soon as Hitoshi was freed from his glass prison, he was overtaken by a sense of vertigo, collapsing onto the floor and puking all over the shoes of whoever was in front of him. There were sounds of disgust before the teen was yanked to his feet. He listed dangerously to one side, his balance off, blinking rapidly to try and bring his brain back into focus. Something came towards his face and he flinched back only to run into someone who was behind him. They grabbed his hands and yanked them up behind his back to keep him still as a thing was strapped to his face. He hissed as the muzzle fully registered to his mind, thrashing weakly to get free and yank the cursed thing off. But freedom was not in the cards. He was wrangled backwards until the back of his knees hit something. With a shove he was forced into a chair, and then his wrists were cuffed snugly behind him. He whipped his head to the side to try and dislodge the metal contraption locked around his jaw, ignoring how it made his vision swim sickeningly. The voices above him swelled into what sounded like a small argument before there was a prick in his neck and he was dropped into darkness. Izuku was finally cleared to take a walk. When the nurse said he could stretch his legs, he begged off his worried classmates in the name of getting some peace and quiet. And seeing as how the room had steadily gotten livelier as the group of teens slowly woke up, they actually let him go, understanding the need. His arm was still in a sling, freckled fingers hanging out limply, and he still had his head wrapped, though the cut should be mostly healed. He eventually found himself sitting in a chair in a random hallway next to a vending machine. He watched solemnly as nurses and doctors bustled back and forth, his brain 100 miles away as he reviewed the happenings over the last day and a half. From the test of courage to the fight with Muscular to the awful, soul-crushing realization that Hitoshi was gone. He turned over every decision and action he made, plotting out what he could have done, should have done, berating himself for failing the boy who had done so much for him. Another reason he had wanted to escape the room was the bags of their personal items that were supposed to be delivered at any second. He knew that as soon as he had his phone he would have to talk to Mei, and he just couldn't. He had failed her brother and he couldn't face her, so he sat alone in the hallway instead. It couldn't last though. Eventually Kirishima found him brooding and informed him that Recovery Girl had asked to see the greenette to check how his head was healing. He sighed and levered up from his seat, following the redhead back towards the room where his fellow students were resting. They were only a few turns away when he heard it. The voice was one he recognized from early mornings and dosy afternoons, from humming in the kitchen and singing accompanied by a vacuum. It was Mike. He paused by the closed door, hand reaching to turn his hearing aids up a bit so he could hear the other voices as well. Yaorazu-san's tracker is showing a building in the warehouse district of Kamino Ward. but we have our eyes on a bar on the other side of that town. With their warper, I'm sure there are more hideouts, but those two are our best bets for getting Hitoshi-kun back quickly. We plan to move tomorrow night with a double raid. I have a list of the teams here for you to go over. Aizawa, we need you on the warehouse team to help deal with the Namu, so please, for the love of the gods, take a fucking nap. Izuku heard a grumbled agreement before there was the clicking sound of a laptop being shut. His two fosters exchanged a few words of consolation with each other softly. He turned his hearing aids down and quickly ran to catch up with Kirishima. Kamino Ward Warehouse District. He knew where that was. They had passed it by on the way to the mall last week. If he could be there when the raid happened, maybe he could help. Even if it was just him holding Hitoshi's hand, it would be better than nothing. He just couldn't stand being so completely useless. By the time they had made it back to the communal room, he had made his decision. All that was left was making a plan to escape the hospital and make his way to Kamino in time to be of some use. He wouldn't let his friend go through this alone for even a second longer than he had to. Shoto watched Izuku quietly from the other boy's bedside. The greenette was staring listlessly at his phone, watching as his news feed auto-scrolled. He felt awful after holding Izuku back as he screamed twice. He felt like a monster, not helping the other teen at all as he went through so much pain. He thought Izuku and Hitoshi could maybe consider him a friend, but now he felt like he had betrayed them. He wasn't there for Shinso when he had been taken, and now he had done nothing but hurt Midoriya more in the aftermath. He really wasn't friend material, was he? The sun was low in the sky when the greenette he was watching stood and grabbed his bag. Midoriya, Shoto asked softly, not wanting to be pushy but confused by the action. I'm just going to the vending machine. The answer made sense. It did, but something in the smaller teen's eyes was off. Oh, he started, turning his head up and at an angle so he could look at the other boy's face a bit better. He could tell there was something more to this trip than just the vending machine. If he had to guess, the freckled teen was probably about to do something stupid. He wanted to point it out. He wanted to stop him. But he had already been such a bad friend. How could he get in the way again? So instead he laced intent into his words when he asked, "Would you like me to come with you?" His offer was refused, a sad smile on an abnormally pale face. "No, I need to do some things by myself." With a deep breath, Shoto accepted the rejection. But he still needed to say something. Okay, just stay safe and come back quickly. Of course, hold down the fort, Todoroki. He nodded his acceptance for the role and then his friend was gone. Simple as that. When Kaminari came back from the cafeteria about 20 minutes after and asked about Izuku, he knew the best thing he could do for his friends was to redirect attention. He went to the vending machines. It's been a minute, but maybe he was caught up talking with someone. If he's not back in a bit, we can go look for him. The blonde readily agreed, settling back in his own chair and starting to chat about the fun cake options he had browsed downstairs, giving an in-depth description about the ginger cake he had chosen. Shoto nodded along, asking a question now and then to keep the other going. All he could do was give Izuku enough time to start whatever he had planned, so he would do his best. Izuku sat cross-legged on the train, his phone turned off and shoved into the back pocket of his jeans. He had taken the last of the bandages off of his face and had snagged a beanie from a dollar shop on the train platform. With all of his longer curls hidden away and a boring navy t-shirt tugged on over his long-sleeved undershirt, he was sure he looked like any other teenager, save for the yellowing bruises around one eye perhaps. But if there was one thing Izuku was aware of, it was the fact that the normal people on the street don't want to ask questions about a young kid with bruises. Wouldn't want to ruin their perfectly boring days after all. He stared out the window, the knife strapped to the back of his belt a comforting weight. He had left his bag just inside the door to the bathrooms he and his classmates had claimed, trusting that it would be found soon enough and brought back to UA. If not, oh well. Hitoshi was more important than some clothes and camping gear. He figured his absence would have been noted by now. Everyone was probably panicking. There was only 30 minutes until the press conference UA had scheduled, though, so most of the adults would be too busy with that, and the plan he was assuming was at the same time. The train came to a stop with a chime and he checked the station number before disembarking. He was only 2 or 3 blocks from the warehouse district. He figured if he jogged he could make it a few streets into the area by the time the fighting started. From there he could turn up his hearing aids and hopefully track them down. Once he was up the steps of the station, he settled into a light jog. Just a kid getting some exercise. Nothing to see here, lady. His heart was racing way faster than the small exertion warranted, his nerves sparking up now that he knew he should be at least within the same city as Hitoshi. He wished he could have asked May to come with him, but the thought of putting his sister in harm's way made his stomach churn. So like a coward he had foregone that phone call. He quickly made his way out of the nicer neighborhood, the area around him getting a bit more run down the further he went. Nicer apartment buildings fading into rougher houses and then to run-down shops. He slowed a bit when he hit the warehouses, the large buildings towering over him. their drab concrete fading into the night where the sparse lighting just wasn't enough. He started winding his way through the side roads and thin paths between buildings, turning up the tech in his ears in an effort to not miss a single clue in his quest for his best friend. It only took 5 minutes before he heard what he was looking for, and he didn't even need his aides to hear it. There was a boom and a plume of smoke a few buildings over, and Izuku was running before his brain even caught up, turning down his ears as he went in the name of not damaging his ears further. Explosions were loud after all. He slowed as he came to the last turn before the leveled warehouse, edging up against the wall and looking out carefully. Most of the building where the explosion had happened, and half of those around it were gone. Izuku was looking at it from the side, trying to see what exactly was going on past a half-demolished wall. He slid a bit more out to the side and caught a glimpse of Nightmare Fuel, a small group of heroes in various states of consciousness, wounded and prone, and walking towards them a villain. The man was large, towering over the rubble Izuku assumed he created, and he had no face, just a plain of gnarled scars over a terrifying grin. The teen froze, a sense of impending doom latching claws into his bones as he watched the man stand over a fallen best genist, speaking with that same grin, obviously taunting the injured hero. He wanted to step in, to help, to do anything, but the fear had wrapped his joints in ice and he couldn't seem to move. Suddenly there was sludge everywhere, dripping down from the air like rancid rain until it slowly dissolved to show the figures of people. More villains. Izuku recognized Shigaraki and the unconscious Kurogiri and counted at least 4 more that he could see from his vantage point. But that wasn't all. Standing next to a girl with blonde hair and a knife was Hitoshi. Izuku started forwards instinctively, wanting nothing more than to grab his target and run, but he realized there was absolutely no way to get to the other boy with how they were positioned, and he wanted to growl in frustration. While everyone was regaining their bearings, he took the chance to run across the rubble-strewn street, sliding into hiding behind a chunk of half-standing wall. Now that he was closer, he could better hear what was being said. Shigaraki's voice as he bitched at the faceless villain made his skin crawl, but it was nothing compared to hearing the voice of what Izuku is now assuming to be the true leader of the League. It was like oil on tar, a slick rainbow covering a black fathomless mire. A cough and a hissed insult interrupted whatever he was saying, though. Genus drew the attention of the group standing in front of him as he tried to stand. The head villain let out a chuckle, obviously patronizing in tone, and the hidden greenette felt like spider legs were crawling along his spine. He watched as the villain raised a hand, obviously activating a quirk, held his breath as he realized Genus wasn't going to get out of the way, choked on a scream as the blow started on its way, only to be blocked at the last second by the arrival of a bullet made of 300 pounds of muscle and glowing blue eyes. All for one. The symbol of peace hissed, smile nowhere to be seen as he held back the punch that probably would have killed a fellow hero. Hello, All Might. Running a little slow today, are we? Izuku blocked out the hero's growled response, not really interested in listening to him posture. Instead, he used his closer vantage point to study Hitoshi, noting the muzzle with fury. His arms were handcuffed behind his back and he had a few bruises, but it was the muzzle that was the most jarring thing about his current state. Izuku remembered the scars across the other's cheeks, the meeting with Nezu where he admitted that a padded muzzle was preferable to one without, of the nights when he would leave his workroom to find his friend staring out of the living room window blankly, video game forgotten, hand absently playing with the hinge of his jaw as he reminded himself that it could open and close freely. Freckled hands clenched into fists at the sight of his friend being silenced like he was nothing more than an animal. He hissed a breath in through his teeth, doing his best to keep control. He needed a plan. He had to figure out how to get Hitoshi out of there. His options rapidly dwindled as All for One barked out an order to his underlings. Following orders, the villains started to retreat, heading for a tunnel half buried under a collapsed wall, the blonde girl reaching out to snag Hitoshi's arm. But Izuku knew, he just knew, that if Hitoshi went down into the bowels of the earth with them, then he would never see his friend again. He raced from his hiding spot, knife sliding out of its sheath as he ran. He placed himself in between his friend and their enemies, blade held up and ready as he hissed out a string of curses. Yellow cat-like eyes blink at him in surprise before the girl is grinning gleefully and pulling a knife of her own. Izuku started backing up, trying to signal Hitoshi to do the same. He was in a bad position here, next to no gear, in the middle of a battlefield, with All Might and another Titan starting to duke it out far too close to them for comfort. They managed to make it a few steps back before she leapt at them. Izuku just managed to block her strike, shoving her back harshly, only to have to dive backwards to avoid a stream of blue flame. Unfortunately, he ran into Hitoshi when he did, sending them both to the ground in an ungraceful heap. His friend grunted in pain, but the greenette couldn't afford the time to check on him. He rolled over, attempting to get back up quickly, but he wasn't quick enough. The manic-looking blonde was already almost on top of him by the time he managed to turn towards her, knife coming down straight for his heart. He flinched back, doing his best to get his arm up in time to block, but knowing instinctively that he wouldn't make it. He heard Hitoshi let out a muffled scream, and Izuku internally wished he would look away. Having to see your best friend's death firsthand would be really traumatic after all. The point of her knife was less than an inch away from his chest when a flash of white wrapped around her wrist, yanking her whole body off course so that she went sprawling. And then Eraserhead was there and standing over his two boys, quirk active as he glared down the two villains who had yet to evacuate through the tunnel. Izuku, grab Hitoshi and get to the police line 2 blocks over. We will talk later. The man never even looked in their direction, full attention devoted to the threat. But the small greenette could still sense that he was angry. Still, he did as ordered, turning to help the bound teen to his feet, wincing when he noticed that a shoulder had dislocated in their fall. From there they fled, trusting Eraserhead to watch their backs and keep their enemies away, trusting their hero to protect them. They ran, ignoring the sounds of fighting as they went. As soon as they got close enough to see the flashing lights and yellow tape of the police line, paramedics ran out to meet them. Shinso was guided to an ambulance as Izuku explained that the other boy was the UA student who had been kidnapped, and that they should call their foster dad to let him know where to meet up. As he rattled off Yamada's number, he was surprised when a second paramedic shoved him down to sit by Hitoshi on the gurney, only suddenly becoming aware of the large cut across his pec and bicep when his shirt was cut away so the man could get a better look at what was bleeding. He hissed at the surprise sting of antiseptic, flinching away a bit before his brusque medic ordered him to stay still. He tried to think back to figure out when he had managed to get hurt, realizing after a moment that the crazy chick's knife must have clipped him as Aizawa pulled her away. He did his best to stay still as the man in front of him wrapped up the injuries and confirmed he would need a few stitches when they got to the hospital. A loud snap startled him, making him spin to face his friend, only to find that the chain of the cuffs had been cut to release his arms, most likely so they could relocate his shoulder. And indeed, that was the first thing the other paramedic did, snagging Hitoshi's wrist and giving a count of 3 before yanking sharply on the arm. The resulting muffled yell and pop made the smaller teen queasy. He reached over to grab Hitoshi's free hand in his own, giving it a grounding squeeze as the other boy breathed through the sudden spike of pain, a feat made more difficult by the contraption still on his face. Excuse me, is there any way to get the muzzle off? Toshi doesn't really like them. The grumpy medic grumbled about Izuku moving around too much, but his coworker nodded. Yes, that was what I was going to do next. I would have done it first, but I was worried about nerve damage if I left that shoulder for too long. Izuku hummed his acknowledgement as the man went about grabbing some medical scissors. With a moment of wiggling, a small apology as the muzzle dug in, and the loss of a lock of hair, Hitoshi was free. The teen took a shaky breath, hand not holding Izuku's, raising to probe the inflamed scars across his nose and cheeks. He seemed to deflate all at once, slumping over into his friend's side as they were loaded carefully into the ambulance. The smaller teen wrapped an arm around his shoulders and let him have a moment, ready and willing to wait for his Hitoshi to be ready to speak. Okay, sadly the chapter is over, and if you enjoyed the video, just leave a like and subscribe with post notification, so when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.